Hey guys, this is Zerk's What If, and welcome to the part 1 of What If Yuji Had All for One. I wasn't going to start this one, but my part 8 to What If Yuji Was Like Yurichi had got corrupted, and I wasn't able to finish it, so I just decided that I was going to start this one. I didn't feel like re-recording, and I might as well start something new, because after that part, I was supposed to post this one, so I'll just post this one, re-record the other part, and then, yeah. But without further ado, let's just get right into this. This story would start way before Yuji was even born. Kenjaku wanted to make the vessel for Sukuna as strong as he possibly could, so not only would he have sealed one of Sukuna's fingers inside of him, he would have found other special grade objects, sealing those inside of Yuji as well, as many as he could find. He wasn't even sure Yuji would survive. However, if Yuji didn't, he would simply start over and try again. This was simply an experiment for Kenjaku, so even if it did fail, he would just start over again and again until eventually he was successful. However, to Kenjaku's surprise, Yuji was born flawlessly. He was a pale-looking kid with white hair and gray eyes, looking neither like his father or mother. But Kenjaku would notice something strange about Yuji. Yuji would have black dots on the palm of his hands. Kenjaku would believe it had to do with him sealing an abundance amount of cursed objects inside of Yuji, but he would push it to the side, revealing in his new creation the perfect vessel for Sukuna. And in order for Yuji to be sculpted the way he wanted to, he would kill all of Yuji's family. Kenjaku would then think about raising Yuji in his own way, making sure that the Jujutsu sorcerers wouldn't be able to get a hold of the kid. He wanted to sculpt Yuji to be the perfect vessel, and to have the same ideals as him. Kenjaku wanted to re-sculpt the world and change Jujutsu society, and he would drill these ideals into Yuji. By the age of 5, Yuji would already know about cursed energy, as well as cursed spirits, as every day since Yuji could walk, Kenjaku would show him cursed spirits, with Yuji always being fascinated by them. Kenjaku would have trained Yuji on how to use cursed energy, but realizing that Yuji may not have a cursed technique, until one day, Kenjaku would make Yuji fight his first cursed spirit, as he wanted to see what the boy could do. If Yuji were to die here, then he would be the ultimate failure, and Kenjaku would simply start over. The curse would be a weaker cursed spirit, with the ability to manipulate fire. Yuji would seemingly stare at the curse, studying it, waiting for the curse to make the first move. As the curse would rush in, it would spew flames at Yuji, but he would dodge it. At the same time he was dodging, he would grab the curse by the arm, kicking it in its back and slamming it to the ground. Yuji would look over at Kenjaku and ask him, was this really it? It was his first fight with a cursed spirit. However, the cursed spirit was weak, extremely weak. He wanted more, a lot more. Yuji would then begin to smile and slam the cursed spirit's head into the ground repetitively. Kenjaku would think that was all, so he would praise the boy for defeating the cursed spirit. However, Yuji would then say that he wants the cursed spirit. Kenjaku would question to what the boy was talking about, as Yuji would point at the cursed spirit and say, "Can't you see? It's like a fiery soul right there. It looks fun, and I want it." Kenjaku would look at the cursed spirit and be confused. What was Yuji able to see that he couldn't? Yuji would then reach out with his hand, with a black dot on his palm now glowing red. He would touch the cursed spirit, and to Kenjaku's shock, the cursed spirit would then get absorbed into the red dot. Yuji would then stare at his hand and smile. Then the dot on his hand would stop glowing red. Kenjaku would ask what Yuji had just did, and Yuji would show Kenjaku, producing flames just as the curse did. Kenjaku would be absolutely amazed. He would think to himself and realize Yuji was able to completely absorb a cursed spirit, and in doing so, he's able to utilize the abilities of whatever cursed spirit he absorbed. Kenjaku would then begin coming up with all kinds of hypotheses for Yuji. Does it only work on cursed spirits? What about Jujutsu sorcerers? If Yuji were to touch a Jujutsu sorcerer, would he be able to absorb their abilities as well? Kenjaku would begin smiling. Things were going so much better than he initially thought they were going to go. Kenjaku knew the next step would be an extreme gamble, but he was willing to risk it. He would think to himself, if Yuji were to touch him, would Yuji take the curse technique of the person he inhabited, or would he take his current curse technique? It was a full-on gamble, but Kenjaku was willing to take it. He would then ask Yuji, what does he see when he looks at him? Yuji would stare at Kenjaku, studying him. He would tell Kenjaku that there are two things inside of his body. Kenjaku would then smile, realizing Yuji was able to see whatever he saw inside of the cursed spirit inside of him as well. He couldn't hold back his excitement. Yuji was able to perceive the contours of the soul, as well as modify them. He would seemingly be able to take techniques as long as he makes contact with the red dot on his palm. Kenjaku would then ask Yuji to tell him what exactly the souls look like inside of his body. Yuji would then explain that one of the souls had stitches around it, while the other one looked like it had swirls around it, like gravity was pulling it down. Kenjaku would have been shocked. Yuji was able to see both techniques that he currently possessed. Kenjaku would then tell Yuji that he wants Yuji to take the one that has swirls around it. Yuji would ask Kenjaku if he was sure, with Kenjaku patting Yuji on the head, telling him that it was okay. Yuji would reach out his hand, activating his technique. As he would make contact with Kenjaku, Kenjaku could feel the cursed engravings on his brain leave his body. It would leave Kenjaku uncomfortable, as it would seem like something was stripped from his entire being. He couldn't put it into words, it just felt odd. Something that was there, engraved in his being, was simply taken. Even though it was weird, his experiment was still a success. If a cursed spirit or sorcerer had a cursed technique, if Yuji touched them, he would be able to strip the user of their cursed technique and make it his own. Kenjaku would then wonder if the reverse could be applied. If Yuji were to learn reverse curse technique, would he be able to implant curse techniques onto other users? It was something he had to know, and he was going to do everything to figure it out. So for the next 9 years, Kenjaku would simply train Yuji over and over, getting him to the peak of his abilities, making him absorb as many cursed spirits as he possibly could. And if they happened to come across a Jujutsu sorcerer with a technique, they would attempt to take that as well. Even though they had come across multiple cursed spirits, Yuji's arsenal wasn't that much bigger than it was. Most of the cursed spirits that he'd come across would have useless, pointless abilities that he wasn't able to utilize properly. But the ones he did take favor in was the fire ability that he originally took from the first cursed spirit he fought, with the other one being the ability that he had taken from Kenjaku. There was also an ability that he stole from a cursed user that allowed him to transform his limbs into weapons, and the last ability being an ability that allows him to detonate whatever he touches within a short interval. Combining these 4 abilities would make him a formidable opponent to anyone he would come across. Yuji would also be on the verge of learning reverse curse technique, however, he just couldn't quite get it. It was the only thing he wasn't able to quite comprehend in Jujutsu sorcery. Just then, Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he had somewhere to be. However, he wants Yuji to continue trying to use reverse curse technique. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he would come back, but he'll probably look a lot different. But he would tell Yuji that he has something in store for him. Since Yuji had effectively grown up with Kenjaku, he would have the same ideals as him, wanting to reshape the world of Jujutsu, learning about the Heian era and what it had entailed. Knowing about Sukuna since a very young age, Kenjaku would then tell Yuji that he won't be back for a while, but he wants him to continue absorbing cursed spirits. He would tell Yuji to follow cursed spirits and the energy around them, find as many as he could, and capture them. Yuji would agree with Kenjaku and tell him that he'll be waiting for him to return. For the following next year, Yuji would do exactly what Kenjaku had told him to do. He would go around finding cursed spirits, absorbing them, until eventually, it would be the middle of the night and Yuji could feel an extremely strong cursed presence nearby. He would find himself in front of a high school. As he would scan the building, he could feel an immense amount of cursed energy coming from the building. Yuji would smile, saying as he hit the jackpot this time. Whatever was inside the building was incredibly strong, and he couldn't wait to absorb it. He would then use his anti-gravity technique to blast himself into the air, shooting straight through a window where he felt the most cursed energy at. As he would touch the ground, he would look around. To his right, he would see a cursed spirit about to swallow 2 people with a weird looking finger in its hand. And to the left of him, he would see a Jujutsu sorcerer who had Shikigami summoned. He would ignore the Jujutsu sorcerer first and go straight towards the cursed object, seeing as it had the most cursed energy. He would use the anti-gravity technique on the cursed spirit while transforming both of his hands into swords. He would easily take out the curse, transforming his blade hands back into hands and grabbing the finger all in one instance. Megumi would watch on in awe as this random guy just came in and took out the cursed spirit, grabbing one of Sukuna's fingers in the process. Megumi would then yell out to Yuji, asking him who he was, but Yuji wouldn't pay him any mind. He would only be staring at the finger. He would scan the finger and notice that there was a soul residing inside of the finger. It was ancient and extremely powerful. Yuji would smile. But again, Megumi would yell out. Just then, Yuji would turn around. He would stare Megumi up and down, looking at the young sorcerer. He would then ask Megumi what he wants. Megumi would then begin to explain to Yuji that that finger was considered a special grade object, known as Sukuna's finger, and that he needed to give it to him right now. Yuji would ask Megumi what would happen if he didn't give it to him. Megumi would then tell Yuji that he'd be interfering with Jujutsu High School business, and under regulations he'd be considered a cursed user, and Megumi would be forced to take him out. Yuji would smile and ask Megumi if he thinks he could do that. Megumi would think to himself for a moment. This guy just took out a curse that he was hesitating to kill. He wasn't sure if he could beat Yuji or not. Unbeknownst to Megumi though, Yuji would have been absorbing the soul inside of the finger the entire time they were talking. So once he finished absorbing the soul, he would tell Megumi that he doesn't want it anyway and throw the finger at him. Megumi would catch the finger, but notice something was off. The finger wouldn't have that same cursed energy that it had. prior to Yuji touching it, so Megumi would tell Yuji to wait and ask him what he did to the finger. Yuji would let out a long sigh and tell Megumi it's best if he just left this alone. He just found something amazing and it's best that Megumi didn't get in his way. Yuji would then begin to flare his cursed energy and Megumi could feel it. The same energy that was coming off of Sukuna's fingers was now coming off of Yuji. Megumi would then believe that Yuji had consumed a part of Sukuna without completely ingesting the finger and would automatically assume the worst. He would tell Yuji that under Jujutsu regulation, he would be executed right here and now. Just then, Megumi would summon Nue and send it directly at Yuji. Yuji would see the technique and become fascinated. As Nue would come in and try to swoop down on Yuji, he would use his anti-gravity technique, sending the bird straight up into the ceiling, making it crash directly through the ceiling. Yuji would then kick the ground, making rubble fly up. He'd use his anti-gravity on the rubble, keeping it into place. As he'd touch every single last one of the rubble that was in front of him, he'd transform his hand into a bat and swing as hard as he could, making all the rubble fly directly towards Megumi. Just as it'd get in front of Megumi, he would point at the rubble, making it explode, causing Megumi to be blasted back. But Megumi would think fast, using Rabbit Escape to cushion his fall. He would then summon Great Serpent, sending it directly towards Yuji, while also summoning his demon dogs. As Great Serpent would attempt to crash into Yuji, Yuji would again use his anti-gravity technique, stopping the snake in its place. Just then, he would simply put his hand on the snake, turning his leg into a weapon and kicking the snake upwards. He'd then point at the snake and cause it to explode. Megumi would be dumbfounded, but what he didn't realize is that Yuji was scanning him the entire time, trying to understand his technique in its fullest. From what Yuji could gather, Megumi was able to summon different Shikigami, and Yuji was taking a great interest in the ability. Whatever this ability was, he wanted it. So he would use his anti-gravity technique plus his flames to boost himself towards Megumi. By using his anti-gravity technique and using his flames like a jet, he was effectively able to fly through the sky. So he would boost himself directly towards Megumi, sending a flying knee directly towards his face, making Megumi crash into a wall, desummoning his Shikigami. As Megumi would be attempting to get out of the rubble, he would look up and see Yuji directly in front of him. Yuji would stare at Megumi and tell him that his ability was very interesting and that he wants to try it out himself. Yuji would activate his technique, reaching towards Megumi, but just then, Gojo would come out of nowhere, stopping Yuji, grabbing his arm. Yuji would have been confused because this guy came out of nowhere and caught him off guard. He hadn't been caught off guard in a while. As he would turn around and stare at Gojo, he could see it, a soul that he wanted terribly. Even off a glance, he would go in to try to touch Gojo instead. However, the infinity between him and Gojo would stop Yuji completely. Yuji would be confused because he didn't understand what the technique was. All he knew was that the technique was extremely powerful and he wanted it. Yuji would attempt to back up to gain some space between him and Gojo. However, Gojo would then use blue and pull Yuji back in. He would pull Yuji into his infinity and begin to question him, asking Yuji things like who was he and why was he here. Yuji could tell that Gojo was insanely powerful, so he would simply comply for now. He would tell Gojo that he felt an immense amount of cursed energy, so he came over here to figure out what it was. He saw that the large amount of cursed energy was coming from a finger, but he gave it to the other Jujutsu sorcerer. That's when the sorcerer began to attack him. Megumi would yell and tell Gojo that that's not what happened. He would tell Gojo that Yuji had absorbed the energy that was inside of Sukuna's fingers, and he assumed that Yuji had been taken over by Sukuna. So under Jujutsu regulations, he was going to exorcise Yuji as a cursed spirit. Gojo would look around for a second, and then ask both of them what they're going to do. Megumi would then tell Gojo that Yuji was also using multiple curse techniques, with Yuji turning to Megumi and calling him a snitch. Gojo would then begin to stare at Yuji and begin scanning him. He would realize that what Megumi said was absolutely correct. Yuji had a curse technique that allowed him to take other curse techniques and let him utilize them as if they're his own. He would call Yuji interesting and ask Yuji if he planned on taking Megumi's technique. Yuji would stop for a moment and realize this man had broken down his entire technique in just a couple of seconds just by scanning him. This man was an absolute monster, and Yuji knew he couldn't do anything for right now. Yuji would be terrified to lie to Gojo, so he would tell him the truth, saying that yes, he intended on taking Megumi's technique. However, it was only because he felt threatened. Gojo would then sigh and say this just wouldn't do. He would put Yuji down and tell him that he should join Jujutsu High. This is when Megumi would speak up, getting visibly upset, but Yuji would say that he didn't want to join Jujutsu High School at all. It just wasn't something he wanted to do. He didn't want to be confined to a school where he had to listen to old people and follow rules all day. His only objective was to simply get stronger, so he'd do things his way. Gojo would then sit there and stare for a while. Just then, he would teleport in front of Yuji, knocking him out immediately. He would tell Megumi that they were taking him to Jujutsu High School. Even if Yuji didn't want to become a Jujutsu sorcerer, it was way too risky to let him be free and do whatever he wanted. Since technically he consumed one of Sukuna's fingers, the higher-ups would probably place an execution order on his head, but he'll be able to stop it and try to get Yuji to get on their side. And if anything bad happens, he'll just kill Yuji. Megumi would be reluctant, but then agree, seeing as Gojo was still the strongest, so even if Yuji did go array, Gojo would be able to take care of him. Some time would pass and Yuji would wake up. He would be in a room full of seals bound to a chair. With Gojo being there as he woke up, Yuji would be upset and ask Gojo what the hell was going on. Gojo would tell Yuji that under Jujutsu regulation, since he consumed one of Sukuna's fingers, he would have to be executed. Yuji would then tell Gojo that he hadn't consumed a finger at all. Gojo would smile and tell Yuji that that's not what the higher-ups think. He would tell Yuji that the higher-ups want him dead, but Gojo himself, being the benevolent man that he is, put a pause on Yuji's execution. Yuji would sit there and simply stare at Gojo. He would begin to think to himself. He knew eventually that Jujutsu sorcerers would come after him, but this was ridiculous. He was essentially forced to work with the Jujutsu sorcerers right now, otherwise he'd die. Gojo would tell Yuji that he also told the higher-ups about his technique. If he were to take any of the techniques from his dear students, his execution would also be resumed. Yuji would begin to get pissed off. He didn't want to get captured. He didn't want to be here. The second he could find a chance to escape, he would. He hadn't seen Kenjaku in a while, but he knew Kenjaku was planning something. He just hoped that it was soon. So for right now, Yuji would simply play along until he could get out. In his head, he would begin plotting his great escape. Eventually, when the time was right, he would take Megumi's curse technique and then flee. He was simply going to abide his time and wait for the perfect moment to strike. Gojo would then ask Yuji how exactly he took the cursed energy out of Sukuna's finger. Bringing out another finger, he would toss it into the air and use his reversal application red on it. As the finger would blast into the wall, Gojo would tell Yuji to look at the finger. It was practically indestructible since it held so much cursed energy, but Yuji was simply able to take the cursed energy out of the object. He would ask him how was he actually able to do that. He would tell Yuji that he believed that his technique was the ability to take other people's techniques and use it as his own. However, Yuji would tell Gojo that it wasn't that simple. Whenever he looks at somebody, he can see the contours of their soul and the technique that's engraved within them. By using his technique, he's able to separate the engraving on a person's soul and transfer it into his own body. Gojo would then ask Yuji was he able to use reverse curse technique, with Yuji telling him that he's almost there, he just can't quite grasp it yet. Gojo would then ask Yuji does he think Yuji will be able to do the reverse of his technique, allowing him to engrave techniques onto someone else's soul, with Yuji saying he doesn't know. He has to figure it out when he gets there. Gojo would then ask Yuji, what does he see when he looks inside of Gojo's soul? Yuji would then stare at Gojo and scan him. He would tell Gojo that he sees a soul with a barrier around it and a pair of eyes behind it that's seemingly staring directly through his soul. Yuji could only see the barrier, but the eyes were like something completely different. The eyes weren't engraved onto the soul like the ability was. Gojo would say it was interesting, and then he would tell Yuji that they had to wrap things up here. He would then tell Yuji that since the higher-ups believed that he consumed one of Sukuna's fingers, he would have a choice. He could either, technically, consume the rest of Sukuna's fingers and die, or die right now. The choice was all up to him. Yuji would obviously choose the choice that allows him to live longer, so that eventually he could plan his escape and leave. Gojo would then tell Yuji that they would need to meet the principal, and that he would need to give him a satisfying answer in order for him to stay at Jujutsu High. Yuji would ask why, seeing as he really didn't even want to stay. With Gojo telling Yuji that that was a fair point, he would tell him that he would go talk to the principal, and that Yuji can just go to his dorm room. As some time would pass, Yuji would be in his dorm room thinking to himself. He knew that the Jujutsu sorcerers didn't really trust him. However, he would come to the conclusion that he might be sent on missions exactly like Megumi was. And eventually, when that time comes, he'll be able to plan his escape and leave in that moment. A couple of days would pass, and Yuji would be called. He would be going on a mission with Gojo and Megumi to meet the new first year. Yuji knew that he had to go along, but he would still be reluctant on doing everything. But he knew he wouldn't be able to escape this time because Gojo was going with them. When the three of them would reach the area, they would meet the new first year, this being Kugisaki. She would introduce herself and tell them that they better be grateful that she was the only girl on their team. Yuji would let off a long sigh, and so would Megumi. This is when Gojo would tell everyone they would be taking a tour of Tokyo, with Nobara being the only one excited. But just then, Gojo would bring them to an abandoned building, where a curse had taken over the building. Gojo would send both Nobara and Yuji inside of the building. However, just before Yuji was able to go in, Gojo would then tell him to not do anything stupid. It came off as harmless to everybody else, but Yuji knew that this was a warning. Yuji would nod his head and say that he wasn't that stupid. As they would go inside, Nobara would ask Yuji what's up with him and his weird look. Yuji would simply ignore her and tell her that they have a curse that they need to exercise, so stop talking to him. She would begin to get annoyed at Yuji and start yelling at him. With all the commotion she was making, a curse would jump out through the walls, surprising only Nobara. However, Yuji would already be prepared. He would use his anti-gravity technique to keep the curse hovered in the air. He would then place his palm onto the curse's forehead and kick it backwards. He would point at the curse and watch it explode. With Nobara being surprised, she wasn't aware that Yuji was able to use multiple curse techniques. As the curse would have been exercised, Yuji would have let off a long sigh and continued upstairs. Nobara, being surprised that Yuji was able to take out the curse so easily, would quickly follow behind him. As they were heading up the stairs, Yuji would then ask Nobara what her curse technique was. She would begin to explain to him that her curse technique was the straw dog technique. As she would begin to explain her curse technique to Yuji, they would enter a room where there would be numerous mannequins sitting around the room. Nobara would immediately notice that something was off about the one in the middle, with Yuji noticing this as well. Yuji would be about to activate his anti-gravity technique, but Nobara would tell him to wait and that she can take care of this. She would drive her nail into the cursed spirit. As they would wake up, as then she would proceed to use hairpin. Nobara would believe that that was all that was here, but Yuji would tell her to wait. Yuji, not wanting to waste any more time, would tell the kid that was behind the box to come out, and that he didn't need to worry about the curse, because even if it did come out, it was already dead. Just as the kid would come out, the cursed spear would also come out, but Yuji was faster. He was already using his anti-gravity technique on the curse, making it float within the air. He would tell the kid to hurry up over here, as the kid would rush over to Nobara, and Yuji would walk over to the curse, tapping it on its forehead. He would tell Nobara that they could leave now. As they would get down to the bottom of the building, Yuji would then detonate the curse. Yuji hadn't realized, but this was really a test for him. Gojo wanted to see the extent of his skills. He knows Yuji probably didn't go all out, but it was still something. The more info he got on Yuji, the better. He wasn't aware where Yuji came from, who was simply a random kid who had the ability to capture curse techniques for himself. Yuji was an issue, and Gojo knew that. There's no way him and Yuji met just by chance. Even if Yuji wasn't aware of it himself, he knew there was probably somebody behind pulling the strings. As for the rest of the day, the Jujutsu High School students would go about their day. As the next day would come about, Gojo would tell all three of the freshmen that he has somewhere to be. However, he wants them to go group with Ijichi, because they're going to be going on their first mission together. He would then look at Yuji and tell him to make sure that he behaves. Yuji knew that Gojo had his eye on him at all times, but this just might be the break that Yuji needed. Yuji would tell Gojo that he didn't need to worry about him, with Gojo saying he hoped so. Gojo would take his leave, and the three freshmen would go group with Ijichi, as they would be taken to a detention center. Ijichi would tell the group that they had spotted a cursed womb, with Ijichi telling the group that it could potentially spawn a special grade cursed spirit, with Ijichi telling the group that if they encountered the special grade, their only option was to run or die. Yuji, hearing this, would begin to perk up with excitement. Here's a chance for him to get stronger, and maybe even a chance to escape. He had begun to smile. Megumi would notice this, but keep it to himself. As they would enter the detention center, Megumi and Yuji would notice they had entered an innate domain. Megumi would summon his demon dogs and would look at Yuji. He would tell Yuji that he had his eye on him, so not to do anything crazy. Yuji would simply laugh and say that he didn't need to worry. Nobara would be confused to why both Gojo and Megumi would be so suspicious about Yuji. Megumi would then tell the group that his demon dogs would be able to smell any kind of threats, so they didn't need to worry. As they would get deeper in the detention center, Megumi would begin to question Yuji. He would ask him why he even bothered to join Jujutsu High School. Yuji would tell Megumi that he didn't even want to join, that he was forced to thanks to what he said. He would tell Megumi that all the higher-ups believed that he consumed one of Sukuna's fingers when that wasn't the case at all. He would say that he simply absorbed the soul within the finger. Megumi would then tell Yuji that he shouldn't have meddled then. Yuji would get irritated and tell Megumi that he wasn't meddling, he just felt a strong cursed presence and went there. How was he supposed to know that the Jujutsu sorcerers were there? Megumi would tell Yuji that it was his fault anyway, since he wanted to attack him. This is when Yuji would say that he wasn't the one who attacked first. Under your Jujutsu regulations, you decided to attack me based off nothing. They would begin to bicker back and forth, and Nobara would get irritated, screaming at them. Just then, she would be dragged through the floor by a curse. Megumi would turn and be confused as to why his demon dogs didn't sense the threat, but then he'd look to the left and realize that his demon dog was dead. This is just when the special grade curse would jump in between both Yuji and Megumi, with Megumi being frozen in fear, but Yuji would act immediately. This was his one and only chance. He was going to take Megumi's curse technique, and then he was going to kill the special grade curse spirit. Activating his curse technique almost immediately, he would reach for Megumi's neck. He would grab Megumi by the neck, absorbing his curse technique. He would then let off a devious smile. He would then throw Megumi into a wall and turn back around towards the special grade. He was going to end this fight as quickly as possible so he could leave. However, just as he would turn to the special grade spirit, he would realize something. The cursed spirit had one of Sukuna's fingers inside of it. It was just his lucky day. He was able to take Megumi's technique. He would be able to grab another one of Sukuna's fingers, absorbing the soul inside of that one, and be able to escape the grasp of Jujutsu High. Everything was going perfectly for him. He would use his anti-gravity technique on the cursed spirit. Just then, he would transform his hands into whips. He would use his weapons and strike the curse, making contact with the special grade. Just then, he would let off another devious smile. This was something he wanted to try out since he first got it. However, he wanted to keep it a secret. Now was the perfect opportunity to use it. The technique he had gotten from one of Sukuna's fingers. He would transform his whips back into hands and point at the curse. As the curse would explode, he would send multiple dismantles towards the curse, slicing it to ribbons, immediately exorcising it. He would then see the finger fall out of the special grade curse spirit. He would grab the finger and make his move. He didn't care about what happened to Kugasaki. He just wanted to leave. As he was making his way towards the exit, he would absorb the soul within the finger and throw it to the side. He would find the exit of the building and rush out. Ichichi would notice Yuji running outside of the building, but before he could even call out to him, Yuji would have activated his anti-gravity technique plus his flame technique and boosted away. Ichichi would notice that the cursed energy inside of the detention center would have vanished. However, Yuji was the only person to leave out of there, leaving him worried about the other two freshmen. Ichichi would immediately call Gojo and tell him what had happened, saying that he believes Yuji may have killed the other two freshmen inside of there. As a day would pass, the Jujutsu sorcerers would have been able to recover Megumi's body. However, it was simply too late for Kugasaki. Gojo knew that Yuji would try to do something like this. However, he didn't believe that it'd be so soon. He believed that his presence was enough to scare Yuji alone, but sadly, he was incredibly wrong. When Megumi finally woke up, Gojo would immediately ask him if he was okay. Megumi would tell Gojo that he believes that his technique was taken from him, seeing as he was unable to use the 10 Shadows technique anymore. He knew what it was and how to form the hand signs, however, nothing was happening. Megumi was still able to use cursed energy. There was just no technique behind it. Gojo would apologize to Megumi, saying that it was his fault for allowing Yuji to join Jujutsu High School. He should have killed Yuji the first time they had met, with Megumi telling Gojo that it was alright. There's no way that Gojo could have known that this would have happened like this. But with the death of Kugasaki, the Jujutsu higher-ups would have immediately set out an execution order on Yuji Itadori, and it was only to be taken on by special grade Jujutsu sorcerers. Yuji, on the other hand, would have finally made it back to his base of operations, finally excited that he was able to take Megumi's technique. The only one he had left to take was Gojo's, and in doing so, the Jujutsu Society would crumple underneath him. First thing Yuji would do is learn how to use his new curse technique, along with training with the one that Sukuna's fingers had given him. Yuji's only purpose now was to get stronger and find Kenjaku. He would be able to let Kenjaku know of what was going on so they could plan more in the future. Yuji was excited. Just as Yuji would be about to rest, he would hear a knock at his door, but he would be confused because not anyone except for Kenjaku knows where he lives. He would get towards the door and get his curse technique ready. The second he would open the door, he would see a man in a robe with stitches on his forehead. He would look at Yuji and simply tell him hello. Yuji would have been back at his base of operations as he would hear a knock on the door. Yuji would open the door and see a man with stitches on his forehead, just like his mother. The man would say hello and introduce himself. He would say that it was good to see Yuji again. Yuji would immediately realize who this was, putting a genuine smile on his face. He would be excited that Kenjaku had finally returned. It had been over a year, and Yuji was worried that Kenjaku probably would have gotten himself hurt, or even worse. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he wanted him to meet a few people. Curses, precisely. Yuji would ask Kenjaku did he want him to absorb the curses, but Kenjaku would say no, and that they were needed for future plans. Kenjaku would step outside, inviting the curses into Yuji's home. This is where we see Jogo, Hanami, and Dagon enter, with Jogo asking Kenjaku who the brat was. Kenjaku would tell all of them that this was Sukuna's vessel, or more precisely, the boy who absorbed Sukuna's fingers. Jogo would be confused and ask Kenjaku what exactly does he mean. He would explain to Jogo that Yuji was originally supposed to be a vessel for Sukuna in order to house him. However, due to Yuji's innate technique, he essentially could become Sukuna if he wanted to. It didn't matter if he was the vessel or not, as long as Yuji was able to gather all 20 fingers and absorb them inside of his own soul, he could essentially become the next Sukuna. And in doing so, it would allow the golden age of Jujutsu to once return again. Yuji would ask Kenjaku why exactly would they need these curses to thwart their plans. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he has a plan and he wants him to go back to Jujutsu High School. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he can't exactly do that. He had taken the technique of one of the students and he's pretty sure he has an execution order on his head now. If he were to be seen by Gojo or any of the special grades there might be a problem. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he doesn't need him to go in and pose as a student again. He just needs him to be a distraction along with some of the other curses. He would then ask Yuji what was the technique that he took from one of the students, with Yuji telling him that it was the 10 shadows technique. Kenjaku would be astonished. Yuji was able to capture a technique that valuable. He would tell Yuji, in the meantime, while they figure out how they're going to get inside Jujutsu High, Yuji would need to train the technique, as if it was his own. Yuji would say that he pretty much understands the premise of it. So for the next week, Yuji would do exactly that, training the 10 shadows technique, while Kenjaku and the other curses come up with a plan in order to infiltrate Jujutsu High and steal more of Sukuna's fingers. He knows now that Jujutsu High will probably have a strong hold on Sukuna's fingers, seeing as Yuji is known to be the vessel for Sukuna. They probably send Gojo out every now and then to capture one of Sukuna's fingers to make sure he can secure it, so they would have to be extra careful in their planning. At the week's end, Kenjaku and all the curses would gather together, calling Yuji. They would begin to explain their plan to Yuji. Yuji and Hanami are meant to be sent into the Jujutsu High School to distract the both faculty and students, while Mahito and some other curse users will infiltrate Jujutsu High in order to take Sukuna's fingers. Yuji would say that was a pretty sound plan, and he didn't mind getting his hands dirty. There were numerous curse techniques at the school that he didn't get to see, so this would be a great opportunity for him to see more curse techniques and potentially take those as well. Kenjaku would smile and tell Yuji that within the next few days, they would infiltrate Jujutsu High, and for him to be ready. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he couldn't wait. Over at Jujutsu High, Megumi would still be a Jujutsu sorcerer. Things would just be odd for him since he didn't have a technique. Gojo would have already offered Megumi to not be a sorcerer anymore, but Megumi said if he could still help people, he would. The death of his fellow classmate was simply unjust, and Yuji had to be stopped. Even if he couldn't use the 10 shadows anymore, he was going to do everything in his power that he could to stop Yuji. He would get stronger by any means necessary. He had begun training with Maki, using weapons and special grade objects, so he wouldn't be left behind. As a Kyoto school sister event will be around the corner, Megumi would swear to himself that he'll get stronger no matter what happens. For Kugasaki and his sister, and for anybody else who's been cursed by Jujutsu, he would get stronger and make everything right. As the day of the Kyoto Sister School event would come about, Megumi would be pretty satisfied with the strength he had acquired for now, but it wouldn't stop him from getting even stronger. He was going to stop Yuji, and if he ever saw him again, he was going to kill him for killing Kugasaki and taking his technique, unaware that within the next hour, Yuji would be right in front of him. As the Kyoto Sister School event would begin, Maki would lead the charge, saying that she would take care of Todo for now, and for the rest of them to simply worry about taking care of the cursed spirits. She would hold off Todo for as long as she could, and if anything, Panda could switch out with her, and they would figure out the rest from there. Since there is no Sukuna's vessel inside of the school, the Kyoto team would simply do the same thing, go for cursed spirits, and let Todo do all of the work. Even though Megumi didn't have a technique, and they were greatly outnumbered, the Tokyo Jujutsu High team was still doing good. They were taking out some of the cursed spirits, but then suddenly, in the faculty room, all of the flares would begin to light up. They would all turn red, making it known that an unknown force has made its way into the arena. As the faculty would attempt to rush over, Gojo included, they would begin to see a barrier fall over the arena. They would all try to hurry up, but it would be too late. The barrier would have already closed. This is when Utahime and Gakuganji would realize that they were able to enter the barrier, with Gojo Satoru realizing that they had made a barrier to specifically keep Gojo himself out. Everybody else was allowed entrance except for him. He would tell them to go on ahead while he would figure out things from out here. This is when, on the inside, as Maki and Todo would be fighting each other, Yuji would jump in between both of them, stopping their fight abruptly. Maki would immediately realize who this was, seeing as she has heard of him from Megumi, the kid with gray hair and pale gray eyes, and with black dots on his hand. She would immediately tell Todo that this guy was Sukuna's vessel, and that he was the one that took Fushiguro's technique, and that they need to be careful. Yuji would smile and say that he didn't know he was so popular already. Todo would waste no time, however. Seeing that Todo was going to go in, Maki would yell and tell Todo to not let Yuji touch him, as she would be rushing in behind him. Yuji would smile, saying as he wanted to test the 10 shadows on somebody, and he wasn't able to do so in his training week, so now would be the perfect time. He would use his anti-gravity technique plus his flames, shooting himself into the air, floating over both Todo and Maki. He would make hand signs for demon dogs, as they would begin to be summoned from his shadow. As the dogs would come out, they would be these grotesque looking demon dogs. He would mix the flame technique along with the 10 shadows, allowing the shadows to effectively have a cursed energy trait. He wanted to see how those two were able to deal with his demon dogs first, and if they were able to defeat those, it would only get worse from there. He would summon more and more until they couldn't do it anymore. He would send the demon dogs after Maki first, seeing as she had no cursed energy. However, to Yuji's surprise, with Maki using Playful Cloud, she would easily disperse of both of the Shikigami. Just then, Maki would begin to run at Todo. As she would begin to get close to him, she would swing Playful Cloud. Yuji would be confused as to why they would be attacking each other at this moment, but just then, Todo would clap, switching places with himself and Yuji, being directly in the range of Playful Cloud, as Maki would crack Yuji across the face, sending him flying through a tree. Yuji would be confused, but also excited. What was that technique? What made him switch places? What were the requirements for it? He wanted to know everything. Yuji would shoot up from off the ground, using his flames and anti-gravity technique. He would then make hand signs, summoning Rabbit Escape, combining his explosion technique with them. He would send them at Todo, as a large swarm of rabbits would then begin to sprint directly towards Todo. Yuji wanted to see how he was going to swap, and Todo knew that as well. He knew Yuji was watching his every move, so he wasn't going to play to his hand. He would simply run, not knowing what the rabbits were capable of. Todo would be sprinting through the trees, but just then, a rabbit would pop up from one of the trees he was attempting to turn on. But just before it could land on Todo, Todo would kick the rabbit. But unlucky for Todo, the second he would kick the rabbit, it would explode on impact. Yuji would let off a sinister smile, as a swarm of rabbits that were already chasing Todo would begin to catch up, about to pounce on him. Yuji would tell Todo that he has no choice but to use his technique, otherwise he's going to die. Maki would scream out to Todo, telling him that he needs to switch, as Todo would clap, switching himself with Yuji, as all the rabbits would jump on top of him, blowing him up. It had done a good amount of damage to Yuji, but since it was his own technique, it didn't hurt him that badly. Yuji would remark about how smart Todo was, and that he might need to take Todo out first. That technique is troublesome, and he wants it for himself. Maki wasn't much of a problem for him, since she wasn't really that strong. He could easily beat her after he disposed of Todo, so he would make his main focus Todo. Yuji would then use his anti-gravity technique, plus his flames, to fly over to Maki, but Todo was not allowing that to happen. But this is exactly what Yuji wanted. Maki would swing the Playful Cloud again, attempting to strike Yuji, but Yuji would duck underneath it. Yuji would then transform his hands into whips, using his anti-gravity technique to boost himself off of the ground, making it seem like he was going to attack Maki. But just as Todo would be about to clap, Yuji would change the trajectory of his attack, striking the ground. Todo would clap, but this time, nothing would happen. Yuji would be confused as he lands back on the ground, and the floor beneath him would explode. He would then tell Todo that it was good that he didn't show all of his hands in the beginning of their battle. Just then, Yuji would see an arrow traveling directly towards him from a while away. He would attempt to dodge the arrow, but Todo would clap once more, switching places with himself and the arrow, striking Yuji directly in the face. Yuji would laugh and say that that technique is so confusing. Yuji would then make hand signs, summoning Nue, combining his anti-gravity technique with Nue. He was going to send it after Maki again, hoping that Todo would switch out with her. And just as he had hoped, Todo would do exactly that, switching out with Maki, attempting to tank the hit from Nue. He would raise his guard and reinforce his body with cursed energy. But just as Nue would strike, Todo would begin floating in the air. Yuji would begin to smile, summoning Great Snake, which had been combined with Demon Dogs, since Maki had just killed them. So with the snake being even faster, it would zip straight over to Todo, and before Todo was able to get another clap off, the snake would crash directly into him, slamming him into a tree. Yuji would laugh and say finally. However, he would look around him and see the rest of the Jujutsu High students surrounding him. He would look at all of them and laugh. Then he would see Megumi and begin laughing even harder. He would mock Megumi for not having a curse technique anymore and ask him if he's really determined to get stronger in order to beat him, because he's gotten a little bigger since the last time they've met. Megumi would be equipped with a jet black blade. He would tell Yuji not to look down on him simply because he doesn't have a curse technique anymore. He was still strong in his own regard, and he was going to take revenge for Kugasaki. Yuji would stare at Megumi and ask who the hell is that. This would piss Megumi off. But before anybody can get another word off, Panda would come in his gorilla form, attempting to swipe at Yuji. Yuji would duck underneath the swipe, but just then, Inumaki would scream, "Don't move," as Yuji would be stuck in place. Noritoshi would then use his blood manipulation, attempting to use Crimson Binding to trap Yuji. However, just before the binding can trap Yuji, he would be freed from Inumaki's grasp, seeing that the blowback for Inumaki was a lot larger than he expected. He didn't realize that Yuji had an immense amount of curse energy, and one word like that was enough to rip his throat to shreds. Just before the binding had reached Yuji, Yuji would make hand signs, summoning Rabbit Escape again, making sure to use his explosion technique along with it. As he would smack his hand onto the ground, the rabbits would begin to flood out of his shadow, going in every single direction. Yuji would let off a smile. He would make sure he sent it to everybody except for Megumi. As the rabbits would swarm, they would touch every last one of the other students. The rabbits would create a large explosion, as the faculty would see it from far away, but they were dealing with Hanami at the moment, so they couldn't interact with the students. Megumi would be the only one left sitting there that wasn't incapacitated. Yuji hadn't killed anybody. He just wanted to test out his 10 shadows. That was the only reason he was here. Megumi would look around as the smoke would clear. He would see all of his fellow classmates and his other Jujutsu sorcerers on the ground. He would feel helpless yet again. Yuji would walk over and laugh at Megumi, calling him weak. He would tell Megumi that he better be lucky that he hadn't killed anyone yet. He was feeling nice, and he was only going to take techniques today. There were a couple that he had seen, and he wants them. Megumi would grit his teeth and tell Yuji that he wasn't going to be taking anyone else's technique today. Yuji would grin and proceed to tell Megumi that by all means he could attempt to stop him, but it will be absolutely pointless. As Megumi would take one step forward, Yuji would stick his hand out and dart towards Megumi. Just before Yuji was able to touch Megumi, Yuji would hear a clap once again. Yuji would smile and turn around and say that he knew that he wasn't going to be down for long. Todo would have swapped Megumi's place with Playful Cloud. He had only been knocked out for a little bit, but it wasn't anything serious. Todo would apologize to Yuji for not taking him seriously, but now he would use everything that he has. Todo would ask Megumi if he was ready, with Megumi nodding to Todo, saying that he'll put full faith in him. Todo would clap his hands and tell Megumi to not stop moving. Megumi would nod, rushing straight in at Yuji. Megumi would go in for a right hook, and Todo would clap. Yuji would turn around, thinking that he was going to swap him with something else, but nothing happened. He would get punched in the right side of his ribcage, with Yuji turning around, attempting to swipe at Megumi, but Todo would clap again, swapping his place with Megumi, ducking underneath the punch, sending an uppercut of his own. This would take Yuji off guard, sending him up in the air, as Todo would scream, signaling Maki, as she would be seen jumping from one of the trees with Playful Cloud. She would swing down, cracking Yuji on the top of his head, smashing him into the ground, as Todo would clap again, using Maki's momentum to slam down on Yuji. Yuji would attempt to grab Todo, but Todo would clap again. Megumi would have thrown a rock, infused with cursed energy, straight towards Yuji. Todo would have used the momentum of the rock to strike Yuji once again, sending him back quite a bit. Yuji would begin to smile. He would begin to smile so hard that the sides of his mouth would begin to rip. He was so excited. These Jujutsu sorcerers were pushing him, and he couldn't be any more excited. Most people would be terrified that they're losing, that they weren't able to do anything. But instead of being afraid, something would have clicked inside of Yuji's head. He understood it now, as all three of them would begin to rush towards Yuji. Yuji would activate his anti-gravity technique, but instead of it activating as regular, he would activate the reverse. As Maki, Megumi, and Todo would slam into the ground, Yuji would begin to cackle. He finally understood it now. While getting beat, he was formulating numerous calculations in his head, trying to figure out what was the best possible thing to do in this moment. And of course it would be to figure out reverse curse technique. Even though he hadn't shown everything in his arsenal and probably could have easily wiped them all out, he was limiting himself for this exact reason. The greed that he has for himself to grow in mid-battle is the catalyst that allowed him to unlock reverse curse technique. He didn't understand it before, but now he finally got it. He would look at Toto and tell him that it was his lucky day. He just unlocked something amazing, and so many techniques just flooded into his head all at once. And since he wasn't able to register all those techniques at once, Toto's technique was safe for now. But he would look over at Megumi and tell him that he's feeling extremely nice. He wanted to test this with Kenjaku, but he'd rather just do it now. He would bend down, getting on Megumi's level, and tell him, "I'm not going to give you back your own technique, but I will give you a technique." He would then take the anti-gravity technique off Megumi alone, wrapping his hand around his throat. As his hand would begin to glow red, the flame technique that he took from the first cursed period, he would begin to transfer it inside of Megumi. He would tell Megumi that there were numerous things he could do with that technique. However, it was one of the weaker ones in his arsenal, and he planned on taking a stronger one later anyway. Yuji would throw Megumi to the side and say that he'd better be lucky he got something in return. Just then, the veil that was placed around Jujutsu High would then begin to break. Everybody would look up and see Gojo Satoru. Yuji would look back down at Megumi and tell him that he's extremely lucky today. Everybody gets to live, and you get another curse technique. Hanami would then appear before Yuji and tell them that they had to go. He would tell the curse not to nag him and that he knows. But just before he leaves, he would tell Megumi to continue getting stronger, because the next time they meet, he will kill him. Gojo would attempt to launch a purple. However, both Yuji and Hanami would get out before the attack even had the chance to reach their area. This would have been an overwhelming feat for the Jujutsu High School students, with the mission to steal Sukuna's fingers and other cursed objects going successfully. As Yuji and Hanami reached back to the hideout, they would meet up with Geto, Mahito, and Jogo. Kenjaku would notice that Yuji had gotten significantly stronger and ask him what exactly happened. Yuji would tell Kenjaku about how he unlocked reverse curse technique and about how he's able to apply the reverse to all of his techniques, even his innate one. Kenjaku would let off a devious smile. He knew it was possible. He would then tell Yuji that they have a lot more planning to do. Yuji would need to get even stronger because they would need his help in sealing Satoru Gojo. They were able to steal 10 fingers from Jujutsu High. Yuji could take those and consume the soul inside of them, making his shrine technique even stronger. Then over time, while they're planning on how they're going to seal Satoru Gojo, Kenjaku would tell Yuji of where other fingers will be, so he can consume those and get stronger as well. Mahito would be confused and ask Jogo and Kenjaku why don't they just actually find an actual vessel for Sukuna to be reawakened. They don't need some brat walking around as if he's Sukuna himself. They need the actual king of curses so the new world can actually begin. Someone like Yuji won't be able to make that happen. Yuji would question Mahito, asking him why exactly do they need the king of curses? Why is Sukuna so important? Yuji would tell Mahito that he would be able to make the new world happen. He doesn't need the king of curses or anyone with some crazy title to their name. All they need is him and Kenjaku's power. He would tell Mahito to sit and behave and stop being a nuisance. Mahito would get irritated with Yuji, calling him a nobody. Yuji would say the same to Mahito, calling him an unnamed curse who just happened to be born recently. He doesn't know why these curses believe themselves to be human anyway. They're just clumps of cursed energy that just happen to be able to think. Jogo, Hanami, and Mahito would flare up and get angry at Yuji for saying this. Jogo would tell Yuji that they were the true humans and that everyone else is just a fake. Yuji would laugh and tell Jogo if that was the case, why is it that humans like him are the ones that are in control of the world instead of clumps of cursed energy like him? Kenjaku would tell everybody to calm down and that fighting amongst each other wasn't the right thing to do. Yuji, Jogo, and Hanami would calm themselves down, but Mahito couldn't calm himself down. Someone like Yuji needed to be taken care of. They could do everything themselves. They didn't need a brat like him around. Mahito told himself that he was going to take care of Yuji and continue on with the plan without him. They don't need an arrogant brat like him going into the new world with them. Back over at Jujutsu High, Megumi would have woken up in a bed once again. He would have been confused. The last thing he remembers is Yuji telling him to get stronger. and that the next time that they fought each other, he would die. All of a sudden, Megumi could feel a technique being engraved inside of his head, as if it was already there. He would use the curse technique, and flames would begin to spew out of his hands. Yuji had really gave him a curse technique and wanted him to get stronger with it. It wasn't the 10 shadows, but it was still something. Gojo would walk into the room and ask Megumi if he was okay. Megumi would scratch his head and say this is deja vu. Gojo would laugh, seeing as Megumi was trying to brighten the room. Gojo would say, all jokes aside, was Megumi really alright? Megumi would say, yeah, he's even better than alright. He would tell Gojo to look at him. As Gojo would begin to scan him, he would realize that Megumi had a curse technique again. But it wasn't the 10 shadows. Gojo would kinda be amazed due to the fact that Yuji was able to come here and learn reverse curse technique on the brink of defeat, but also know that he failed again in trying to kill Yuji. It was a miracle that no one else had died or Yuji didn't take anyone else's technique, but they would need to set up extra precautions and call back Yuta, because it was obvious that no one except for a special grade will be able to take on Yuji, and they needed Gojo at Jujutsu High just in case Yuji was to infiltrate again. They realized that Yuji and Hanami were simply a distraction so that the others that they were working with could steal more of the fingers for Yuji. Megumi would swear up and down that he would get stronger, even with this weaker technique. Even if it wasn't the 10 shadows, he would make it his own and turn it into something stronger than it was. He would become greedy exactly like Yuji was. Meanwhile, Yuji would have consumed all of the fingers that they had taken from the Jujutsu High School, making his shrine technique even stronger than it already was. He had absorbed a total of 13 fingers inside of him right now, and Kenjaku had just told him that there were 2 more fingers nearby that he could go and absorb. Mahito would have been plotting behind Kenjaku's back in order to try to kill Yuji. He was going to follow Yuji unknowingly and kill him whenever he got the chance. As Yuji would get to the location, he could sense the presence of Sukuna's fingers there. He would be walking through a forest, and there would be a large gathering of cursed energy underneath a bridge passageway. As he would take a step into the passway, the surrounding area around him would begin to change. Yuji would have realized that he would have entered the curse's innate domain. As Yuji would be looking around, scanning the area for anything, a beam of blood would begin to fly directly towards Yuji's face. But just in the nick of time, he would dodge out of the way. Just then, he could feel it. It was something just like Sukuna's finger inside of the cursed spirit that was sitting right in front of him. If he was able to kill this curse, he would be able to take 2 of Sukuna's fingers as well as whatever was inside of this curse. It was another type of technique and he couldn't wait to grasp it. It would only add to his arsenal and make him even stronger. Yuji would sit back and smile. He was going to make this quick. Yuji would have entered the innate domain and gotten himself ready to fight the cursed spirit that was in front of him. Yuji said that he was going to make this fast and absorb the technique that was inside of the cursed spirit, and he would attempt to do exactly that. But before Yuji could get the chance to do anything, the curse would already be rushing towards him. Using blood manipulation, it would begin to use convergence, jumping at Yuji while clapping its hands together. Yuji would be taken off guard by how fast the curse was moving, but it wouldn't stop him. Just as the curse would be about to shoot off a piercing blood, Yuji would use the reversal anti-gravity technique, causing the curse to crash into the ground, dispersing its piercing blood attack. Yuji would be about to land his hand on top of the curse to finish it off. However, just before he got the chance, another curse would swoop in, attempting to grab onto Yuji. Yuji would dodge out of the way and look to where the curse was. He would realize it would be Mahito, the same curse that was arguing with him when he was with Kenjaku. Yuji would begin to laugh. He didn't realize Mahito had the guts in order to do something like this, but he was all for it. Mahito was simply another pawn to Yuji, someone he could use later on down the line. While still holding the other curse with his anti-gravity technique, he would begin to ask Mahito some questions. He would ask Mahito, what exactly does he think he's going to accomplish here? Yuji knew that he was way stronger than Mahito, so there was no need for him to take him seriously at all. He didn't understand Mahito's logic and why he would attempt to ambush him here. However, before Mahito could say a word to Yuji, Jogo and Hanami would appear, with Jogo telling Yuji that they told Mahito not to go ahead like this. Yuji would smile and ask all of them, are they here to kill him or just get in his way? Just then, the curse that Yuji was holding with his anti-gravity reversal technique would begin to let out a blood-curdling scream, causing all of the cursed spirits to cover their ears besides Yuji. It would have created numerous convergence orbs in the air, with all of them beginning to fly towards Yuji. As the blood would get near Yuji, Yuji would notice that the convergence orbs were bubbling, and the second they got near Yuji, they would explode. This would throw Yuji a little off guard, causing him to release his reversal technique, freeing the curse, allowing it to get up. Just then, the same curse would go over with the other curses, standing back over towards them. This is when Yuji would realize what was going on. He would ask all of them what their issue was and why they wanted to kill him, with the curses saying that they were going to extract Sukuna's fingers from inside of him, or force him to make his fingers into cursed objects like Sukuna did, in order to gain a new vessel for Sukuna. They would feed some of the original fingers to a host itself, and then use the rest of the fingers from Yuji in order to make sure Sukuna was able to get stronger. Yuji would laugh and call all of the curses idiots. If they wanted to fight him, all they had to do was ask earlier, instead of waiting all this time. Yuji would tell the curses that he would have been happy to kill them and extract their techniques for himself. But then again, he would tell the curses that he doesn't want to fight them, not yet at least. This fight would have to wait until Satoru Gojo had been sealed. The new world that they seek to create would not be possible as long as he was around. They could kill Yuji, sure, but as long as Gojo was alive and kicking, the age of curses will never come. Jogo would kiss his teeth, realizing that Yuji could potentially be correct. They could kill Yuji here, sure, but without the manpower that Yuji himself has, will they actually be able to take on Satoru Gojo? Yuji is essential to their plan in order to create the new world. No matter how much they hate him, they still need him. However, Mahito wasn't hearing any of it. He wanted Yuji to die, and they were going to revive the actual Sukuna, not some brat that Kenjaku had cooked up. Jogo would then tell Mahito that even if they did fight Yuji here, there's no guaranteed chance that they will win this fight. Mahito would say that there were 4 of them and 1 of Yuji. They would easily be able to take him on, especially if he wasn't someone like Gojo. However, Jogo would tell Mahito to look at Yuji and ask him, does he look even the slightest bit worried? Mahito would look over and see Yuji doing nothing but simply smiling. Mahito would then speak up and tell Yuji he's going to offer him a deal. Yuji would tell Mahito that he was intrigued and that he was listening. Mahito would tell Yuji that if he were able to beat both him and the blood curse, he would be able to take both of their techniques and consume the fingers that were inside of the blood curse spirit. However, if Mahito and the spirit were to lose, he would at least promise him this, that he at least makes the new world happen along with Jogo and Hanami. However, if Yuji was to lose, Yuji would give up the fingers that he had consumed already in order for Sukuna to reawaken himself. Yuji would smile, knowing what Mahito's technique was. He had wanted Mahito's technique since the first time he saw him, but he couldn't do anything since Kenjaku said he had needed him. But if Yuji had the technique, everything would still be okay. This was Yuji's lucky day. He was going to be getting 2 fingers, a blood manipulation curse technique, and Mahito's technique. Yuji would begin to smile ear to ear. He would tell Mahito that he agrees on his offer, and that if he wins, he promises that he'll help both Jogo and Hanami make the new world happen. Jogo would tell Mahito that this was pointless and unneeded. However, Mahito would tell Jogo to leave it alone. Mahito would then tell Jogo and Hanami to leave, and just to wait at the base where Kenjaku was. Whenever everything was over, they'd know who won or not. Jogo would tell Mahito that this was stupid, and to try not to get himself killed. Him and Hanami would then prepare to take their leave, as Yuji would let off another sinister smile. He couldn't wait to take Mahito's technique. He had already thought he was getting a bonus with the blood manipulation. However, being able to take auto transfiguration from Mahito will be an even bigger bonus. As Jogo and Hanami would leave, Yuji would ask Mahito, what is he waiting for? The blood cursed spirit would begin to snarl, as Mahito would tell Yuji that he better get ready, because Mahito wasn't going to hold anything back. He was ready to die here, along with all of his ideals. Mahito would begin to rush in at Yuji, with the blood cursed spirit beginning to use conversions and clapping his hands together. Just then, Yuji would use hand signs, summoning the giant snake. It would rush out of his shadow, attempting to crash right into Mahito. However, Mahito would jump right over the snake and begin to clash with Yuji. Yuji would smile and use his anti-gravity technique, launching Mahito into the air. He would then turn his hand into a spear, cutting it off at the same time. He would grab his hand spear with his other arm, activating his explosion technique onto it. Just then, Yuji would hear piercing blood coming from the blood cursed spirit, but before the piercing blood could go off, Yuji's snake would wrap around, crashing into the blood cursed spirit, slamming him into a wall. Yuji would then take the spear he had imbued with his exploding technique and throw it up at Mahito. It would strike Mahito right in the chest as Yuji would point up into the air, causing the spear to explode. Mahito would be blown into multiple little pieces. However, Mahito was going to attempt to use this to his advantage. He would turn each one of his pieces into a miniature him, causing them to be spread out all throughout the innate domain. At the same time, the blood-cursed spirit would then use slicing exorcism to slice directly through the snake, causing the Shikigami to be desummoned. As there would be a bunch of mini Mahitos running around, Yuji couldn't figure out which one was the real Mahito. Being distracted by the mini Mahitos, it was the perfect setup for the blood-cursed spirit. It would fire off a piercing blood that would jet straight towards Yuji. However, Yuji this time would barely realize that it was coming. He would attempt to block it with one of his arms. However, it would then begin to pierce into his arm. Yuji, feeling the blood piercing through his arm, would begin to deflect the attack. However, just from behind him, Mahito would strike him in the back, luckily landing a black flash onto Yuji. Yuji would be sent forward into the blood-cursed spirit, as the spear would then activate flowing red scale stack, throwing a punch directly towards Yuji. However, just before Yuji would be caught by the punch, he would catch himself, ducking underneath the swing, hitting a wall, landing on his feet. He would then use his explosion technique, blowing up the wall and jumping off of it at the same time. Using the technique for more momentum, he would rocket straight towards the blood-cursed spirit, tackling the spirit, crashing it into the ground. Yuji would then again use his anti-gravity technique reversal. He would then jump into the air using hand signs to summon Max Elephant, along with combining his anti-gravity technique reversal with it. Summon the elephant from a high altitude to crash onto the blood spirit. He would desummon the Shikigami using anti-gravity technique reversal on himself, crashing down into the blood-cursed spirit. Mahito, seeing this, would attempt to try to gain another attack off on Yuji. However, Yuji would see him this time, sending dismantles his way yet again, slashing Mahito in two. Yuji would then bend down, activating his innate technique, using it on the blood manipulation curse, absorbing both of Sukuna's fingers, plus the soul that had blood manipulation. He would then smile and look at Mahito, who was on the floor trying to recover from the slash. Since Yuji was able to perceive the soul, it was hard for Mahito to not take any kind of damage from him. Mahito would have recovered, but by the time he had recovered, Yuji had already downloaded the information from the other technique into his brain. Wanting to use his new technique right away, he would activate convergence, making a blood orb right in front of him. He would then clap onto the orb and say piercing blood, as the blood would jet out straight towards Mahito, piercing him directly in the chest. Yuji would then pull his hands up, causing the piercing blood to split Mahito in two yet again. As Mahito would drop to the floor, Yuji would sigh. He would ask Mahito if this was really worth it. Mahito, reforming himself, would tell Yuji everything he does is calculated and worth it. He doesn't want a lecture from a brat like him. Yuji would then walk over to Mahito and touch him on the neck, telling Mahito that if this is how he wanted to die, then so be it. He would begin to use his innate technique on Mahito. However, nothing would happen. Yuji would be confused, as just then, from behind Yuji, another Mahito would strike Yuji in the back, cracking him with a black flash. Mahito would laugh and ask Yuji, did he really think he was that stupid? Did he really think that he was going to let himself get caught and lose that easily to someone like him? Yuji must have been out of his mind. Mahito would tell Yuji that he didn't put everything on the line for a reason. He's fighting for a cause, while Yuji is simply fighting for fun. The two black flashes from Mahito would cause a sudden awakening inside of his soul. He didn't need a domain. He just needed something that was going to be able to kill Yuji right here and now. Mahito would then put his hands over his face, transferring his body into something that he's never done before. His soul cried out for the power in order to defeat Yuji, and the two black flashes allowed him to do so. As the violent transformation would end, Mahito would have armor all around his body, but he would look more slim. He would have hand-like wings coming out of his back as well. Mahito would tell Yuji that he better get ready because he wasn't going to be holding anything back. Mahito would tell Yuji that he was going to transform him into one of his strongest transfigured humans. As Yuji would smile and begin to laugh and say that this is exactly what he wanted, he's thankful that Mahito wasn't going to go down this easily. They would both begin to rush in at each other. However, Yuji would be caught off guard by Mahito's sudden increase in speed. Before Yuji could even blink, Mahito was already in front of him, throwing a punch straight towards Yuji's face. It would connect, cracking Yuji right across the jaw. Yuji would yet again be caught off guard by the sudden increase of strength as well. It was as if Mahito's speed and strength had increased tenfold. Mahito would then swing with his left, cracking Yuji across the face again. He would grab Yuji and knee him in the stomach, taking one of his arms and throwing him into a wall. Yuji would crash into the wall, but he was already prepared. Just as he hit the wall, he would use hand signs, summoning Rabbit Escape, making sure they were imbued with his explosion technique. He would send them towards Mahito. However, As the rabbits would begin to rush towards Mahito, he would sprint straight through them, with the wind pressure from his speed causing all of the rabbits to explode. Yuji would begin to smile as Mahito would be right in front of him again, cracking Yuji in the stomach, causing Yuji to cough up blood. Yuji, however, wouldn't falter from this. He would begin to use anti-gravity reversal. As Mahito would begin to feel the weight, it wouldn't slam him down as it did before, but he was still barely able to move within it. Yuji would then swing his fist, cracking Mahito in the face. Using blood manipulation, he would then begin to use flowing red scale, increasing his speed and strength as well. He would begin to combo Mahito. He would send a left hook, as Mahito would take the brunt of the attack, sending a left of his own. They would both crack each other across the face, sending each other backwards. Just as they both would do so, Yuji would then use convergence again. While activating his explosion technique onto the blood, he would clap his hands onto the convergence orb, as Mahito would take a stance, both of them waiting for the other to make a move. Mahito would be the first one though. He would rush in as fast as he could, with Yuji noticing and sending a piercing blood directly at Mahito. However, the speed of the piercing blood was faster than Mahito thought it was going to be. Mahito would just barely dodge out of the way, getting nicked on his arm. However, that's when Yuji would point at Mahito's arm. Just then, the blood that struck Mahito's arm would explode, causing Mahito's arm to be blown off. Yuji would then rush in, but Mahito was already ready for Yuji. He would regenerate his arm, sending a palm directly towards Yuji. He would touch Yuji and attempt to use Idol Transfiguration, but something weird would happen. Mahito felt Idol Transfiguration work on Yuji. However, the soul that Yuji had collected that allowed him to change his hands into weapons would have completely vanished from his body. Yuji would feel this and realize Mahito is a direct counter to his innate technique. Mahito's ability to be able to reshape the soul was counteracting Yuji's ability to be able to store the souls inside of his body. With Mahito using Idol Transfiguration to try to rapidly disform his soul, it would effectively destroy the soul inside of Yuji's body. Yuji, feeling the soul and technique be stripped from his body, would immediately realize that Mahito is a problem. If Mahito was able to touch him again, he could potentially destroy every last one of the souls that he has inside of his body. Yuji was able to protect his own innate soul, but the other ones he wasn't able to protect. Yuji knew that he had to lock in, otherwise all of his techniques would be gone by the end of this fight. Mahito and Yuji would push off of each other and begin to stare each other down. Yuji would look at Mahito with an absolutely concentrated face. He would not allow Mahito to touch him ever again. He doesn't want to risk losing Sukuna's technique or the anti-gravity technique. Mahito would let off a sinister smile and ask Yuji, where's his smile at? He thought Yuji was having fun. Yuji would then proceed to activate Flowing Red Scale Stack, not saying a single thing, rushing in at Mahito. Mahito would begin to laugh, rushing in at Yuji as well. Mahito would swing his hand, attempting to touch Yuji again. However, Yuji would sidestep the attack, grabbing onto Mahito's arm and using Cleave. It would blow off Mahito's arm, as Mahito would attempt to swing with his other. Yuji would duck underneath it, sweeping Mahito's leg. As Mahito would fall to the ground, Yuji would kick Mahito in the chest, sending him flying backwards. Just then, Yuji would use hand signs, summoning Nue, infusing the bird with his anti-gravity technique. Nue would swoop over and strike Mahito, causing him to float in the air. Yuji would then make another pair of hand signs, summoning Max Elephant above where Mahito was, imbuing Max Elephant with the anti-gravity reversal technique. As Mahito was floating through the air, he wouldn't be able to dodge this attack. The elephant would land on top of Mahito at a crushing speed, slamming him into the ground, cracking majority of his armor. Just then, Max Elephant would be desummoned, as Yuji would be above Mahito, already falling down, using anti-gravity reversal on himself. Mahito would attempt to get up, but it was far too late. Yuji would crash down on top of Mahito, caving his chest in, as well as hitting him with a black flash. This attack would destroy Mahito's armor completely, while also putting a hole through Mahito's chest. Yuji would then stare down at Mahito and ask him, was he still having fun? Because he is. Mahito would begin to laugh and attempt to touch Yuji, but Yuji would jump into the air, as Mahito would begin to regenerate his stomach. Mahito would begin to laugh again, as Yuji would be standing across from him. He would ask Mahito what's so funny, as Mahito would be thinking to himself that he only has one more chance, one more gamble, as that last attack nearly killed him. He would tell Yuji that he has one more thing. Mahito would lock eyes with Yuji. Just then, he would open his mouth and say domain expansion. However, Yuji would simply say no, sending a bunch of slashes towards Mahito, using Dismantle over and over, before Mahito even had the chance to actually put his domain up. The cuts weren't meant to go through Mahito, they were simply meant to stop him from activating his domain, causing enough damage to where Yuji will still be able to extract the technique from Mahito. Mahito would be on the ground, still smiling. He would tell Yuji that he had a fun fight, even though he was only recently born. He experienced so much as a curse, and especially from this fight. He would tell Yuji to make sure that he keeps his vow, as Mahito's soul will now be bounded to him. Yuji would tell Mahito to shut up and to give him his technique, understanding that he knows he has to uphold his end of the vow with Mahito. He would activate his innate technique, grabbing Mahito by the neck, and begin to absorb Mahito's soul, taking idol transfiguration for himself. Yuji would look down at his hands and take a deep breath. He would think back on what Mahito had said earlier to him, about how he was only fighting for fun, as Mahito was fighting for a cause. Yuji couldn't understand or wrap his head around it. Yuji had always felt as if he was following a script in his life, something that someone else had wrote for him. Yuji could feel deep down that he was never really in control. However, after this fight with Mahito, it would all come full circle. It was all simply for fun for Yuji. Sure, he was following what Kenjaku wanted him to do, but was that really what Yuji wanted to do? Before he would go back to where his hideout was, he would ponder on this one thought alone. Kenjaku wanted to make a new world, but where would Yuji sit when this new world was created? Once everything done, would Kenjaku simply throw Yuji aside, or will he allow Yuji to sit at the top? Yuji didn't know exactly what Kenjaku had planned. Kenjaku barely told him anything anyway. He only told Yuji what he needed to hear in the moment. Not wanting to get too deep in his own mental, Yuji would shake these thoughts away for now. He would simply return back to his hideout. Jogo, Dagon, and Hanami would see Yuji walking through the doors and understand what had happened. Kenjaku would ask Yuji where Mahito was. Yuji would point to his hands and tell Kenjaku that he absorbed Mahito. Kenjaku would give Yuji a serious look. He would ask Yuji if he was able to use idol transfiguration like Mahito did. Yuji would stare back at Kenjaku and tell him should he test it out on him. With Kenjaku taking a step back, however, Yuji would let off a smile and say that he was just kidding. He would tell Kenjaku that he's able to use it properly, so there's nothing he needs to worry about. They need to focus more on their plan on how to capture Satoru Gojo. Kenjaku would let off a nervous laugh and tell Yuji that they need to do exactly that. Kenjaku would tell the group that on October 31st, they would put a veil over Shibuya, attracting the Jujutsu sorcerers and hoping that Gojo falls for the bait. They would take hostage of multiple civilians and demand that Satoru Gojo would come forth. He would say that he needed Yuji, Jogo, and Hanami in order to distract Gojo while he gets the prison realm prepared. Jogo and Hanami would ask Kenjaku how long do they need to stall out the monster for, with Kenjaku telling them that they need to stall him for at least 1 minute. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he doesn't need Jogo or Hanami to help him. He would stall Gojo for 1 minute himself. If anything, the other two can go around causing havoc in Shibuya. Kenjaku would tell Yuji that he shouldn't put himself at risk like that. Yuji would tell Kenjaku that he doesn't need to worry about him. Yuji would tell the group that he will take care of Gojo Satoru alone. He would tell Kenjaku to get the prison realm ready, and that before the 31st happens, he has some things he needs to prepare. He would tell all of the cursed spirits and Kenjaku to not bother him until the 31st. Yuji would remember that he has one more summon that he needs to tame in the 10 Shadows technique, and with his current abilities, he's positive that he'll be able to tame this one. Kenjaku would then tell Yuji that after they seal Satoru Gojo, Kenjaku would need Yuji's help in order to find Tengen. Yuji would ask who that was, with Kenjaku simply telling Yuji that Tengen was someone who maintains balance in the world. He would tell Yuji that they need help finding them in order to throw the world out of balance. And when everything is said and done, Yuji can become the new king of curses. Yuji would stare at Kenjaku, realizing that he still wasn't telling him everything. But he wouldn't press Kenjaku at all. He would simply tell Kenjaku that he was going to help him find Tengen. But deep inside of Yuji's mind, he couldn't help but still think on what Mahito was saying to him and what he was thinking about earlier. Who exactly was Kenjaku? He knows Kenjaku gave birth to him. However, whatever Kenjaku was, it wasn't the woman that raised him. Kenjaku was something, and Yuji wanted answers. Yuji wanted to know what his role was in everything. Where did he actually stand within all of this? Was he actually meant to be the new king of curses, or was he simply a pawn playing in the palm of Kenjaku's hands? Yuji would find everything out. Even if not now, he would figure it out eventually. Yuji wasn't stupid. He would think to himself and tell himself that Satoru Gojo probably knows a lot about Jujutsu Society or what's going on within it. When they interact with each other, Yuji would simply ask Gojo about everything and ask him if he knows about Kenjaku, although Gojo might not exactly talk to him. Yuji would scratch his head and say that he may have messed up. he would take a deep breath and smack himself with both of his hands, attempting to get himself out of his head. The only thing Yuji could confirm for certain is that he was destined for greatness. Yuji would tell himself that he wasn't going to follow the rules of anybody anymore. He was going to do things according to how he wanted to do them. After they seal Satoru Gojo, Yuji was going to take control of everything, and he would make absolutely sure of it. As a week would pass, Yuji would still be training his abilities. He would then believe it was finally time to summon his final Shikigami in order to attempt to tame him. Yuji would make hand signs and take a deep breath. He would then proceed to say, "With this treasure I summon 8-handled sword divergent, Scylla Divine, General Maharaga." As wolves and frogs would begin to stand around him, the wolves would begin to howl, and the frogs would begin to bleat. Maharaga would stand tall behind Yuji. Yuji would look up straight at the beast. As without a second wasted, Maharaga would immediately swing down onto Yuji. Yuji would catch its fist and use dismantle on the beast, slicing it numerous times in the chest. However, the beast wouldn't stagger and simply swing again. He would strike Yuji in the chest, sending him backwards quite a bit. Yuji would then activate Flowing Red Scale and begin to use convergence. Maharaga would jump directly towards Yuji, attempting to strike him again, but Yuji was prepared, hardening the blood around his hand. He would make blood-like gauntlets, blocking the strike from Maharaga, placing his hand on Maharaga's chest and proceeding to use cleave. Maharaga's chest would get sliced open again, but all of a sudden, Yuji would hear a clicking sound. He would look up and see the wheel on Maharaga's head begin to turn. Yuji would raise his eyebrow at this, but he couldn't take his eyes off the fight. Maharaga had seemingly regenerated his entire body and would rush at Yuji again. He would pick up one of the trees that were near him and throw it at Yuji. Yuji would use cleave on the tree, slicing it into two, as Maharaga would be right behind the tree, throwing another punch, hitting Yuji directly in the face. Yuji would take the attack head on, punching Maharaga in the face himself. He would then begin to combo Maharaga. Maharaga would swing its right, however Yuji would duck underneath it, taking his right and hitting Maharaga in the stomach. Maharaga would attempt to swing backwards with his right hand again. However, Yuji would catch it, swinging over Maharaga's arm and kicking him in the face, sending him into some trees. Yuji would then send more slashes directly towards Maharaga, cutting the entire top half of his body into smithereens. However, yet again, the wheel on Maharaga's head would begin to turn. Yuji would kiss his teeth as he would see Maharaga regenerating itself again. This fight was a lot harder than he thought it was going to be. Maharaga would rush in, but this time seemingly faster than he was before. But Yuji would use his anti-gravity technique reversal, slamming him into the ground. Yuji would then use convergence, putting a bunch of blood orbs above Maharaga, imbuing his explosion technique inside of the blood. He would then use supernova on the blood, causing the blood to explode, striking Maharaga on every part of its body. He would then point at Maharaga, as the blood that had struck Maharaga would then explode once again, causing a huge explosion to where Maharaga was laying at. Yuji would believe that he had gotten the beast right then and there, but just then, he would have heard yet another click of Maharaga's will. As the beast would get up, it would rush directly towards Yuji again. However, yet again, Yuji would use dismantle, attempting to slice the beast into ribbons. But this time, his slashes were barely doing anything. Maharaga would immediately regenerate from each slash that Yuji would send at him. Yuji would then realize exactly what Maharaga was doing. Yuji noticed that every time he sent his slashes and the wheel would turn, his slashes would only get weaker and weaker. He would realize that Maharaga was adapting to all of his abilities, and he had pretty much used his whole arsenal on the beast. However, there was still one more move that he had yet to use. If this move didn't kill Maharaga, he would die here. He had already met the requirements. All that's left is to set up the attack itself. Yuji would smile and look at Maharaga, asking the beast, what is it waiting for? Maharaga would rush at Yuji, but Yuji would use hand signs, summoning Piercing Ox, imbuing it with his explosion technique. He would send the Ox forward as it would ram into Maharaga, catching Maharaga off guard. Yuji would then again use his anti-gravity technique reversal on Maharaga, slamming the beast into the ground. It wasn't as strong as last time, however, it was enough to hold Maharaga in place. Just then, Yuji would smile and say that the fight was over. Yuji would take a deep breath and say open. Flames would begin to form in Yuji's hand. Yuji would set up a Divine Flame, saying that he hasn't had any use for this attack yet, but now would be the perfect time. As Maharaga's wheel would spin, attempting to close the distance on Yuji yet again, Yuji would then let go of the arrow, as it would crash into Maharaga, eviscerating Maharaga in one fell swoop. Just then, Yuji could feel it, another Shikigami that was added to his arsenal, and this was the strongest one of them all. He was certain with this Shikigami, and knowing what it could do, he could potentially be able to kill Gojo Satoru himself. But that was only a baseless wish. If anything, he wanted to talk to Gojo and figure out things for himself and what he's going to do. He's pretty sure as well, with Maharaga tamed, even Kenjaku wouldn't be able to stop him. None of the curses would be able to either. Yuji was finally at the pinnacle, and when October 31st came about, he would show the entire Jujutsu society everything he could do and take over for himself. Yuji had just tamed Maharaga, and his arsenal of curse techniques was now perfected. The only thing that was left to wait for was October 31st, when Kenjaku would throw the veil around Shibuya, and they would begin their attack on Gojo Satoru in order to seal him in the prison room. Yuji, the entire time waiting up for the incident, would have been training his heart out because he knew he had to face a monster like Gojo Satoru. On the other side, Megumi would have been training his heart out as well, being just as greedy as Yuji. He was going to show Yuji that he didn't need his technique and that he was strong enough to beat him with anything. Unknown to Yuji, Megumi would have been able to beat a special great curse spirit during his training, only utilizing the flame curse technique. Megumi, being greedy like Yuji, would have pushed his technique to brand new levels, while also being able to use reverse curse technique. Although he wouldn't have access to a domain, reverse curse technique was a huge bonus for him. Even though it sapped a lot of curse energy from him, it was still a huge bonus. As October 31st would come around, the Jujutsu sorcerers would be notified that there was a veil being put over Shibuya, and inside of the veil, they were asking for Satoru Gojo to come into the veil by himself, otherwise they would kill all the civilians that were trapped inside. The higher-ups and Gojo himself would know that this was a trap. However, Gojo didn't care. He knew he was the strongest. He was going to clean all of this up, and everybody would be safe. Megumi would tell Gojo to be careful, seeing as Yuji was still out there and he has his technique. Gojo would remember what he told Megumi a while ago, saying that in the past, a 10 Shadows user and a 6 Eyes Limitless user just like him had fought to the death and both of them had died. He would tell Megumi not to worry, that he's got this because he's the strongest and that there's nothing they need to worry about. Megumi could only give off a slight smile and tell Gojo to be careful. Gojo would tell Megumi that he's got this. As Gojo would enter the veil in Shibuya, he would go underground into the station, exactly where they told him to go. He would look around and see that there were no civilians inside. He would be confused as they threatened to kill civilians, yet there were none there. Just then, Yuji would appear and tell Gojo, yo. Gojo would look over, seeing Yuji with a wheel above his head. He would smile at Yuji and tell him that he's gotten all grown up now. Gojo would then look at Yuji with a serious face. Yuji would tell Gojo he isn't going to harm his sweet student, is he? Gojo would chuckle and tell Yuji that he's not his student anymore. Just then, Yuji would feel a force pull him in as he would get cracked across the face by Gojo. Yuji would turn his head up and smile. He would send dismantles towards Gojo as they would seemingly go through the barrier. As Gojo would ask Yuji, did he forget? But Yuji would tell Gojo that no, he hadn't forgot. He's just testing something out. Yuji would then summon Giant Serpent. He really only needs to last 1 minute against Gojo, so he would do anything in his power, just in case he couldn't kill Gojo. He would imbue the snake with an explosion technique, sending it towards Gojo, as Gojo would simply stand there and let the snake crash into him. But as the snake would crash, an explosion would go off, causing rubble and dust to go across the area. However, Gojo would simply use Lapse Blue, clearing the area of all dust and debris. He would then be confused, because Yuji was nowhere to be found. Just then, Yuji would come up from Gojo's shadow, sending a punch towards his face. Using domain amplification, Gojo would notice almost immediately, catching Yuji's fist, with Yuji telling Gojo that he could be touched, and the wheel on his head would begin to spin. Gojo would realize what Yuji was doing. He didn't realize that Yuji had grown this much in such a short amount of time. Being able to utilize domain amplification and his curse technique, by switching domain amplification on and off, he was surprised that Yuji was able to push himself this far. The amount of training that he must have undergone must have been immense. Gojo would only smile and tell Yuji that he guesses he still is his student. Gojo would then teleport behind Yuji, attempting to punch him again. However, Yuji was already prepared, ducking underneath the punch, sending a kick. A kick imbued with domain amplification would crack Gojo across the face. Gojo would then begin to get excited, because there was no one else that was really able to match him, though he would finally be able to go all out, even if it was on his student. He would grab onto Yuji's leg and throw him into a wall. Yuji would slam into the wall and Gojo would already be there, using blue on Yuji, pulling him forward and punching him in the stomach yet again, cracking him into the wall again, sending a huge shockwave throughout the subway. Yuji would cough up blood and begin to smile. he would grab onto Gojo's arm, sending a knee towards his head, slamming it against him. He would then flip off of Gojo, sending a kick upwards again, connecting with Gojo's chin. As he would land on the ground, he would send dismantles towards Gojo again, as yet again, they would seemingly go straight through his barrier. Gojo would be noticing this, but as Yuji would send the slashes yet again, the wheel in his head would turn one more time. Gojo, knowing what the technique was, he would tell himself that he had to get this over with quickly before he adapted to his infinity. He would use blue on Yuji again, yet Yuji would use domain amplification again, surprising Gojo, seeing as Yuji wasn't pulled in that time. However, Gojo wouldn't care. He would then rush in at Yuji. He would send a right, as Yuji would duck underneath it, trying to send a right of his own. Gojo would grab the punch with his left, sending a knee towards Yuji's stomach, connecting, crashing into Yuji's stomach, sending him upwards. He would then use reversal red, blasting it into Yuji, sending him upwards yet again. He would block the attack. However, being caught off guard, Gojo would use blue, pulling him in again, but instead of allowing Yuji to try to get the chance to use domain amplification, he would close in, imbuing his fist with blue, crashing it into Yuji's stomach yet again. It would connect. However, Yuji was still prepared. He would block the attack with both of his hands, catching the punch with domain amplification. Just as he would do so, he would turn off his domain amplification, sending a cleave. However, just as Yuji thought, the infinity around Gojo would protect him from the cleave, negating the attack entirely. But yet again, the wheel on Yuji's head would spin. Yuji would laugh and say that he thinks he's got it now. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji that he doesn't have anything. Gojo would grab Yuji by the collar and drag him across the side of the subway station, breaking apart the walls and throwing him. Gojo would then use blue to gather up all the debris to try to trap Yuji. Yuji would gather himself. However, it was far too late. The debris that Gojo had gathered would crash onto Yuji. Yuji would then use cleave on the debris, breaking it apart to try to figure out what Gojo was trying to do. Just as the debris would disperse, Gojo would already be in front of Yuji, throwing a kick towards his head. Yuji would be able to duck underneath it. However, yet again, Gojo would use blue, making Yuji be sent upwards right into an overhead punch, cracking Yuji in the face, sending him back on the ground. Yuji would land on his feet as Gojo would be seen above him, sending down an overhead kick. Yuji would dodge out of the way and grab Gojo's leg using domain amplification. He would send 3 quick jabs onto Gojo. Gojo would easily parry them, knocking his hand out of the way and sending a hook of his own. It would connect against Yuji again, sending him towards a wall again, crashing into it. But before Yuji could even catch his breath, Gojo was already in front of him, sending another combo. He would proceed to beat down Yuji badly, not allowing Yuji to get a single breath in, making sure he was to end Yuji right here and right now. Just then, Gojo would cock his fist back, getting ready to land the final blow. He would send a punch. However, Yuji would quickly make hand signs, summoning rabbit escape. As Gojo would send the punch, it would crash into one of the rabbits, as Yuji would duck into the shadow. As Gojo would land a black flash, Yuji would be terrified, seeing that if that attack had hit him, he most likely would have died. Yuji would smile yet again. He wasn't going to lose here. He was going to kill Gojo and take his technique. But before that, he still needed to talk to Gojo. It didn't matter though, because Gojo was now in the zone. Just as Yuji would come up from his shadow, Gojo would already be there, grabbing Yuji by the collar yet again and throwing him up into the air. He would follow up with a 3-hit combo, a right and a left cross followed by a double palm strike that would knock Yuji back into the wall again. Yuji simply couldn't escape Gojo no matter how hard he tried. Gojo wasn't giving him time to summon any Shikigami, or even use any techniques at that matter. The pressure from Gojo was simply too much. Gojo would continue his combo and attempt to end things again. However, the wheel on Yuji's head would spin yet again. Yuji would then let off a disturbing smile. This one moment had caught Gojo off guard for a quick second, but it was all Yuji needed. He would use hand signs, summoning Maharaga, as Maharaga would come out of his shadow and slash at Gojo. The Infinity would stop Maharaga's slash. However, it would seem as if Infinity was getting weaker and weaker. Gojo would proceed to back up and ask Yuji did he really need some help. Yuji would then take a deep breath. He would then tell Gojo that before they finish their fight, he has something he wants to ask Gojo. Gojo would tell Yuji that he doesn't really feel like talking right now. However, Yuji would tell Gojo that he might want to hear this. Gojo would roll his eyes and tell Yuji that he's probably just scared since he's going to lose. Yuji would laugh and say he's definitely not going to lose here. He would then stare down Gojo and ask him, does he know anybody by the name of Kenjaku? Gojo would then raise an eyebrow and say that that name doesn't ring any bells for him. Yuji would then begin to explain how Kenjaku looked, as this would begin to shock Gojo. Kenjaku, hearing all this from the background, would begin to be pissed off. Yuji would continue telling Gojo about who Kenjaku was and what exactly he was planning. Gojo would be confused, asking Yuji why exactly he told him all of this, as Yuji would simply tell Gojo that he doesn't care. He's tired of listening to people who are weaker than him bark orders at him. He now understands why Sukuna did what he did. The only people that were worthy of saying anything were those who were strong, and Yuji himself is strong, unlike Kenjaku. Yuji planned on reshaping the world into exactly what he wanted, making sure the people of power are on top while everyone else sits at the bottom. If you have no power, you are simply useless. Gojo would tell Yuji that that kind of world seems boring and lonely, and that sitting at the top alone with all the power in the world isn't as fun as he might think it is. Yuji would tell Gojo that he doesn't think it's fun, he believes that it's necessary. Yuji would tell Gojo that the same thing happens at Jujutsu High. There are a bunch of old people who have no idea what they're talking about that bark orders at people like him and send him out like he's a weapon or a dog. Gojo could be free to do whatever he wanted, however, he sits behind and listens to the old heads. He would tell Gojo that he could do so much better. Gojo would sit there in silence for a second. However, he would then tell Yuji he understands what he's saying, but the way he wants to go about it is not the right way. There are rules and regulations set in place for a reason. Gojo would tell Yuji that he's strong and can make his own rules because he's strong. However, he doesn't want to rule with an iron fist. He wants to lead those who are weaker than him so they can be strong themselves and not have to rely on people like Gojo himself. Yuji would then let out a long sigh and say that Gojo was boring. He thought he would understand more than anybody else, but it seems Yuji was very wrong. Yuji would tell Gojo that once all of this is over, he was going to kill Kenjaku and take over his plan, doing things the way Yuji wanted to do it, not the way Kenjaku wanted. He would tell Gojo that he could either stand with him or against him. It was his choice. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji that he was getting beat right now, so why would he stand with him? In Gojo's eyes, Yuji is one of the weak ones. As Yuji would hear this, his eye would twitch. He can understand why Gojo Satoru would call him weak, seeing as he's been the pinnacle of power in the Jujutsu society for a long period of time. But it's just the fact that Gojo called him weak. This would piss Yuji off. Yuji would ask Gojo, is that really so? Does he really think he's weak? Yuji's only been using 2 of his techniques. He hasn't even been using everything. Gojo would only laugh and mock Yuji, saying that he has to steal other people's techniques anyway to make himself stronger. Yuji would let off an irritated smirk, as Gojo could feel an immense amount of cursed energy build up within Yuji. Yuji would tell Gojo that he doesn't need anybody else's curse technique. He could defeat Gojo with his own. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji he highly doubts that. As Yuji would say enough talking, he would dash in, closing the distance on him and Gojo immediately. Using domain amplification, he would send a punch towards Gojo's chest. Gojo would parry the attack, sending it downwards, trying to send a knee towards Yuji. However, Yuji would block the knee with his own leg. Yuji would then spin around, attempting to backhand Gojo. However, Gojo would grab his arm, picking Yuji up and slamming him into the ground. As Yuji would be slammed into the ground, he would use hand signs, summoning Max Elephant to drop on top of him. The elephant would fall down with reverse gravity technique imbued onto the elephant, slamming into Gojo. However, the infinity would stop it. The attack this time was even closer than it was last time. Yuji would slip into the shadow underneath Gojo, as Gojo would say that he's had enough playing around and that he was going to finish this right here and right now. Gojo would then proceed to use hand signs. He would say domain expansion, infinite void, as the domain would wrap around the subway station, encapsulating Yuji inside of it. However, something confusing would happen. Just like with Mahito, as Gojo would use his domain, instead of targeting Yuji's innate soul, it would target one of the other souls, disabling the technique. Yuji's anti-gravity technique would have been disabled. Gojo would be confused, seeing as Yuji to him, technically, had tanked unlimited void. Yuji would then immediately send his mantles towards Gojo as they would slash at his body. Yuji would smile and tell Gojo that he got him. Maharaga would come out of Yuji's shadow once more, sending a knee directly towards Gojo, as he was able to block it, but it would send him upwards. Yuji would meet Gojo there with a downward slam, making him crash back into the ground. Yuji would then use flowing red scale stack. Getting even faster, he would rush at Gojo once again. With Gojo being caught off guard by the sudden burst in speed, he would proceed to combo Gojo, hitting him with 2 quick jabs, grabbing his arm, then kneeing him in the stomach. He would then send an uppercut, cracking Gojo in the chin. He would then cock his fist back, just as Gojo did, and smile, asking Gojo, is he still weak? As the punch would connect, cracking Gojo in the stomach, hitting him with a black flash. The domain that Gojo had expanded would collapse, as Gojo would be sent into a nearby wall. Gojo would then begin to feel a wave of uneasiness. He didn't understand what had happened inside of the domain, what had caused Yuji to tank the sure hit effect of his domain. Even with the 6 eyes, he wasn't able to tell. Gojo would wipe the blood from his mouth and tell Yuji that the battle was far from over. In fact, it's only just getting started. Yuji would sit there with Maharaga on his side, agreeing with Gojo, saying that the battle has only just begun. Everything from this moment on is the real fight, so he'd better be prepared. With both of the fighters operating at 120%, they would rush back in at each other. They would re-engage in hand-to-hand combat. Gojo would send a kick, as Yuji would parry the kick, grabbing Gojo's leg, countering him with an elbow. Gojo would block the elbow, but Yuji would continuously send punches until Gojo was out of position. Yuji would smack away Gojo's hand, capitalizing off the moment, sending several rapid jabs towards Gojo's chest, before finishing the combo with a punch that would knock Gojo's head back. Gojo would bring his head back and headbutt Yuji, causing him to be dazed. The attack would make Yuji stagger a little bit. With Gojo seeing this, throwing a right, Yuji would be startled by the sudden attack, but he would be able to dodge outside of the attack and attempt to counterattack with a left hook. Gojo would duck underneath the attack and land a powerful counterattack on Yuji's ribs. Yuji would wince in pain, as Gojo would send yet another punch, slamming it into Yuji's arms as he would block it. It would send Yuji upwards. However, just then, Gojo would use blue, attracting himself to Yuji instead of attracting Yuji to himself. He would swing again, cracking Yuji across the face. Yuji would take the attack, throwing a punch of his own, cracking Gojo in the face as well. They would begin to trade blows back and forth, with each hit hitting harder than the last. As they would be pushed back from one another, they would re-engage immediately. Gojo would supercharge his fist with cursed energy and unleash rapid fire straight punches towards Yuji. Yuji would be able to block this time, but that wasn't all Gojo was trying to do. He would grab onto Yuji's arm, pulling him forward. He would then send a powerful downward punch, cracking Yuji yet again. This would stagger Yuji once more. Gojo would then cock back his fist, rocketing a punch straight towards Yuji. Just as the attack would be about to land, Maharaga would hop from Yuji's shadow and take the brunt of the attack, as Gojo would land yet another black flash, blowing the curse's top portion off of its body. However, Maharaga's wheel would simply spin and he would regenerate himself. Gojo wasn't done though. He didn't care that Maharaga was finished. He was trying to finish Yuji. Maharaga would swing it right towards Gojo, but Gojo would grab his arms, throwing him towards Yuji, slamming him into him. He would then use Lapse Blue at maximum output, swinging both Yuji and Maharaga around the subway station, crashing them both into a wall. Yuji would duck into Maharaga's shadow as Maharaga would dash straight towards Gojo. Maharaga would attempt to swing on Gojo yet again. However, he would simply duck underneath it, but as he would duck underneath it, Yuji would come out from his shadow, sending an uppercut towards Gojo, cracking him in the chin again. Gojo would immediately slam his head back down, cracking Yuji in the head with another headbutt. As Maharaga would grab onto Gojo, Gojo would use red on Maharaga, pushing him off of him, slamming him into a wall. But Yuji would already be behind Gojo, sending another punch towards him. However, Gojo would turn around, grabbing the attack, pulling Yuji's arm and cracking him in the face yet again. Yuji could now understand why Gojo was titled the strongest. It seemed as if, no matter how hard Yuji had trained, Gojo was simply still too much for him. But that only made this fight a lot more enjoyable for Yuji. Being able to push him to new limits, being able to push his curse technique, this was the thrill that he's always wanted. Yuji would activate Flowing Red Scale Stack again, grabbing onto Gojo's arm as he was grabbing onto him. Yuji would send himself towards Gojo, sending a punch directly towards his chest. It would crack Gojo in the ribs, but Gojo would simply shrug it off, laughing at Yuji, saying that his attacks had no weight behind it. Just from behind Gojo, Maharaga would swing down with his Sword of Extermination. Gojo would attempt to block it, but forgot that Infinity wouldn't work on Maharaga, as Gojo's arm would be sliced off. He would quickly use Reverse Curse technique, swinging himself around, throwing Yuji into Maharaga, sending a maximum output red into both of them. As they would both slam into the wall of the subway station, Gojo would say that since his domain wouldn't work, he was going to try something else here. He needed Maharaga to go, so it would only be a one-on-one between him and Yuji. Then, he'd be able to kill Yuji and stop Kenjaku from doing whatever he was going to do. As Yuji would be slightly catching his breath, he could feel the sudden surge of curse energy from Gojo. He knew that this attack was going to be bad. As Gojo would stare at Yuji, he would then proceed to launch a hollow purple straight at Yuji. However, Yuji would summon Maharaga in front of him, as Maharaga would take the brunt of the attack, being evaporated, being killed off in one hit, as Yuji would be able to survive the aftermath, seeing as Maharaga took the initial brunt of the attack. Yuji would be heavily damaged on the floor, trying to use Reverse Curse technique to heal as much of his body as he could. Gojo would stare down at Yuji and tell him that he does still think he's weak. Yuji would take a deep breath in. With his body fully healed with Reverse Curse technique, he would rush in back at Gojo using Domain Amplification. Since Maharaga was gone, the only way he could damage Gojo was by using Domain Amplification. However, he wasn't going to be able to use any of his techniques. He would send a right towards Gojo, but Gojo would simply dodge backwards, dodging the attack altogether. He would send a kick towards Yuji, kicking him in his stomach, sending him towards the wall again. Yuji would drop down to his knees and begin to cough up blood. He was exhausted. This fight went on way longer than he thought it was going to go. He assumed he would have been able to take down Gojo simply because he had Maharaga on his side, but it didn't seem that simple at all. Gojo was simply far too experienced for him. Yuji would smile. He would then tell Gojo that it was a shame he wasn't going to be able to see the new world happen. Gojo would raise an eyebrow and ask Yuji what the hell he was talking about. Just then, a voice behind Gojo would speak up, saying hey. Gojo would turn around and see Kenjaku. He would already know about Kenjaku, but still seeing his best friend's body be used in such a manner would confuse him entirely. That one moment alone of hesitation would have caught Gojo off guard. The prison realm was sitting right in front of him, as it would lock onto Gojo and capture him. Gojo wouldn't be able to use curse technique or anything, as he would realize it was actually game over for him. Kenjaku would sit there and explain that it was a shame that Yuji had foiled half of his plans, but it's okay, since Satoru Gojo was now captured, he would kill Yuji anyway, seeing as he was on death's door already. With Gojo sealed and Yuji Itadori dead, Kenjaku would be able to go about his plans regularly without anybody interfering. He just needed someone to be able to take on Gojo Satoru and hold him to a standstill in order for him to get captured. It was a win-win for Kenjaku, since Yuji was already going to betray him. He knew it a while ago. He just had to wait for the right moment. The two strongest sorcerers would fight it out and exhaust each other so that Kenjaku could simply swoop in at the end and take all the credit. It was his lucky day. Gojo would scream at Kenjaku, saying that he has no right to take over a body like that, as Kenjaku would tell Gojo that he has no right to say anything anymore, as he's simply a box. Gojo would curse Kenjaku as he would be folded into the prison realm. Yuji would lay there, tired out and exhausted, as Kenjaku would walk over to him. He would ask Yuji if he had his fun, and it didn't matter if he did or didn't anyway. Yuji was going to die right here, right now. He knew that Yuji was planning to overthrow him eventually. He knew that Yuji would get in his head and attempt to overthrow the system that Kenjaku has in place. But Kenjaku would tell Yuji that no one was going to intervene in the plans he had set up for thousands of years. This was something that was long in the making, and he wasn't going to let someone like Yuji interrupt any of that. He would tell Yuji that once he dies, he's going to revive Sukuna inside of Yuji's body so that the true king of curses could come about into this world. Kenjaku would then use cursed spirit manipulation to summon two special grade cursed spirits. He would tell one of the cursed spirits to hold Yuji down, and he wanted the other one to kill Yuji slowly. He would tell Yuji that this is what he gets for trying to disturb his plans. He would tell Yuji to die as angrily as he could so that maybe he could come back as a cursed spirit and Kenjaku would be able to use him. In this one moment, everything would freeze for Yuji. There's no way everything was going to end here. There's no way he was simply just going to allow Kenjaku to kill him, especially after he just put his life on the line like that. Kenjaku was a bug that needed to be exterminated, and Yuji was going to do exactly that. He couldn't stand the fact that Kenjaku, someone way weaker than him, was attempting to kill him, attempting to bark orders at him again. He just couldn't stand for it. Every bit of strength that anyone else had was meant for Yuji to capture. That was the sole purpose of his life, to become number one and stand at the top of everything. Everything was all for Yuji. It was all for one, and that one was him. Something would click inside of Yuji's head, with all the emotions stirring about. With every last bit of cursed energy he had left, Yuji would open both of his hands, as both of the dots on his hands would begin to glow a bright red. Yuji would then scream the words, "Domain expansion," all for one. Kenjaku would be surprised and confused. He didn't think Yuji had enough cursed energy left to expand a domain. Inside of Yuji's domains, there were hands all around the domain, all of them with red dots on the palm of their hands. But before Kenjaku could even make another move, his body would simply fall over. Inside of Yuji's domain, the sure hit effect was that no matter who was in the domain, if you were caught by the domain, the technique imbued within your soul will be stripped immediately and given to Yuji. The view that everything had belonged to him caused the domain to act that way, and since Kenjaku was technically simply the brain, having his technique stripped would make the body seemingly useless. However, Yuji was able to take both cursed spirit manipulation and Kenjaku's technique itself As the domain that Yuji had set up would collapse, Yuji would begin to laugh maniacally. He would begin to thank Kenjaku for allowing him to awaken to this one moment alone, and that everything seemed perfect. After everything was said and done here, he would continue Kenjaku's plan since Kenjaku had explained everything to him. He would start the culling games and attempt to merge humanity with Tengen. And after he'd do that, he'd plan on taking over the world as he saw fit. He would destroy everything and reshape the entire Jujutsu society and Earth itself, making anyone and everyone bend under his knee. Everything in this world was meant for him, and he sought to take it all. Yuji had just expanded his domain for the first time, taking the curse technique of both Kenjaku and the two cursed spirits that were with him, seemingly exercising them on the spot. Yuji would gather himself, realizing that everything that Kenjaku was going to do, he has to now do it. He knew exactly what Kenjaku had wanted, because Kenjaku had told him prior he was going to merge humanity with Tengen. And now that Gojo Satoru was sealed and right in front of him, there was nothing that could stop him. However, there was one thing that was currently stopping him, and that was Gojo Satoru himself. The prison realm was under immense strain while struggling to contain Satoru Gojo's immense power and limitless ability. So at the moment, Yuji was stuck with the prison realm at the bottom of the subway for now. He was going to have to figure out how he was going to get the prison realm outside the barriers. But that's when Yuji had realized something. Since he had killed Kenjaku, the barriers that Kenjaku had placed would have dispersed, meaning that sorcerers could be diving on his position at any moment. He would then think to himself, even if the sorcerers did capture Satoru Gojo, they would have no way of unsealing Gojo, or at least that's what he thought. Yuji knew that he had the strength to take on the lower tiers of the Jujutsu High School, and that he could easily dominate them, and if anything, he could summon Maharaga to deal with them, because none of them were as strong as Gojo, and he would doubt that any of them would have the firepower to be able to defeat Maharaga in one fell swoop. So instead of taking off, Yuji would just sit there and wait for the prison realm to finish scanning Satoru Gojo. If anyone were to come down into the subway station, since the barrier had collapsed, he would simply kill them and take their technique. Once he was able to get Satoru Gojo under his control, he was going to use auto transfiguration just as Kenjaku had planned and begin the culling games. After all that was said and done, he was going to go to Jujutsu High School, so he would be able to use cursed spear manipulation on Tengen, so he could ultimately begin his plan. He would think to himself this entire time, sitting and waiting. Yuji would sit there with his eyes closed for a little bit, waiting for the prison realm to finally finish scanning Gojo. Just then, he would hear footsteps. There were at least 4 people running straight towards him. Yuji would stand up, immediately getting on guard. Just then, he would make eye contact with the 4. It would be Megumi, Maki, Nobito, and Nanami. Yuji would lock eyes with Megumi and would begin to smile a devious smile. He would yell and tell Megumi that he actually still alive, being surprised and clapping for him. He wasn't expecting Megumi to get very far with his curse technique. However, seeing him now, he sees how strong Megumi has really gotten, and he commends him very much. Nanami and Nobito would be confused as to who this guy was, but Megumi would tell the two that this guy was Yuji Itadori, the new quote-unquote king of curses. Yuji would smile and tell them that he didn't realize he was so popular. Megumi would look over at Yuji, scanning him, realizing that he's somewhat damaged. Scanning the situation even more, he would realize the box on the ground, realizing that Gojo wasn't around, and there was a dead body on the floor next to Yuji. It must have been Kenjaku, and Gojo must be in the box. He would share his ideals with the other people in his group, as Nanami and Nobito would agree with him. Megumi would tell them that they need to proceed with caution, because Yuji is extremely strong, and he's not something to scoff at. Seeing as Gojo was in the box, Yuji was somehow able to subdue Gojo Satoru and capture him, so he's nothing to scoff at. He would tell the group that they need to get prepared to capture Satoru Gojo back and take out Yuji Itadori. Yuji would gather himself and smile, realizing that they were about to attack him and attempt to take Satoru Gojo for themselves. If it were to come down to it, Yuji would simply expand another domain and take every last one of their techniques. But he wanted to enjoy himself some more. He had gotten enough fighting out of Gojo. However, since these guys were a lot weaker than Gojo, he would actually be able to enjoy himself. He would look at all 4 of them and tell them to come on, asking all of them what are they waiting for. Their precious teachers on the floor right here. Nobito would be the first to rush in, using projection sorcery. This would catch Yuji off guard, seeing as he didn't realize the old man was able to move that fast, realizing that it might have something to do with his technique, as Yuji would be struck in the chin, being sent backwards, but he would gather himself quickly. Nobito would begin to smile, saying that he didn't think the boy would be able to take such a hit from him, but next time he'll kick it up a notch. He would use projection sorcery again, rushing back in at Yuji. However, at the same time this time, Nanami and Megumi would rush in as well. Megumi would tell Nanami to be careful and to not let Yuji touch him at all, because if Yuji touches him, his technique will be gone. Nanami would tell him that he understands, rushing in at Yuji. Nobito would rush past Yuji, brushing him on the shoulder, as Yuji would attempt to turn around. But to his surprise, he would be frozen inside of an animation frame. Just then, Nobito would crack Yuji dead in the chest, smashing the frame and sending him flying, as Nanami would follow up on the attack using his ratio technique, slashing Yuji on the leg, sending one of his legs flying, as Yuji would attempt to gather himself, trying to land on his feet, but he would trip over and fall, crashing into the ground. Yuji would begin to laugh and say that technique was confusing, but it was nothing compared to all the techniques he has to store and remember in his mind. He would figure out his technique just like he figured out everyone else's technique. Just as Yuji would get himself together, getting himself up, he would see Megumi shooting at him with his flames, darting straight towards Yuji, sending a flaming kick directly towards his face. Yuji would duck underneath it, and without realizing, Maki would be right there as well with Playful Cloud, cracking Yuji across the face. Yuji would think to himself that it may have been a bad idea for him to stay behind. However, he wasn't going to lose here. Not after everything he's gone through. He would use RCT to heal his leg up, stomping on the ground, stopping the momentum from getting hit by Playful Cloud. He would then begin to chuckle. He would then make hand signs, summoning Rabbit Escape, while imbuing them with his gravity technique. He would send them forward towards everybody, as Maki would easily dodge out of the way, and so would Megumi. But Nobito, not realizing what Yuji may have done, would kick one of the rabbits out of the way. As he would kick the rabbit, Nobito would be flown upwards into the air. Nanami, seeing this, would begin to dodge the rabbits as well. Yuji would capitalize off this instantly, rushing straight towards Nobito since he couldn't use his technique mid-air like that. He was going to make this fast because he didn't have any time to waste. There was a lot more to the plan that he still had to do, and he wasn't going to let any of these people get in his way. Yuji would jump up into the air, grabbing onto Nobito's face, and begin to use Idol Transfiguration. At the same time, he would use his own innate technique. He would begin to extract Nobito's technique, as well as turning him into a grotesque beast. Extracting Nobito's technique, the information would begin to flow in his brain, and Yuji would be stuck there for a second. Megumi, Maki, and Nanami would be confused as to what just happened, because it all happened so fast. But they would also realize that Yuji was simply sitting there. They would attempt to capitalize off the moment. Megumi would rush in with his fire technique, blasting forward, trying to reach Yuji before he had the chance to recuperate. However, the transfigured Nobito would begin to block Megumi's path, blocking Megumi's initial attack, but Nanami would be right behind Megumi, slashing at the transfigured Nobito, killing him in one strike. Megumi would continue to rush forward, as Yuji would just barely regain his conscious, but by the time he regained it, it was too late. Megumi would already be sending a flaming knee directly towards Yuji's face, crashing into his face, sending him into a wall. Just then, Megumi would charge up the fire in his hand, charging up as much as he could, sending it forward directly towards Yuji. As he sent it straight towards Yuji, it would scorch him, lighting him ablaze. Yuji would begin to scream at the top of his lungs, as his skin was being burnt off. However, Megumi wouldn't let up. He would continue blowing as much fire as he could, trying to burn Yuji into a crisp. As Yuji would be screaming, he would then begin to laugh, laughing over and over, laughing harder and harder, as Megumi would only be confused. Yuji would then rush through the fire, grabbing onto Megumi's face, slamming him into the ground. As he would slowly begin to use RCT to heal his wounds, he would tell Megumi that this is so much fun, isn't it? Fighting to the death, seeing who comes out on top, seeing who's stronger. He would then use his reversal gravity technique to pin Megumi to the ground. Megumi would be struggling, attempting to get up, fighting with all his strength, but he simply couldn't do it. Yuji would then get lower and begin whispering in Megumi's ear. He began to tell Megumi that he was going to kill every single person here. He was going to kill all of them, slowly and in front of Megumi, so he can watch everyone suffer. Yuji would tell Megumi that he still has a trick up his sleeve that he hasn't shown anyone here yet. The only one that was worthy of it really was Gojo. Maki would run up behind Yuji, attempting to hit him with Playful Cloud yet again. However, Yuji would tell Megumi that she was the first to go, as he would turn around immediately, grabbing onto Playful Cloud and ripping it from Maki's hand. She would be confused at first, as just then, in the same moment that Playful Cloud was stripped from her, she would be hit across the face with Playful Cloud as well, being crashed into a wall. Yuji would then rush in at her laughing, asking her what is a curseless bum like her going to do. He would begin to pummel her with Playful Cloud, beating her senselessly, attempting to finish her off. However, Nanami would rush in, hitting Yuji with his ratio technique, slicing his arm off just as it was about to connect with Maki. Yuji would quickly make hand signs, summoning Giant Snake, sending it directly towards Nanami, as it would crash into him, making him crash into a wall, almost killing him off the one blow alone. The only thing Megumi could do was sit there and watch as his friends get beat senselessly. He thought he had gotten so much stronger and was going to be able to go toe to toe with Yuji, but he was a fool to think Yuji was going to sit around and idly let everybody else get stronger around him while he saved the same strength. Yuji's greed seemed to be so much more than Megumi thought. Megumi would begin to scream out in anger, hoping that anybody would come and help them. Just then, another person would come, sprinting straight towards Yuji, but Yuji wouldn't realize because the person didn't have cursed energy. Yuji would get hit in the side of his face, being shocked by how strong the person was. He would then begin to combo Yuji, hitting him with a right, then a left, grabbing his arm, kneeing him in the stomach, spinning around Yuji, cracking him in the back, and sending a kick towards his ribcage, cracking one of Yuji's ribs. Yuji would be confused, so much was happening in such a short amount of time. Who the hell was this person? Why didn't they have any cursed energy? And right now wasn't the greatest time for this. Yuji would attempt to hurry up and end things, attempting to grab the person. However, they would easily dodge out of the way, sending a high kick towards Yuji, cracking him in the head again, sending him flying. As Megumi would be released from the technique, he would look over and see a man who looked somewhat familiar to him. Seeing as Yuji was occupied, he would tell the group that they simply need to grab the prison realm and leave. So Nanami would hurry up and grab the prison realm, and then grab Maki, as the three would make their way out of there. But Yuji would be continuing to be pummeled by Toji. He wouldn't understand why the hell this person was here, or what the hell was going on even. This random person without cursed energy like that one girl. Yuji would then activate his gravity technique reversal, making Toji slam into the ground. But to Yuji's surprise, Toji would begin to pick himself back up, fighting the gravity that he was being crushed under. Yuji would begin to smile, seeing as this guy was a lot stronger than he thought he was going to be. Yuji would summon Nue, sending him towards Toji, as he would rush in with Nue as well. Toji would be struck with Nue, getting electrocuted, as Yuji would close in, attacking Toji, starting off with a devastating assault. He would send 3 quick jabs in succession at Toji. Toji would attempt to swing back with his left, but Yuji would roll underneath it, sending a low sweeping kick, making Toji fall over onto the ground. Yuji would then follow up on the attack, slamming his foot down onto Toji's chest. As he would do so, he would also point down, causing the point where he had struck to explode. At the same time, he would summon Giant Serpent, sending it towards Toji as it would crash into him. But Toji would seemingly stop the snake in its track. He would rip the snake's mouth open, seemingly hitting directly through it, rushing right back towards Yuji. However, Yuji would use his gravity technique, sending Toji upwards. As Yuji this time would use Idol Transfiguration, transforming his hands into blades, jumping straight up and stabbing Toji directly in the torso. Transforming his arms back, he would grab onto Toji's arm, spinning him around in the air and throwing him into the ground. He would then fall towards the ground, using his gravity reversal technique, slamming onto Toji, causing Toji's chest to be caved inwards, and him dying on the spot. Yuji would be confused as hell as to what just happened there, but at the same time he would turn and see that the prison room was gone, along with the 3 sorcerers. He would be pissed, but there was nothing he could do for now. He needed to gather himself. The millions of cursed spirits that Kenjaku had stored inside of his spirit manipulation was given to Yuji the second he absorbed his technique. He still had an ace up his sleeve, and he could still start the culling games. He would let them get out and think that they had free will for a moment. Then he would send the millions of cursed spirits out into the wild and begin the culling games, and head straight towards the Jujutsu High School to where he could cull Tengen, so the plan would actually begin to start. Yuji wasn't afraid that the fact that they were able to take Gojo. They had no way of unsealing Gojo currently, So Yuji would take a deep breath and use auto transfiguration in a wide range of area, activating what Kenjaku had planned. Everyone could feel the sudden spike of cursed energy from down below, but would continue at telling everybody that they need to get out of Shibuya because something big was about to happen. As Yuji would begin to laugh, he would then use cursed spirit manipulation, sending millions of cursed spirits out into the wild, free, in order to roam and do whatever they wanted so he could start the culling games. Everything was going to happen smoothly from now on. Eventually, he was going to take Gojo Satoru back, and he was going to rule the world with an iron fist at the top. With the disaster cursed spirits filling Yuji release a whole bunch of cursed spirits at once, they would all begin to converge on top of him. Jogo would be the first there, asking Yuji what exactly he's doing. Yuji would tell Jogo that he's doing exactly what they wanted. He's going to make the new world, but he'll be at the top. Jogo would look over at Hanami, and then look at Dagon. Yuji was getting ahead of himself, and Mahito may have been right about him. They need someone like Sukuna, not someone like this brat. Yuji was strong, sure, but he didn't have the mindset that Sukuna had. Yuji was still a kid, and they needed someone like Sukuna that could actually lead them into the new world of curses. The curses would tell Yuji that they wouldn't be following him anymore. However, they wouldn't get in his way. Yuji would tell the curses that was fine. As long as they stayed out of his way, he didn't care at all. Unknown to Yuji, however, Jogo had found another 3 fingers, and he was going to give it to Yuji. However, Jogo had simply decided that he was going to save the fingers and let Sukuna actually incarnate in another sorcerer. Maybe that flame sorcerer from before. He was going to force feed the fingers to one of them and let Sukuna incarnate for real. Instead of it being a brat like Yuji, Sukuna would be able to kill Yuji and take over his body when he got the chance. Jogo would walk out. He would tell the other curses to split up so they could find the other sorcerers in this heap of curses. They were looking for that flame sorcerer from before. They would reincarnate Sukuna inside of that sorcerer and plan everything from there. Dagon and Hanami would immediately go out looking for the flame sorcerer, as Jogo would do the same thing. He would search all throughout Shibuya as he would see Megumi taking on a lower grade cursed spirit. Jogo would then land next to Megumi, crashing into the floor, as Megumi would immediately get on guard, charging flames in his hand. Jogo would look at Megumi and tell him that he needs him to die in order for Sukuna to come back fully. Megumi would tell Jogo that he didn't plan on dying today. As a matter of fact, he didn't plan on dying at all. Jogo would tell Megumi that that's a bummer because he planned on killing him today, right here and right now. Jogo would immediately rush in, engaging hand-to-hand combat with Megumi. Jogo would start off with a kick, sending it straight towards Megumi, but Megumi would block it, grabbing onto Jogo's leg, spinning him around and throwing him into another direction. Megumi would immediately charge the fire in his hands, sending off a blast that would connect straight towards Jogo. However, since it was fire, it didn't deal as much damage to him. Megumi would realize this, seeing that his fire wasn't really having an effect on Jogo at all. So he would simply need to switch tactics, relying on nothing but brute strength to beat Jogo. He would clash his fists together, creating blue flames in his hands. As he would rush towards Jogo, they would clash once more. Megumi would begin the fight with the right jab. However, Jogo would parry the attack, counter-attacking with a headbutt. This would send Megumi sliding back. However, Megumi would quickly gather himself, sending another attack straight towards Jogo, this time attempting to send a flying kick towards Jogo. The attack would connect, snapping Jogo's head backwards, sending him flying backwards into a wall as he would crash into it. Jogo would begin to get irritated. He would summon ember insects and send them straight towards Megumi. As Megumi would hear the insects, they would fly directly towards him and then into him, as they would explode on contact. This would send Megumi flying backwards, but he was able to create a flame-like shield that had protected him from the explosion. He would gather himself and plant his feet on the ground again. However, just then, a chute right from the side of Megumi would spawn, as it would then spew lava directly out of it, shooting straight towards Megumi. He would attempt to block the attack, but it would simply be too hot for him to block. He would be seared by the attack, but he would dodge out of the way just in time before it completely engulfed him. However, he had dodged directly where Jogo wanted him to be. Jogo would follow up, sending a knee directly towards Megumi's face, cracking him in the jaw. This attack would cause Megumi to be dazed. He would spin around from the attack, and Jogo wouldn't let up. He would send more ember insects towards Megumi, causing him to blow up yet again. But this time, Megumi couldn't dodge the attack, so he had to take the full blow of the ember insects, as they would burn majority of his body. Megumi thought he was growing faster. Megumi thought he was strong enough, but this curse was simply on a whole different level from everything he's ever fought. He thought he could stand on par with Yuji one day, but it didn't seem like it was going to happen anytime soon. Megumi would attempt to get up, however, Jogo would simply kick Megumi in the face, causing him to be knocked out. Jogo would then take the fingers out of his pocket, telling himself that he hopes this works. He would then force feed Megumi the 3 fingers that he had. As the second he would swallow him, the effects of the fingers would start immediately. Megumi would start to contort and twist violently. He would then begin shaking, as Jogo thought he had just killed the sorcerer. But then, Megumi would stop moving, as all of a sudden, markings would appear all around Megumi, as Sukuna would begin to laugh, saying that he's finally been reincarnated. It's been so long, over 1,000 years, and he's finally back. He would look over and see Jogo. He would then ask Jogo if he's the one that revived him. Jogo would confirm and say that yes, he was the person that revived Sukuna, and he has a lot to tell him, and he hopes that he'll actually listen. Sukuna, being on the happier end, would tell Jogo that he's willing to listen since he's the one who revived him. Jogo would then begin to explain the entire situation to Sukuna, saying that there was a kid that took his fingers and claimed them as his own. Instead of Sukuna being allowed to reincarnate fully, the child was taking his fingers and using it as his own, absorbing his powers. Sukuna would begin to look pissed off, seeing as there was someone who was taking his strength and claiming it as their own. He didn't know who was brave enough to do something that stupid, but he wasn't going to take any of it. But seeing as he was now, he probably wouldn't be able to do anything. Sukuna would then ask Jogo how many fingers has the brat consumed, as Jogo would tell Sukuna that Yuji has probably consumed at least 16 fingers, and he had just given him 3 fingers, so there was probably only 1 more finger available for him to consume. Other than that, Sukuna would have to attempt to get as strong as he could on his own. Sukuna would tell Jogo that there are plenty of ways that he can get stronger, but for right now, Sukuna needs to focus on gathering his last finger, plus gathering something else that he knows will make him stronger. Sukuna would begin to laugh and say that everything was going to go amazingly. Now that he's been revived, he can't wait to fight this brat and take back the power that was once his. Once he has all his preparations in order, he's going to immediately go fight the brat. Jogo would also tell Sukuna that him and 2 other cursed spirits will be at his disposal if he needs anything. Originally, they were going to let Yuji lead them into the new world. However, due to him only being a brat, his leadership isn't all that they want it to be. They need someone like Sukuna who actually has a voice and knows what he's doing to lead them into the new world. As Yuji would recuperate himself, he would be able to feel the sudden surge of cursed energy throughout Shibuya and realize that the King of Curses himself has been incarnated. He would snicker, saying that Jogo had probably betrayed him, realizing that Gojo had a couple of fingers and probably used it in order to incarnate Sukuna. But Yuji wouldn't be worried at all, seeing as he had consumed majority of the fingers. If Sukuna were to come after him, he could probably kill him, although he said the same thing about Gojo, and Gojo damn near beat him if Kenjaku didn't step in. Yuji would sigh and say that he has a lot of work to do, and that he has a lot of preparations to go about. His first step is going to be to go to Jujutsu High in order to capture Tengen with spirit manipulation, in order to begin his plan to merge Tengen with humanity. Since the culling games themselves had already started, he was going to do everything exactly as Kenjaku had planned, and adding a few things of his own to the mix to make sure he could rule. Everything in this world was all for him, and he was going to take it and make it just his. No matter what he had to do, no matter who he had to kill, no matter what he had to take, he was going to take it all. Jogo would have been able to revive the King of Curses, allowing Sukuna to have his own body, but unfortunately Sukuna would hear the news that 16 of his fingers were already taken, and he couldn't use them anymore. He was only given 3, and there was only 1 more for him to consume. He would have to get preparations together in order to be able to face Yuji and get his full strength back. At the same time, Yuji would be making preparations in order to infiltrate Jujutsu High School once more. It was finally time for him to go through his plan. He was going to continue what Kenjaku started, merging all of humanity with Tengen. However, Yuji would then remember Kenjaku wanted idol transfiguration and made Yuji use it in a widespread area right before everything in Shibuya happened. Then it would click in Yuji's head again. Kenjaku told Yuji about the culling games way before the Shibuya incident even happened. He would think to himself, if Yuji could absorb Tengen, he would be able to start the culling game and do exactly what Kenjaku wanted. And on top of that, with all these past incarnated sorcerers, he would be able to gather as many souls as he could. And then when Yuji's had his fun, he was going to shape the Jujutsu world exactly how he wanted to. Some time would pass, and Yuji would be outside of the barrier of the Jujutsu High School. Yuji wasn't as well versed in barrier techniques like Kenjaku was. However, being around him for a while, Yuji knew just enough, and it's not like he wanted to be quiet about his entrance into the Jujutsu High School. He would remember, back when they had infiltrated the Jujutsu High School before, Yuji was able to tell them how to get throughout it because he could sense some more souls that were linked to him that were in the Jujutsu High School's inventory. He was going to go the exact same way, since he knew he couldn't get past the regular barriers that Tengen had set. Yuji would walk his way through the corridors, telling himself that when he comes back, he was going to absorb the rest of the souls that were lingering in the Jujutsu High School inventory. He didn't need them now, but he didn't want anything else tying him here. As Yuji would keep walking down the corridor, the area around him would become a flashing white. Yuji would be confused as to what was going on. Not understanding where he was, Yuji would turn around, but to his surprise, the area behind him would be white as well. Yuji would then close his eyes and try to scan anything around him. However, he would get nothing. This is when Tengen would appear behind Yuji. Yuji would turn around, and Tengen would introduce herself. She would say to Yuji, "Welcome, the one who devours all." She would tell Yuji that she knows what he's here for. Yuji would then tell Tengen, then why they're wasting their breath. He would tell her to just let it happen, and to not fight back too much, because it would make things more difficult for him. She would then ask Yuji to wait, and entertain her for a little bit. Yuji would let off a long sigh, and say that fine, he'll entertain her for a bit. She would then ask Yuji, what is his actual purpose in being here? The only thing he's doing is following Kenjaku. Yuji doesn't know what he actually wants to do with himself. She would tell Yuji that his fate has been drastically changed due to unknown reasons that even she couldn't explain, telling Yuji that things weren't even supposed to happen this way. She would call Yuji an anomaly. She would tell Yuji that whatever happened at his birth was never meant to happen in the first place. Whatever had happened then changed the fate of the world entirely. Yuji would be confused as to what she was talking about. Yuji would tell Tengen that his fate has always been his. The only person who can decide Yuji's fate is himself. That's when Tengen would chuckle, and she would tell Yuji that his fate was never up to him. She would tell him if Kenjaku hadn't done whatever he had done to Yuji at birth, none of the things that were happening right now would be happening. Yuji wouldn't have the ability he had. Yuji wouldn't be in the position he's in right now. Things would have been completely different and flipped over their head. However, whatever Kenjaku did broke you out of that fate and turned you into this. Tengen would then pause, as Yuji would be confused and baffled on what to say. This Tengen person seemingly knew everything. Tengen would then continue once again. She would tell Yuji, even though Kenjaku didn't trust you at all, he still knew that even if you were to go out, you would still continue his plan. So Kenjaku set up barriers in advance in order for you to start the culling game. He knew that you would come here in order to cull me and absorb me with cursed spirit manipulation, in order to still enact his plan. In a way, Kenjaku still lives on inside of you, as you are simply not your own person. Yuji would just simply stare on in silence. Tengen would continue, Kenjaku's will lives on in you, and that's the only thing you live by. Yuji would then start to get pissed off. He would tell Tengen that Kenjaku is dead, and that's all that matters. Kenjaku doesn't live on in him. Everything that's going to happen in the future is because Yuji wants it to happen. Tengen would interrupt Yuji, saying, if it was really in your will, you wouldn't be doing the exact same things he has laid out for you. She would tell Yuji that he's still Kenjaku's puppet. He's still dancing in the palms of Kenjaku, even while Kenjaku isn't even here anymore. Kenjaku was so confident that Yuji would continue his plan, that even in death and before his death, he laid out things in order for you to continue on what he was doing, even though he didn't trust you at all and knew that you were going to kill him eventually. If you are your own person and you tell me that you have your own will, then tell me, the one who devours all, what is it that you want to do? Yuji would stare at Tengen and tell her He wants to rule the Jujutsu Society with an iron fist. Anything that has to do with Jujutsu sorcery would be his to begin with. Tengen would laugh and tell Yuji can he actually take on such a burden. She would tell Yuji that there's a lot more to Jujutsu Society than just strength alone. Yuji couldn't understand though. He would tell Tengen that doesn't make any sense since Sukuna was able to do it all those years ago. Tengen would laugh again and say that this was not the past era anymore. This was the future. This was a new era of Jujutsu sorcery, and that he can't compare something 1,000 years ago to now. Yuji would then tell Tengen, instead of simply shaping Japan into the way he wants it to be, he was going to shape the entire world in order for it to bend under his foot. There's a lot more to this than Tengen thinks. Since the culling games have already started, Yuji's only objective now is to absorb Tengen, and the rest from there, Yuji knows exactly what he wants to do. He would tell Tengen they are right, however. He's only following in Kenjaku's footsteps because he's laid out the blueprint for him. There's no shame in taking an easy way when you have one. However, Yuji won't continue with Kenjaku's plan to merge Tengen with humanity. He was going to do something different entirely. He was going to merge Tengen with himself, effectively attempting to become immortal like Tengen is. Therefore, his rule on the Jujutsu world would never come to a close unless he was defeated in battle. He was going to make his conquest worldwide instead of just Japan alone. First, he was going to start in Japan, and then he was going to spread out. And with the years to come, he knows his barrier techniques will only get stronger. Yuji would tell Tengen that there was so much more to learn, and that he wanted to learn everything. Tengen would tell Yuji that she knows that he came with the purpose there to absorb her, but merging himself with her isn't as good of an idea as he thinks it is. Yuji would tell Tengen that she doesn't need to worry about that. His technique will work out the fine details. There isn't a single person in the world beside Yuji himself that knows how his technique works completely. He would begin to explain to Tengen exactly how his technique works. Yuji would tell Tengen that his technique's name is All for One. Yuji, having this technique, is able to see the contours of the soul and the technique that is engraved within that soul. Using his technique, he is able to absorb the soul, effectively absorbing the technique. When it comes to cursed spirits, if Yuji were to absorb a cursed spirit's soul, Yuji would be able to use the technique. However, like Mahito's idol transfiguration, since Yuji's soul doesn't work the same way a cursed technique's soul works, he wouldn't be able to use the technique exactly as the curse uses it. He has access to the technique and can change the shape of his soul at will. However, unlike Mahito, idol transfiguration doesn't protect the shape of his own soul because it's not his soul. There is effectively a small trace of the person inside of Yuji. However, it's so small, the person has no control while they are inside of Yuji's body. The only one that put up some kind of fight was the finger that Yuji had consumed a while ago. The soul of Sukuna was strong, but Yuji was able to suppress it and keep it down and take the power as his own. If Yuji was even a little bit weaker, Sukuna would have been able to take over. However, Yuji simply had more control over his soul than Sukuna did at that moment. Tengen would sit there and ask Yuji, so does he plan on using his technique to devour her and become effectively immortal? And due to the fact that Tengen's technique won't work on Yuji like it worked on her, he would be able to keep his form effectively forever and not evolve in a sense where he has to merge with a star plasma vessel. Yuji would sit there and simply smile. Yuji knows what he wants to do, and when he's able to get there, he's going to do it and not let anyone stop him from doing that. Kenjaku almost did it once, but he'll never let that happen again. Tengen would then ask Yuji, what does he expect to do against the King of Curses, or when they unseal Satoru Gojo? Yuji would tell Tengen that he doesn't fear the King of Curses not one bit, and Gojo Satoru should be an easier fight the second time around because he still has Maharaga. Gojo wasn't able to defeat Maharaga. He let Maharaga take the initial brunt of the attack, while Yuji took the rest. His only job was to distract Gojo, not kill him. Midway throughout the battle, he figured out he wasn't going to be able to defeat Gojo Satoru. Tengen would be about to speak up once again, but Yuji would put his finger over his mouth, telling her to be quiet. Yuji would say that was enough talking, and that he feels Tengen is simply trying to distract him here. He would tell Tengen while they've been talking, he could feel numerous souls walking around them, so he would tell them to come out. This is when Yuki would step out of one of the barriers that Tengen had placed, introducing herself to Yuji, saying that she heard all about his plan, and that she sees numerous flaws with it. She would tell Yuji, does he actually think he could stand over the Jujutsu Society with an iron fist as he is alone? And then not only does he want to take Jujutsu sorcery outside of Japan, he wants to make it worldwide in order for him to rule with an iron fist. It simply doesn't make sense to her. Yuji would say that he doesn't have to explain anything to her, and that it doesn't matter if she doesn't get it. Everything in this world was meant for Yuji to take. That's why he was given the ability he's been given. So it was either they could stand with her, or die here and become pawns to his plan in order to take over everything. Yuji would then smile and say that he's heard a lot about Yuki. He doesn't know what her technique is exactly, but he's heard plenty. He knows that her technique will make a fine addition to his own. Yuki would then laugh and say that she would rather kill herself than allow Yuji to take her technique. His ideals are way too crazy, and she would rather go down instead of giving him her technique. Yuji would then say, even if she were to die, he could take her technique a little bit after her death. As long as it wasn't too long, he would still be able to take it. So either way, she could give up her technique easily, or Yuji would simply kill her and then take her technique. Yuki would then smile and then ask Yuji, does he really think he'll be able to kill her today? Even with all of those techniques at his disposal, she'll be able to beat Yuji with her one technique and show him that he's not superior to anyone. Yuji would lift up his hands and tell her to go ahead and try. Yuki would then summon Garuda and say that she has more than enough strength to do so. She would add mass to Garuda and kick it over towards Yuji, where Yuji would attempt to block it, but to his surprise, the attack would break his arm instantly. Yuji would laugh and say that that attack was a lot more powerful than he thought it was going to be, and that he's genuinely surprised. She would tell Yuji not to be surprised so early on into the fight because she has a lot more to show. Yuji would use reverse curse technique, healing his arm instantly. As Yuki would rush forward, Yuki knew that she couldn't allow Yuji to touch her with the palm of his hands. Otherwise, her technique was gone for good, and that would make things even worse than they already were. Garuda would rush back onto Yuki's side as she was rushing in. As she would go in, she would throw a punch at Yuji. Yuji would use Idol Transfiguration to reinforce his arm, attempting to block the blow. As Yuki would strike, Yuji would be surprised, seeing as the weight behind this attack was even more than Garuda. With his arm being completely blown off, he would understand a little bit of how her technique works. Yuki would then smile and ask Yuji if he was surprised, saying that she's stronger than she looks, isn't she? She would then begin to explain her technique to Yuji, saying that her technique is called Star Rage. It has the ability to add virtual mass to herself and Garuda, making both of their destructive potential exponentially dangerous. Yuji would kiss his teeth, realizing what she had just did. Now that she had just explained her technique to him, it was going to be even stronger, and even more of a hassle for Yuji to deal with. However, at the same time, Yuki knew that even though she did a lot of damage there, she needs to hurry up and finish this fight quickly, because if Yuji got the chance to actually do something and use multiple of his techniques, she would be in a bad position. They would both sigh to themselves and say that it was a pain. As both the two fighters would take their stances, Yuki would attempt to hurry up and rush back in on Yuji. However, before Yuki had the chance to rush in completely, Yuji would have used convergence, firing off a piercing blood attack, as Garuda would have flew in front of the attack, rolling into a ball, attempting to block the attack for Yuki. As the piercing blood would strike onto Garuda, the blood would make contact and make a large explosion, catching Yuki off guard, throwing her off balance. As Yuji would capitalize off the moment, rushing in, he would activate Flowing Red Scale, while summoning a small amount of Rapid Escape, imbuing them with gravity techniques. As he would rush forward, he would send them forward as well. As Yuki would just be about to catch herself, she would see a rabbit approaching her quickly. Yuki would send Garuda onto the rabbits, curling Garuda into a ball and punching them into the rabbits. Since Yuki had added mass to Garuda and sent them towards the rabbits, Yuji would be surprised to see that his technique didn't work on Garuda, but that wouldn't stop his initial rush. He would get right in front of Yuki, as he would prepare hand-to-hand combat with her. Yuki would smile at Yuji, telling him that she didn't take him to be the hand-to-hand fighter type. She thought he was too scared to do anything and sat in the back while his abilities did all the work. Yuji would laugh and say that people underestimate him because they think he can't fight in hand-to-hand, when really, majority of the time, he simply just wants to have fun. Yuji would throw a kick at Yuki, however, she would deflect it and punch Yuji in the face with her right arm. Yuji would twist around and throw a right jab at Yuki. However, Yuki would catch this, pulling Yuji into her and throwing two more quick jabs at his face. This would knock Yuji back a bit. However, Yuki would follow up her combo with a two-handed palm strike that would send Yuji flying. Yuji would catch himself. However, Yuki was not done with her assault. She would send Garuda onto Yuji, wrapping around him. As she would begin to rush in, and Yuji would smile ear to ear, telling Yuki that this was more like it. Just as Yuki would be about to throw another punch, Yuji would use cleave on Garuda, slicing the Shikigami and breaking himself free. Yuki would have been surprised, as she would have forgotten that Yuji was able to use cleave and dismantle like Sukuna was able to. Just then, Yuji would throw his hands up, sending a dismantle towards Yuki, as it would slice Yuki, but it wouldn't do any major damage. Yuki would get pissed off, asking if Yuji was taking it easy on her. Yuji would only shrug his shoulders and smile even more. She would then tell Yuji that he shouldn't be taking her lightly at all, as without healing herself, she would continue to rush in at Yuji once more. However, Yuji would realize that the weight behind her stomps was even more than before. Yuki would then yell out Garuda, as Yuji would be confused because he thought he sliced the beast in multiple pieces. However, Garuda would then fly over to Yuki's side, as Yuki would grab onto Garuda, wielding Garuda like a whip. She would then swing Garuda around and whip at Yuji. As she would crack Garuda, the area around Yuji would proceed to be demolished, as Yuji would be absolutely shocked. The weight and power behind that one attack was incredible. Her technique is something Yuji needs now. The force that she possesses is absolutely unfathomable. That much damage from a single strike alone is ridiculous. Yuki would then whip Garuda around again, cracking it at Yuji once more. But instead, this time, with Yuji still being in awe at the attack, it would strike Yuji in the chest, caving his chest in and sending him backwards into the wall of the barrier. Yuji would begin to smile and laugh profusely. He would then tell himself that he needs to get a bit more creative in order to beat this woman. So he would do just that. He was going to force combine his Shikigami using Idol Transfiguration. He would then begin to merge Nue with Great Serpent, Round Deer, and Tiger Funeral. This of course creating Merged Beast Agito. Summoning the Shikigami, he would then imbue the Shikigami with blood manipulation, allowing it to be able to use Flowing Red Scale Stack. Although this took a lot of cursed energy out of Yuji, the effects behind it was absolutely worth it. Yuji would then begin to smile and ask Yuki, was she ready for round 2? Yuki would be studying up and down what that Shikigami was, but she wasn't going to let it throw her off her game. She would smile and tell Yuji to bring it. He's not so scary after all. Yuji would only shrug his shoulders and say that he guesses so, as just as quickly in the next second, Merged Beast Agito would be right in front of Yuki. Being caught off guard by the Shikigami's speed, she would attempt to block. However, the strike would send electricity coursing through her body, as well as almost break her arm in the process. That one attack would have left her arm completely numb. This is when Yuki realized that she might be in trouble completely. Yuji would then proceed to use Flowing Red Scale Stack on himself. He would rush in at Yuki, as Agito would do the same as well. Agito would strike Yuki in her back, sending her flying towards Yuji. With electricity coursing through her body and being sent straight towards Yuji, Yuji would follow up on the attack, striking Yuki in her stomach. With a punch imbued with his explosion technique, he would strike as Yuki would begin to cough up blood. Just then, Yuji would point at Yuki's stomach, as the place that Yuji had last touched would begin to explode, creating even more damage for Yuki. Agito would then grab onto Yuki's arm, sending electricity coursing throughout her body once more. Yuki wasn't able to think straight at all. She couldn't put anything she wanted to into play, and her entire body was being fried from the inside. Her vision was becoming blurry, and it was extremely hard for her to think. As Yuji would begin to rush in once more, he would then proceed to launch a devastating combo onto Yuki, along with Agito doing the same thing. With Yuji on one side and Agito on the other, they would begin to pummel Yuki over and over. Yuji would then finish off the combo with a punch towards Yuki's gut again. However, this time, he would use Idol Transfiguration, turning his hand into a blade, piercing straight through it. He would then begin to grab onto Yuki's neck and say, "This is what happens when I don't take it easy. The fights just end too quickly and I can't have any fun at all." He would then tell Yuki not to put up any more of a fight and to simply give him her technique. However, Yuki would then call onto Garuda again, as she would add mass onto Garuda, sending it towards Yuji. However, Yuji would then use Idol Transfiguration on his other hand, overlapping armor and flesh in order to cushion the blow, as he would catch Garuda and tell Yuki that that was enough. Yuji would then use his innate technique onto Yuki, stripping her of Star Rage and taking the technique for himself. Yuji would then begin to smile. With another technique this powerful under his arsenal, he would be absolutely unstoppable. His next move now was to find out where Tengen was actually hiding. In the beginning of the fight, when he could feel Yuki, he could feel another soul nearby, so he knew that had to be Tengen. He was going to strip down these barriers. Even if it took him a week to do so, he was going to strip them down and find out where Tengen was. He may have not been well versed in barrier techniques as Kenjaku was, however, Yuji knew just enough. Eventually, by using his innate technique, plus what he knew of barrier techniques, he was able to find the true form of Tengen. With Tengen asking Yuji once more, is this really what he wants to do? She would tell Yuji that he's still following in the shoes of Kenjaku, that he's still dancing in the palm of Kenjaku's hand. She would tell Yuji that he needs to wake up. He needs to understand that some things are just not meant to happen. She would tell Yuji that when his entire worldview comes crashing down back onto him, he's going to regret everything that he's ever done. Trying to rule the world with an iron fist isn't going to go the way that he wanted. Something or someone will intervene and stop him eventually. That is simply how the world of Jujutsu works. There will always be balance in the world, and you can't do anything to stop it, Yuji. Yuji would have a straight face and tell Tengen to shut up. He would tell Tengen that he will rule for as long as he wants to. Once he cleans up everything in the culling games, he will begin his progress on world domination. He will finish absorbing the rest of Sukuna. Every person he comes across in the culling games, he will take their technique. And when the culling games is over, he will make sure everyone will fear him. And that fear will generate more cursed energy. The more cursed energy that's brought about in the world will bring about stronger cursed spirits that he can absorb then. And when those cursed spirits come to play, it will generate even more fear, bringing even more cursed energy. Yuji would tell Tengen that he will continuously get stronger until the day he dies, but since he's gonna absorb Tengen, that'll never happen. Yuji would then place his palm onto Tengen's head, saying that he truly thanks her. She will be the turning point in Jujutsu history yet again. Using his innate technique, he would then begin to absorb Tengen's soul, taking Tengen's immortality for himself. For the next step of his plan, he would then go on to the culling games. He was going to take everyone's technique that was there, and when he was done doing that, he was going to spread the games throughout the entire world, not just Japan. Any places that even had a slight amount of cursed energy in it. He would start off small and expand over time. Since now he had all the time in the world, the only person that could potentially stop him was Gojo. However, as of right now, they had no means to be able to unseal Gojo, and Sukuna himself wasn't much of a threat to Yuji at the moment. Yuji was on top of the world right now. Everything was going smoothly for him, and there was not a soul that could stop him at this moment. However, at this current moment, word was being spread about Yuji, how he was able to kill Tengen, and there was not a Jujutsu sorcerer currently who had not heard of him. Being able to seal Gojo, and technically be a second Sukuna, would begin to spread more fear than ever. Unbeknownst to Yuji, his plan was already working. Fear. That was the only thing he wanted. People to fear him, and to generate more cursed energy. Since there was a lot more to do, he would continue to plan. He was going to enact exactly what Kenjaku had did. Once he was done with this culling game, he was going to continue marking people over and over with idol transfiguration, making it so their brain would have the same structure as a sorcerer, awakening even more people's techniques in order for him to steal them. This was only the start to Yuji's plan. There was so much more to come. The only thing Yuji had to do was give it time. Unbeknownst to Yuji, he was generating fear, the exact thing he wanted, so people could generate more cursed energy. His plan was working, albeit slow, it was still working in general. After Tengen's defeat, Yuji would officially begin the culling games, awakening every single sorcerer that Kenjaku had placed a mark upon within the 10 colonies. Yuji's plan for the culling game was simple. He was going to go to each and every colony and absorb as many curse techniques as he possibly could. And then when he had his fill, he was going to continue Kenjaku's plan. He would attempt to talk to the Japanese government and show them about cursed energy and how it works and how they could use it as a renewable resource, hoping they would buy into the plan so that he could use non-sorcerers in order to generate even more cursed energy. His plan was solid, and he knew that no one could stop him at the moment. For right now, he was simply going to take it easy. He had enough fighting. He simply wanted to have fun now. There was no one who could stop him now, not even Sukuna himself. Gojo was sealed. The majority of the sorcerers were dead. When everything was said and done, He was going to go back to Jujutsu High and destroy everything there anyway. Either that, or make it his base of operations. Ruling the world with fear, ruling the world with an iron fist. Yuji couldn't wait, smiling ear to ear. Just then, we would cut over to the Jujutsu sorcerers. It would be Yuta, Hikari, Maki, and Nanami. They would all be discussing a plan on how they were going to take down Yuji, and or free Satoru Gojo. All of them knew things were grim, however, they needed to free Satoru Gojo as he was their only hope. They knew that Tengen was dead, seeing as majority of the barriers around Jujutsu High were down, and they had to come up with some kind of plan. They didn't know exactly how they were going to free Satoru Gojo, but they would have to come up with something. They were only able to talk to Tengen briefly, before Yuji had found his way inside of the Jujutsu High barriers. Tengen would tell them about Yuji's plan and what he wanted to do, or how he was enacting Kenjaku's plan. She would explain the basics to them, but that was all she was able to do. Things were looking extremely grim. Maki had gone to the Zenin clan, attempting to use Megumi's name as head in order to take weapons out of their inventory. However, coming back, there was a different heir to her altogether. Yuta would tell the group that they have to find a way to free Satoru Gojo within the culling games. With all the people that had awakened the technique, or the incarnated sorcerers themselves, there was at least one person in there who could possibly unseal Satoru Gojo or had a technique that was able to do so. They would simply have to get lucky and attempt to find that person. They had no idea where Megumi was either. They didn't know if he was dead or simply out of commission somewhere. They had to focus their sights on that as well. They would attempt to find Megumi, find someone who could free Satoru Gojo, and rack up points in order to change rules and attempt to save as many people as they could in the culling games. All the non-sorcerers in there were simply playthings to the sorcerers that were in there. Yuta would tell the group that they should more than likely split up. It wasn't the smartest idea, however. If they split up, they would be able to find more ground. Yuji could be in one of the colonies, so he would tell them to simply be careful, and if they were to encounter Yuji, don't engage with him, simply run away. Yuji was too strong for anybody but Yuta at the moment. He would tell them to simply be careful, and that he would try to gain as many points as he could, as well as trying to conversate with other curse users to see if they would transfer their points, to try to make as many rules as they could, in order to halt or at least stop the culling games in some way. The entire group would nod, as the plan was in motion. Plan A was to attempt to find anybody with a whole bunch of points, to see if they would help them out in their plan in order to stop the culling games. They would also be attempting to find someone who could unseal Satoru Gojo within all of the colonies. Out of the 10 colonies that were there had to be at least one person that was able to unseal him, while also looking for Megumi. Their plan was sound, and they intended on doing exactly what they told each other they were going to do. They would separate, each going into different colonies. If they saw Yuji, they were simply going to lay low or retreat. Unless they were together, they were not going to try to fight Yuji at all, especially now that he's probably had some rest and is back at full strength. Their main goal was to unseal Satoru Gojo and find Megumi. The group would tell everybody their goodbyes and tell each other good luck. The sorcerers that would be entering the culling games would be Yuta, Maki, Hikari, and Nanami, with each of them entering different colonies. We would cut back over to where Yuji was. He would be in Tokyo Colony number 1, as he would have already racked up around 150 points. Most of the people that he would come across were weak, and the techniques that they had were simply boring, not worth his time and not worth absorbing. Majority of the sorcerers he was able to defeat by simply summoning Agito and watching them fight his Shikigami. There were only a couple of sorcerers that were able to push Agito back, and Yuji would attempt to have their fun with them. However, they would die almost immediately fighting Yuji. Just then, Kogane would pop up near Yuji, saying that a player has added a new rule, allowing them to see the points of other players. Yuji would raise an eyebrow at this and begin to smile. He would think whoever this player was a genius, being able to see other people's points, so he could see whoever was strong. He would then look at the list, seeing as there was a player named Hiromi Higuruma. The player had at least 100 points, and Yuji would begin to smile. He had finally found a strong person, someone with 100 points. This was well worth his time. He would go around the colony beating other people up, asking them where Higuruma was. As he would finally get his answer, he would head towards the theater, where Higuruma would have his base of operations at. As he would enter, he would see Higuruma in a bathtub. Yuji would smile and laugh and say that he's been looking for Higuruma and ask if he was him. Higuruma would look over and ask Yuji, why does he care? Yuji would tell Higuruma that he wants him to give him his points. He has some things that he needs to set in motion, and with Higuruma's points, he would be able to do so. Higuruma would simply turn his head back over the other way and say no. Higuruma would then tell Yuji that he's nothing but a criminal. Higuruma would say that he's heard about Yuji and that he knows that he's the one who started these games. Higuruma would say that the games themselves, they aren't bad at all. He's able to do justice properly and kill those who are truly evil. However, the way Yuji has gone about it is just unjust, and it goes against everything. Yuji would take a deep breath and ask Higuruma, is that all he has to say? It doesn't matter if Higuruma doesn't want to give him his points. Yuji could earn the points some other way anyway. He would kill everybody in this colony. It didn't matter to Yuji. Either way, he was getting his 100 points. Higuruma would then stand up, getting out of the bathtub. He would ask Yuji if that was so, as a hammer would begin to appear in Higuruma's hand. Yuji would begin to smirk, saying that it is. Higuruma would then tell Yuji that then he is truly evil and that he needs to be stopped right here. He would tell Yuji that he may not be the most upright person because of the things that he's done. However, Yuji is objectively worse than him, way worse. Yuji would smile and say that he knows, as Higuruma would immediately say the words domain expansion, deadly sentencing. Yuji would be surprised as he knew this guy wasn't a sorcerer of the past. However, in just this short amount of time, he was able to expand a domain. Yuji was even happier, seeing as there was somebody this strong. Yuji would sit there simply scanning the area, trying to figure out how the domain worked, as Higuruma would then begin to explain it to him. After said explanation, Yuji would then begin to be put on trial. Judgment would then tell Yuji that he's under suspicion for the murder of Nobara Kugisaki, as Yuji would simply smile and say yes, he killed her. Higuruma would give Yuji a disgusted look, seeing as he was able to admit that so openly. Judgment would then scream out to Yuji, guilty, death penalty, confiscation, as the domain would then subside. Yuji could feel it. Higuruma wasn't exactly aware of Yuji's technique, but Yuji could tell. Only one of his techniques got stripped away due to confiscation. Yuji would simply smile and say that it was such a shame. His technique seemingly counters majority of people. Higuruma's domain would have stripped Yuji of Star Rage. However, Higuruma was granted the Executioner's Sword. Higuruma wouldn't say anything about the Executioner's Sword, but Yuji could only take a guess. He probably shouldn't allow himself to get hit by that sword, seeing as the judgment said death penalty. Yuji had probably met specific conditions in order for that to happen. Yuji's brain being a lot more analytical due to him having an abundance of techniques. He would have to think around, understanding the situation he was in. Higuruma would rush forward, attempting to finish the fight as quickly as he could. He would stab at Yuji, however, Yuji would simply dodge to the side. He would play along with Higuruma for now, but eventually, he was going to end this. Having his fun, he would act as if he couldn't use any type of curse technique, simply dodging, as Higuruma would continue his assault, slashing and stabbing over and over. However, Yuji would simply dodge the attacks, being too fast for Higuruma. Higuruma may have been a genius, but Yuji was simply faster and stronger than him. He would continue his assault on Yuji, as he would use an overhead swing on Yuji. Yuji would dodge out of the way, finally pressing the attack. He would punch Higuruma in the face, sending him flying, as Higuruma would be stunned. Yuji seemingly didn't even use a lot of cursed energy there. However, he was pushed back that far away. Yuji was an entirely different beast, and this was just with cursed energy alone. There was no technique behind it. Higuruma knew that he had to hurry up and get this together. He needed to finish Yuji right now, otherwise he would die, and he knew that. But in Higuruma's head, he knew that if he was to die here, it would simply be his karma for killing the people that he killed already. Shaking his head, Higuruma would rush in once more, but to his surprise, Yuji would be behind him already. Caught off guard, he would be confused, as Yuji would have used projection sorcery. Just then, Higuruma would have turned into a frame himself, as Yuji would then use auto transfiguration, transforming his hand into a more compact version. On top of using blood manipulation, using flowing red scale stack, he would strike Higuruma, crashing the panel, slamming him into the wall. Off this one attack alone, Higuruma was coughing up blood. This had also broke 2 of Higuruma's ribs. However, Higuruma would be confused. He thought he took Yuji's technique. What exactly was this, and what was going on? He was sure Judgment said confiscation, and Yuji wasn't able to use it. However, it would seem Yuji was toying with him this entire time. He couldn't believe it. Yuji would then smile as he would point his finger towards Higuruma, saying the words boom, as Higuruma would let off a soft smile and say that this is just simply his karma, as he would then explode, taking even more damage, blasting him back into the wall once more. Just these 3 attacks alone would cause Higuruma to be knocked unconscious. Knowing Higuruma probably wasn't going to give his points to Yuji, Yuji would stand over Higuruma's body. He would then use his reverse gravity technique on Higuruma, beginning to crush his body. Using RCT on Higuruma just a tiny bit in order to wake him up. He would tell Higuruma to wake up. Beginning to put more pressure on his body, he would tell Higuruma that right now he could transfer his points and live, or he could keep his points and die. The choice was up to him. Higuruma would tell Yuji that he doesn't know what he has planned. However, Higuruma would tell Yuji that he would rather die than assist him in whatever plans that he had going on. It would simply be his karma. Yuji would say whatever, and so be it. He's still going to gain the points, no matter what Higuruma does. He was going to kill everybody in this colony and then move on to the next. It didn't matter to Yuji. All of this was simply a game to him. Higuruma would call Yuji sick and say that somebody will stop him eventually. Yuji would laugh and say he's heard that before, as he would make the reversal gravity even stronger, beginning to crush Higuruma slowly. Yuji would simply turn away and begin to walk away, as he didn't care about Higuruma's technique. It wasn't something that was effective for Yuji. The only thing that he'd be able to make useful out of Higuruma's technique was his curse tool. Other than that, it was pointless to him. Higuruma would begin to get crushed slowly and agonizingly, as his life would then finally come to an end. Yuji would be granted the 5 points and begin to make his way out of the theater. And he would then tell Kagane to add a rule. He would tell Kagane to add the ability to move freely between the colony borders, so he could make his progress towards different colonies. Setting it in play, as everybody would hear this rule, majority of the sorcerers would begin to be frightened. Even if you were ruling number 1 in your colony, if someone who was stronger from another colony was to simply join in and kill you, what were you going to do? Yuji would then make his way to Tokyo colony number 2. He'd look at the list of players, as just then he'd see another player with over 100 points named Hajime Kashimo. He would begin to smile at the sight of another strong player. He wasn't expecting one so early like this. He would just hope that they had a better technique than the last person he fought. Feeling the cursed energy of 2 fighters nearby, he would sprint over, as he would see a guy with blonde hair and a guy with blue hair fighting. Yuji would jump down off the building he was on, landing in between both of them. He would smile menacingly, saying that he didn't mean to interrupt both of them. However, he would ask if either one of them was Kashimo. Hikari would look on in confusion at Yuji, realizing exactly who he was. He remembered what Yuta had told him, that if he was to encounter Yuji, he would need to run. Do not engage with him at all. They would only fight Yuji when they were together. Kissing his lips, Hikari would then begin to back up, as Yuji would say not so fast. He would appear behind Hikari, using projection sorcery, putting his hand on his shoulder. He would tell Hikari that he was going to fight, because he wanted to see his curse technique. Hikari would begin to sweat, as he didn't realize Yuji was this fast, and just feeling the cursed energy off of Yuji, he could tell Yuji was way stronger than Yuta, and that's why Yuta told him that they should wait until they were together to fight Yuji. Kashimo would laugh and say that he can't believe there was someone this bold that would come in his colony and believe that they were going to run things right now. Kashimo would tell Yuji that he was in the middle of a fight, so if he could sit to the side and wait it out, then he would get to him shortly. Yuji would say no, that he wasn't going to sit around and wait, and that all 3 of them could fight each other. He would tell Kashimo, wouldn't that make it so much more fun? Kashimo would laugh again and say that he really loves the way Yuji thinks. However, Yuji would then say that the last guy he fought, he didn't have a lot of fun with him. So he was going to test the both of them. He wasn't going to fight immediately. However, he was going to summon one of his strongest Shikigami and see what either of them could do. Kashimo would laugh and call Yuji a coward. However, Yuji would say that no, he wasn't a coward. He could kill either of them if he really wanted to. However, right now, he simply wants to have fun. Smiling at Kashimo, he would then make hand signs to summon Maharaga, summoning him. Maharaga would stand tall with the will above his head, as both Hikari and Kashimo would be shocked. They didn't know what this thing was, but the presence that it had was absolutely alarming. Kashimo would begin to smile. He didn't know Yuji was this strong. However, if this was just one of the Shikigami he could summon, what could Yuji himself do? This was all the more exciting. Although he only wanted to fight Sukuna, Yuji might just be worth his time as well. Yuji would tell the two that he was going to sit over there, pointing towards some boxes, and that he was going to watch the three of them fight to the death, and whoever came out on top, he would fight after. However, Yuji was simply doing this to simply see whose technique he wanted to take. It wasn't a matter of who was stronger. He knew that if he really wanted to, he would simply use his gravity technique, pinning them to the ground. And if they were strong enough to resist that, he could simply use Star Rage, imbuing it within his gravity technique to make it even stronger. Yuji would smile and say that he was going to count down from 3, and that when he gets to 1, he wants them to fight with their heart's content. He would begin counting down. 3, 2, 1. As he would clap his hands, Maharaga would rush forward immediately, as Kashimo would rush forward as well. Hikari would be reluctant, but he knew he had no choice but to fight here. Starting off strong, Hikari would immediately pop a domain expansion, hoping to get jackpot so he could last even a little bit longer. Fighting Kashimo, Hikari was still on the back end of the fight. However, using his domains, he was able to keep up. But now that there was another person in the mix, he wasn't sure if he could keep up or not. However, he wasn't going to let that stop him. Inside of the domain, Maharaga's wheel would immediately spin. However, Kashimo would make the first move, rushing towards Maharaga, sending a punch straight towards his face. Maharaga would once again take the brunt of the attack, brushing it off, sending a punch straight towards Kashimo. Kashimo would block the attack. However, the weight behind it would be more than he expected, as it would push him back. Hikari would simply play it safe, waiting on his domain, but Maharaga would not allow that. He would rush towards Hikari, as Hikari would get into a defensive mode, ready for an attack. Maharaga would send a punch towards Hikari, it would slam into his head, but Hikari would be able to block it simply just in time. However, it would crash him into the walls of the domain, as Maharaga would attempt to follow up on the attack. He would rush straight towards Hikari, throwing a right. Hikari would duck underneath it, attempting to sweep Maharaga's legs, but Maharaga would simply jump over it, slamming his fist down again. Hikari would roll out of the way, but just then he would see Kashimo sprinting straight towards both of them. Maharaga would swing once again at Hikari, but he would swing around Maharaga, dodging the attack, as Kashimo would swing down, attempting to hit Hikari. However, his attack would land on Maharaga, as Maharaga would turn his head, twisting towards Kashimo. The wheel on his head would begin to spin once more. Just then, Kashimo would begin to smile. He would realize that he had enough electricity stored up. He would shoot it out, making it head straight towards Maharaga, sending it directly towards his head, hoping it would blow the creature to smithereens. It would connect, and Maharaga's head would be blown straight off his body. Kashimo would laugh and say that he didn't think the Shikigami would be so weak. However, the wheel above Maharaga's head again would spin, as his head would reform, and Maharaga would begin to smile. Kashimo would say of course, as Kashimo would then say of course, there's no way that something that was summoned by that guy would be that weak. Just then, Hikari's domain expansion would line up 3 numbers as he would hit a jackpot, dismissing the domain, and Hikari would have almost endless cursed energy. Yuji would sit there, realizing that although Hikari had a great curse technique, his domain was the only thing that was worthwhile. It gave him an immense amount of cursed energy, allowing him to be effectively immortal. Yuji would grit his teeth, realizing Hikari's curse technique was completely useless to him. He would then begin to focus on Kashimo. Maharaga would swing yet again towards Kashimo, as Kashimo would duck underneath it, using his staff to smack Maharaga in the chin. Maharaga would immediately gather himself, looking straight back down at Kashimo, as Kashimo would begin to smile once more, saying that he can't believe this thing was so durable. As Hikari would then rush in, Hikari would smack Maharaga out of the way, telling Kashimo that they need to work together. However, Kashimo would laugh and tell Hikari that he's a loser, and that only losers think about working together. He's going to kill this thing and Hikari, and then immediately go after Yuji. Yuji would notice something as well about Kashimo. Kashimo wasn't using an innate technique, not yet at least. It was the trait of his cursed energy that was allowing him to do the things he was doing so far, generating electricity. If Yuji took his technique, would he be able to use the trait of the cursed energy? This was the question he was asking himself. He could also feel it off of Hikari as well. Hikari's cursed energy was rough. However, he wasn't sure, even if he were to take either of their techniques, was the cursed energy trait from both of them going to rub off on him? If so, Kashimo's cursed technique would be the better one, seeing as it causes more destructive capabilities other than Hikari's. If anything, he could imbue one of his Shikigami with his cursed technique, allowing them to be able to use the electricity and not himself. Yuji would simply begin to smile, as he would clap his hands, and Maharaga would be desummoned. Kashimo would be confused and scream at Yuji, telling him what was the deal and that he was having fun. Yuji would say that he thinks he knows what he wants to do. He would look at both of them and tell them to come at him with all they've got. He doesn't want a one-on-one, he wants a 2v1. He wants both of them to come at him, holding nothing back at all. Kashimo would begin to smile. He had already generated enough electricity, so he would tell Yuji sure thing, as he would throw his staff directly towards Yuji. Yuji would simply grab the tool, telling Kashimo that this was such a mundane way to start a fight. However, Kashimo would then send electricity out of his body, going straight towards the rod. Yuji would realize, however, it would simply be too late. As the electricity would reach the rod, it would then attach onto Yuji, blowing his arm off completely. Yuji would smile, as he had just been outplayed for a single second. Hikari would then believe that maybe, just maybe, him and Kashimo might be able to kill Yuji here, as Yuji would immediately use reverse curse technique, regenerating his hand almost instantly, as Kashimo and Hikari would be surprised at the speed of his reverse curse technique. Yuji would cock back his fist, using Star Rage, as Kashimo, already heading in, would prepare to block the attack. Yuji would charge his fist forward, sending the punch directly towards Kashimo. Kashimo would block the attack. However, the weight behind the attack was insane. Kashimo blocking would realize this, as the arm he had blocked with would break. As Yuji wasn't done with him yet, he would use his reverse gravity technique on Kashimo, slamming him into the ground, as he would then look over to Hikari and tell him that he's welcome to join. Hikari would attempt to rush at Yuji and punch him. However, Yuji would simply dodge out of the way. He would then use blood manipulation, using convergence, creating a small blood orb in his hand, compressing it. He would then use piercing blood on Hikari, only needing it to nick his skin. As long as it created an open wound, he didn't care. Hikari would attempt to smack the attack out of the way. However, it would skid off his skin, creating a small cut. That cut alone was enough. Hikari could feel it, the poison from blood manipulation coursing throughout his body. In just a few moves alone, he had immobilized both fighters. Yuji would then have a bored look on his face and say that he can't believe that was really all that they had. Hikari would then understand exactly why Yuta didn't want them to engage at all. The gap in strength between him and Yuji was absolutely immense. Yuji would walk over to Kashimo, as he would place his hand on Kashimo's forehead, telling him to not scar him too much, and he simply wants to try something out with his technique. He would use his innate technique on Kashimo, taking his technique. He would then begin to flare off his cursed energy. And to Yuji's surprise, his cursed energy trait would have changed due to absorbing Kashimo's cursed technique. He would begin to smile and say that this was absolutely amazing. He knew he would find a gem among these pebbles, and Kashimo was the one to deliver it to him. Hikari would sit there weakened and not knowing what to do. Yuji would be about to walk over to him, but just then, Hikari would immediately pop his domain expansion. He needed to get the poison out of his system, and if he were to hit a jackpot here, he would simply try to escape and not fight Yuji. However, inside of the domain, Yuji would tell Hikari that he doesn't really care for him. He wanted to find Kashimo so that he could extract a strong player's technique, but Hikari wasn't worth his time, not even in the slightest. Hikari had a decent technique, however it wasn't suitable for Yuji. And Yuji would tell Hikari that he could easily kill him and take his points. However, there are other stronger players he wants to fight first and take their techniques, so he's letting him off the hook. He would then tell Hikari that he should probably get that poison out of his system though, because eventually he'll rot from the inside out. Yuji would begin to walk away, waving at Hikari, telling him to try not to die, because he still wants to fight him at least once. Yuji, using Star Rage, would simply burst through the walls of Hikari's domain, with Hikari being even more shocked. The walls from inside a domain were absolutely fortified, so the fact that Yuji was able to use a technique and burst through the inside of the walls was insane to him. He could understand if it was from the outside. However, from the inside just shows the gap in strength between him and Yuji once more. Hikari would simply laugh and say that he has his work cut out for him. Yuji had just extracted Kashimo's technique and was on his way to the next colony. There were so many techniques he wanted to learn and so many techniques he wanted to take from everybody. And using Kashimo's technique, he was going to have a lot more fun. He had already decided to move on to the next colony. No one else there was worth his time or even had a decent enough technique for him to take, so he was going to move on. Entering the Sondai colony, he would call on Kagane and ask about the players that were inside the colony and how many points they had as well. He would see that there were 4 players that had a large amount of points, and a huge grin would begin to grow on Yuji's face. These guys had to be strong if they all had this many points. He wanted to see every last one of their techniques and what they could do. However, just as Yuji was scanning the list of players, a humongous Shikigami would crash from a building, attempting to lunge itself at Yuji. Yuji would look over with a dull look on his face. He would begin to charge his fist with Star Rage, adding mass to his arm. He would then cock his fist back, throwing a punch straight towards the Shikigami. The fist would connect, caving the Shikigami's head in, as it would be blasted into a wall. He would then reach his hand out, as he would close his hand into a fist, using his explosion technique reversal. The Shikigami would then implode, causing it to be extinguished. Just then, some bat-like Shikigami would appear, attempting to close in on Yuji. Yuji, however, would say that this was boring, and whoever was sending these Shikigami out should come and fight, instead of hiding away. Using projection sorcery, Yuji would vanish from the position he was in, feeling the subtle cursed energy of Druve. Ending up right behind him, Yuji would simply touch his head, as he would do the same thing he did to the Shikigami, closing his fist and making Druve's head implode. Yuji would then say that that was a waste of time. He would call upon Kagane again, asking exactly who that was, seeing that it was the man with 91 points. He would be disappointed, seeing that the person with 91 points was this weak. He's hoping at least the other 3 will be able to give him some kind of challenge. Just then, Yuji would see a swarm of cockroaches heading straight towards his way. Seeing this, Yuji would simply jump in the air, allowing the wave of cockroaches to simply pass underneath him. However, surprising Yuji, the cockroaches would begin to follow him. As they would grab on his leg and begin eating, Yuji would begin to smile and say that this was interesting. As each cockroach would begin to gnaw on Yuji's leg, they would begin to be electrocuted at the same time, with majority of them falling off and the wave of cockroaches falling down. Yuji would smile as, just from behind him, Kurorushi would be seen, holding his festering life blade, about to swing at Yuji. Yuji would notice him, however, it would simply be too late. Kurorushi would land a blow with his blade on Yuji's shoulder, sending a gash down his torso. As Yuji would get slashed, he would feel the eggs be punctured inside of him. At the same time, he could begin to feel the eggs begin to chew their way out as they would burst out of his arm, leaving Yuji's entire right side of his torso hanging off his body. Yuji would begin to laugh once more as he would use reverse curse technique, telling the cockroach that he won't let that happen again. Kurorushi would fly back in, attempting to finish Yuji off, swinging down with its blade once more, as Yuji would simply dodge, stepping out of the way just in time. Yuji would put his hand up and begin to use reverse gravity manipulation, sending the bug crashing into the ground. Yuji would then begin to use reverse gravity manipulation on himself, as well as using Star Rage, adding mass to himself. He would then begin his free fall, rocketing directly towards the bug. He would also begin to use his explosion technique on himself. As the second he would make contact with Kurorushi, a gigantic explosion would be heard, as Kurorushi would be below Yuji, splattered across the floor and almost out of commission. Yuji would be impressed, seeing that there was a cursed spirit this strong. He was going to make use of it. Using curse manipulation, he would turn Kurorushi into an orb, saying that he can't believe he has to do this, but he's even worse. he would begin to swallow Kuroshi's orb, saying that he'll make use of Kuroshi later. Just then, from the left side, Yuji would hear someone tell him, "So you must be the one I've heard so much about." Yuji would turn his body to swing. However, his arm would begin to be mutated, being bent throughout the sky. As just then, Uro would use Thin Icebreaker onto Yuji, cracking him in the side of the head, sending him flying into a building. Yuji, emerging himself out of the rubble, would begin to laugh, saying that Uro was a coward for attacking him like that. Using Idol Transfiguration, he would then begin to sprout wings on his back, as he would begin to shoot off straight towards Uro. Surprising her with a sudden burst of speed, he would strike Uro as she would block. However, the electric properties from Yuji's punches would cause her to feel numb throughout her entire body. Yuji would laugh, as he would then use his explosion technique, blowing her arm clean off her body. Yuji would laugh and tell Uro that he likes her technique, and he thinks he's going to take it for himself. However, from behind Yuji, he would feel a huge accumulation of cursed energy begin to gather. Turning around, he would then see a beam heading straight towards him. Yuji would duck underneath the beam, as Uro would see it, using sky manipulation to bend the beam back around right towards Yuji. Yuji would laugh and say that that technique is so useful, as he would get struck directly by one of Ryu's attacks. Ryu would then scream out and tell them both to not forget about him. He's heard so much about Yuji, and he hopes that Yuji will be able to satiate his appetite. Yuji would get up from off the ground once more and begin to chuckle, saying that he's happy he's become so famous in this short amount of time. There's so much more that Yuji wants to do still, and he's going to start with both of them. Being able to discharge cursed energy like that, and being able to manipulate the sky, these were two very interesting techniques. Yuji couldn't wait to get his hand on either of them. However, once again, all three combatants could feel a large spike of cursed energy. Yuji would be amazed by the amount of cursed energy this person had, turning immediately over to see Yuta Akotsu sitting there. Yuta would then speak up, saying that he didn't expect Yuji to be here right now. Yuta would then analyze the situation, realizing that Yuji had already taken out 2 contestants, and that he had to have gone through quite a bit of his cursed energy. He was already able to wound Uro, and seeing as Yuji had 65 points, he would assume that Yuji was the one that made the rule to make it so people were able to cross the colonies. Yuji would look on at Yuta and begin to laugh, telling him that he has a humongous amount of cursed energy, more than Gojo Satoru. Yuta would confirm with Yuji that he does have a lot of cursed energy, and it is more than Satoru Gojo's. However, his teacher is still the better of the two of them, but he doesn't feel like talking to Yuji. Yuta knew that he shouldn't engage with Yuji, but the scenario he was in was just too perfect. Yuji wasn't at full power, and he was fighting this entire time. So more than likely, Yuji had gone through a large amount of cursed energy by now. Yuta was going to test his luck. He knew the other two would focus more on Yuji, seeing as he was the most dangerous out of all of them. If they could all get him out of the way, then Yuta would do cleanup. And at the same time, they knew Yuji had killed Kenjaku, so more than likely he was the game master. And if Yuji were to die, the culling games themselves would probably end. Yuta would ready himself, getting himself for battle, as Yuji, Uro, and Ryu would do the exact same thing. It would be a 4-way fight, but 3 of the players knew that they had to focus on Yuji. If anything, Yuji knew that it was more likely to turn into a 3v1, but he was perfectly fine with that. Yuji would begin to smile and tell them to come on and bring it. Yuta would be the first one to rush in at Yuji. Katana in hand, he would swing horizontally at Yuji. However, Yuji would duck underneath it. Using blood manipulation, he would activate Flowing Red Scale Stack, speeding himself up, regaining his footing, and stepping right in front of Yuta. Yuta would be caught off guard by the sudden burst of speed, as Yuji would use Idol Transfiguration plus Star Rage, adding mass to himself while fortifying his hand. He would go for a strike on Yuta. However, Yuta would just barely block it in time. Blocking the attack with his blade, the blade would shatter on impact, Yuta being shocked by the amount of power packed in that one punch alone. But he would also realize something. Yuji had Yuki's technique, which means he killed her. This would begin to piss Yuta off. Yuji would then begin to call Yuji all types of names, cursing him up and down, saying that he's a heartless bastard. Yuji would let off a smirk and say that he knows. Yuta would rush back in. He would throw a right, as Ryu would begin to charge a blast in the background. Yuji would parry his right, as Yuta would continue to try and combo. Each fist Yuta would throw, Yuji would easily parry. Yuji would then begin to chuckle once more, telling Yuta that he hopes he can keep up. Using projection sorcery, he would go out of Yuta's sight, going straight to Ryu, getting behind him and asking him what he's doing. Ryu would turn around, However, he would be turned into a frame, as Yuji would begin to use blood manipulation, plus star rage, plus idol transfiguration, stacking all the abilities together, adding mass to himself, fortifying his hands, and creating blood armor on his hands as well. He would crack Ryu across the jaw, knocking him out in one fell swoop. Yuji would then laugh and say that it was so fun gathering new techniques. He would then use projection sorcery once more, going back over to Yuta. However, Yuta had already caught on to what this technique was, attempting to match Yuji. However, he just simply couldn't get the timing down. He would turn around, attempting to figure out where Yuji was. However, he would be turned into a frame quickly. Yuji would attempt to use the same combo on Yuta. However, Uro would use sky manipulation to bend the area around Yuta, causing Yuji's attack to miss altogether. Yuji would look up at Uro and say that she was getting in his way. He would use his gravity reverse technique, slamming Uro to the ground. He would then tell Uro that he has a surprise for her, saying as she didn't attack until this curse was completely taken out, he wanted to see how she was going to be able to go up against it now. Using curse manipulation, he would then summon Kurorushi, as he would point at Uro and tell Kurorushi to go crazy. Uro didn't realize that Yuji had captured Kurorushi and didn't kill him, turning him into one of his puppets, and Kurorushi was a terrible matchup for her. She would simply begin to fly away. However, Kurorushi was right on her tail. Yuta would finally break out of the projection sorcery, realizing that Yuji is a lot more powerful than he thought he was going to be. However, seeing what was going on now, things were going to take a dire turn. He was going to stick to his original plan. He simply needed to get out of there, find other people that would transfer their points to him, so they can attempt to bend rules around to stop the culling games. He would attempt to retreat. However, Yuji would use projection sorcery once more, getting right in front of Yuta, asking him where exactly is he going. Yuta, already reading what Yuji was doing, would already be sending a punch, as it would connect with Yuji's face, sending him crashing into a building nearby. Yuji would grab himself out of the rubble, smiling ear to ear, saying that Yuta was a genius. He had already figured out the curse technique. He wants to know how well Yuta would do against the others. Yuji would then begin to use 10 shadows, summoning Agito. He would give Agito the properties of Star Rage, increasing its mass tenfold, telling it to go forth and crush Yuta. The Shikigami would sprint forward, going straight at Yuta, leaving cracks in its step, each step seemingly getting heavier and heavier. Yuta, without no delay, would begin to pull his ring out and call onto Rika. Agito would be right in front of Yuta, throwing the punch, as Rika would catch it. However, the electricity from Agito would begin to shock Rika, as the mass added on Agito would blow Rika's arm off completely. Rika would sit there shocked and numb, as Agito would throw yet another punch at Rika, hitting her dead in the face, blowing Rika backwards into a building. Yuta would be surprised seeing this, as he didn't expect Yuji's technique to be so formidable. Yuta would call on to Rika. However, from behind Yuta, Yuji would begin cackling, telling him that he should pay attention more. Yuta would turn around. However, it would be too late. Yuji was already throwing an attack out, using his same combo of blood manipulation, plus idol transfiguration, plus star rage. Yuji would strike Yuta dead in the chest, causing him to be completely winded, breaking at least 5 of Yuta's ribs. Yuta would be launched backwards into a building, right where Rika was. Yuta would begin groaning and coughing up blood. As Yuta would begin to use RCT on himself, he needed to get out of here. Now was not the time to fight Yuji. They needed to free Satoru Gojo if they wanted to do anything against him. Yuji would then land down next to Yuta, telling him that he can't believe he has a whole bunch of cursed energy for nothing. He would say that the other guys were peons compared to him, yet Yuta is still completely useless. He would tell Yuta that he doesn't care for him anymore, although he knows what they want to do. There's no way the Jujutsu sorcerers are here for no reason. You guys are plotting something. Yuji would begin to smile, saying that they could try all they might, but nothing was going to stop Yuji at all. Yuji hasn't even hit the pinnacle of his power. This was only the beginning. He would begin to explain to Yuta exactly what he's going to do. The second he finishes the culling games here in Japan, since he's effectively immortal by consuming Tengen, he will move on to outside Japan, marking people just as Kenjaku did, setting up a culling games around the world, not just Japan. Japan was just the start. Yuji wants world domination. He wants every single person on the planet to fear him. Every non-sorcerer, Jujutsu sorcerer, cursed spirit, he wants to be a living legend. A world where everyone fears him because of his strength. The next coming of Sukuna. Yuta would begin to laugh and tell Yuji that his plan was stupid. Does he truly not realize that someone will be able to stop him eventually, even if it's not now? Jujutsu sorcery always balances itself. Let it be another Jujutsu sorcerer on your same level, or a cursed spirit that would wipe you from the face of the earth to bring balance. Even if I am to die today, you will die one day. Yuji would simply have a huge smile on his face. He would then tell Yuta that it doesn't matter who or what will appear later down the line. His rule will be absolute. There will be no other person or cursed spirit that will topple the strength I will have. Every time someone comes to power, I will kill them and take their technique. Anytime a cursed spirit believes that they could do better than me, I will kill them and take their technique. Everything in this world belongs to me. Yuji would then begin to laugh. It would start off light, then become menacing, getting louder and louder. As just then, Yuji would feel an accumulation of cursed energy nearby. As a beam of pure cursed energy would come crashing into him, Yuji had completely forgotten he hadn't killed Ryu, he had only knocked him out. Charging a granite blast and launched it straight at Yuji. Ryu would then begin to scream, telling Yuji that there's no way that he was going to let himself be taken out like that. His appetite isn't even close to being satiated. Ryu would rush in at Yuji, throwing punch after punch. However, Yuji would simply dodge out of the way, telling Ryu that he should have just stayed there and played dead. Ryu would then attempt to send an overhead punch. Yuji would dodge out of the way, cocking his fist back using Star Rage, adding as much mass as he possibly could to his fist. He would throw the punch, making it go straight through Ryu's stomach. Ryu would then begin to cough up an alarming amount of blood, as at the same time, Kururushi would be dragging Uro's limp body towards Yuji. Yuji would say that this was perfect. He was going to be able to take two techniques at once, as Kururushi would throw Uro onto Yuji, as he would hold on to both Ryu and Uro, using his innate technique, taking both Sky Manipulation and Cursed Energy Discharge. However, Yuji taking both techniques would begin to stunt his brain a little. He would sit there, stunned, taking in the information of both techniques at once. It was too much for his brain to process. Yuta would realize this, calling on to Rika, as Rika would be able to fly over since Agito was no longer in commission since Yuji's brain was registering the other two curse techniques. Yuta would also notice this, realizing that in order for them to be able to kill Yuji, they might have to make a few sacrifices, and Yuta would be the one willing to do that if it came down to it. He would make his way away, running as fast as he could away from Yuji. He was going to attempt to regroup with everyone else and try to formulate a plan, or see if they found anyone that would be able to get Satoru Gojo out of the prison realm. Running as fast as he could, Yuji would be able to get himself back together. However, looking around, he would realize that Yuta was gone. He would kiss his teeth and realize that he probably shouldn't do that. Yuta probably could have been able to kill him in that moment. However, the shock of being attacked would have probably awoken Yuji anyway, and he guesses Yuta wasn't going to take that chance. Yuji would put his hands on his chin, thinking about what his next move was going to be. He knew that Jogo had reincarnated Sukuna, so he was still a threat to be around. However, Sukuna didn't have that many fingers, so he wasn't going to be that much of a problem for Yuji. He would also understand that the Jujutsu sorcerers are probably looking for someone that was going to be able to unseal Satoru Gojo, but at the same time, he wasn't worried about Satoru Gojo either. The first fight, Yuji was inexperienced and didn't know exactly what Satoru Gojo was going to be capable of, but this time was different. He had already seen how Gojo fought. He knows all of Gojo's moves. If Gojo was to be unsealed, he would easily take care of him this time. Yuji would clench his fist, saying that right now, he doesn't need to be greedy. He needs to rest his body, saying that he needs to recharge. Combining curse techniques like that is exhausting. That early attack with Kururushi that made him repair his entire body took quite a lot out of him. He would then think to himself, saying that if the three of those guys were more coordinated, they would probably have been able to take on Yuji, but it was no matter now. Yuji was now simply going to rest himself, getting himself stronger for the next day. However, Yuji did not know that the Jujutsu sorcerers had found someone that was able to unseal Satoru Gojo. Yuji would make his way back with the other Jujutsu sorcerers, where he would be in a room. He would see two new faces, this being Takaba and Hana. Nanami would have told Yuta that he found Takaba and he helped him deal with some people. He would say that Takaba is an odd fellow, but it was good to have him on their side. Yuta would say that it was good that they have new teammates because they're going to need as much help as they can trying to defeat Yuji. Hikaru would speak up as well, saying that yes, they needed as many people as they could get against Yuji, telling the group that he had a run-in with Yuji, with Yuta saying that he had a run-in with Yuji as well. Hikari would tell the group that he was severely outclassed. Even while he hit his jackpot, he couldn't do much. He was poisoned by Yuji's blood manipulation, and it caused him to be slow anyway. Jackpot was able to rush the poison out of his system, however, taking on multiple attacks of blood manipulation would cause him to be exhausted quickly. Yuta would then tell the group that Yuji is also getting proficient at stacking his curse techniques together as well. He would tell the group that Yuji had easily annihilated 4 players that had a high amount of points. And on top of that, he's collected at least 2 more curse techniques that he knows of. Telling the group about Yuji's weird cursed energy trait as well. He would tell the group that it gives a slight shock, however, Yuta was able to block it with his cursed energy reinforcement. Yuta would then sit down and ask about Hana. Maki would then speak up, saying that she had saved Hana from some weird sorcerer. With Angel thanking Maki once more, Yuta would then ask Angel if they were willing to help them free Satoru Gojo in order to deal with Yuji. Angel would tell the group that she didn't want to get Hana in unnecessary violence. However, Yuta would then begin to plead with Angel, saying that they need Satoru Gojo in order to defeat Yuji. Because even if they were to all go right now and try to fight Yuji, he's positive Yuji would come out on top. The whole room would go silent. Hearing that come from Yuta himself was quite a shock to all of them. They knew Yuta was strong, but to hear him say that Yuji would probably be able to take on all of them was egregious. Angel would tell the group that she would help them this one time. However, they better put their lives on the line to protect Hana. Yuta would tell Angel that he was willing to do anything as long as they freed Satoru Gojo. Yuta would pull out the back of the prison room and tell Angel that they were going to use this to free Gojo. Once Gojo was freed, they would attempt to stop Yuji once more. At the moment, he's positive Yuji is simply trying to rest due to the fact that he's accumulated over 175 points in one day. In the downtime, they would do as planned. They were going to free Satoru Gojo and plan something with him when they free him. No one is to engage with Yuji by themselves because it would be considered a death wish. Everybody in the room would agree, realizing that this was a serious problem. They still hadn't found Megumi. They don't know what happened to him. All they know is they need to free Satoru Gojo, find Megumi, and kill Yuji once and for all. As the day would continue, they would do exactly that. They would get themselves together in an open area, ready to free Satoru Gojo. They would signal Hana as she would use her curse technique, using it on the back of the prison room in order to free Gojo. She would use her technique, and when the dust settled, Gojo would be standing there. Everyone would be excited due to the fact that Gojo was finally back. They would congregate with Gojo, telling him everything about how Megumi was missing and that they needed him in order to defeat Yuji. He's simply gotten too strong, and Gojo was probably the only person that was going to be able to help them defeat him. Gojo would simply smile and tell them that they don't need to worry anymore. Yuji wasn't so bad to fight the first time, and he doubts he's going to be bad the second time. Yuta would then tell Gojo that they need to fight Yuji together, but Gojo would stop him there, saying that he was going to fight Yuji alone, one-on-one. And if he was to die, then they would jump in. Yuta would be confused on why Gojo would want to fight Yuji alone, but Gojo would tell Yuta that he fights better off alone anyway, being able to do the most damage that he possibly could do without worrying about anybody else. That's just Gojo's style. In the meantime, while Yuji was doing whatever he was doing, he was going to prop them into shape, and after everything was said and done, they were going to find Megumi. Hoping that he wasn't dead, Gojo would tell Yuta that everything would go smoothly, and that he needn't worry about anything. If anything, Gojo has everything under control. He is Gojo after all. Yuta would sigh and say that he guesses he has no choice but to believe in Gojo. Gojo would have told everyone that he was going to fight Yuji alone. He didn't want anyone else to intervene, and that his style was to simply destroy Yuji without relying on anybody else or worrying about anybody else. He was going to do exactly that. In the downtime, he was going to train the other sorcerers as much as he could because he knew Yuji was going to be a formidable opponent. Even the first time they fought, Yuji was somewhat formidable against Gojo, even though he didn't beat Gojo. And on top of that, Gojo doesn't know the amount of curse techniques Yuji had collected for now, so it was only in his best interest to simply sit and wait, train himself and his students as much as he could so that when the time is right, and Gojo wasn't able to defeat Yuji, he would be able to do it when the time comes. Unknown to anybody, not even Yuji himself, Sukuna being inside of Megumi's body, realizing that he's only 3 fingers strong. He has his regular curse technique, however, it's not as strong as he wants it to be. However, he has a flame curse technique. During this entire time, since he took over Megumi's body, he's been doing nothing but relentlessly training himself in order to perfect this curse technique. It didn't take much, since the curse technique wasn't all that special. However, Sukuna was going to make it special. That was his genius in Jujutsu sorcery. It didn't matter what the technique was, you just had to be greedy. And that's exactly what Sukuna was. He made up for at least one finger by eating his own grave wax, and came across Yorozu. Even though it was a hard-fought battle, he would hardly come on top, being able to just barely take down Yorozu, as she would gift him one of his hand error tools. This was going to be difficult for Sukuna. He didn't know what to do. Some brat had taken his fingers and absorbed them. He was beyond livid. He was nowhere near the strength he originally was at. He feels like a complete fool. However, he wasn't going to let that stop him. Whenever he got the chance, he was going to go to the brat and kill him himself. As long as Urame was by his side, he was going to kill whoever stood in his way. He had been training his flame curse technique for a while now, to the point where it's completely mastered, even under this short amount of time, doing things Megumi couldn't even fathom of doing. Urame had offered their body to Sukuna in order for him to take it over. However, Sukuna would tell Urame that that wasn't needed, and that he was going to do things himself. He knows, based off of Megumi's memories, that the sorcerers plan on facing Yuji Itadori nearby in the future, so during that time, he will infiltrate whatever they have going on and attempt to kill Yuji in order to take his own body back. He will reclaim what's his and rightfully claim his soul back from Yuji. As time would continuously pass, Yuji would simply have his fun, doing whatever he wanted, killing people, gathering more points, and collecting more cursed energy for the barriers. It was almost time. The barriers were nearly full, and he had gathered enough cursed energy. He was going to merge all of that with himself and continue the culling games across the world. He couldn't wait. However, just then, Yuji could feel a large gathering of cursed energy heading his way at supersonic speeds. Before Yuji could even get himself together, he would see a hollow purple headed towards him at max speeds, catching him off guard. He would attempt to block it, however, it would blow his arms away, as Yuji would simply smile. He didn't think the Jujutsu sorcerers had that in them. He was going to make sure they paid dearly. Once he was finished with them, he was going to reshape everything. He had already killed Tengen, and they were the last thing holding Jujutsu society together. Once he got rid of them, everything would go according to plan. He couldn't wait. As just then, Yuji would see Gojo Satoru walking straight forward without a care in the world, as if he already knew his victory was announced to him. Yuji would step down from the building he was on top of, walking towards Gojo as well. As they would stare at each other, Gojo would tell Yuji that he expected a lot of things out of him, but this was not one of them. He knew Yuji was a strong sorcerer, and he wanted him to come to Jujutsu High. However, Yuji is simply an evil person. There's nothing that would help him. There's no one that can save him. He simply needs to be put down like the dog he is. Yuji would then begin to laugh, telling Gojo that he can't believe someone like him is saying something like this to him. Yuji would then begin to say, Gojo Satoru, the weapon of Jujutsu society. If anything, you should be standing in my shoes. They use you as a weapon when they want to get rid of something, and you just sit there and take it. Gojo would then laugh and say that he doesn't just take it. He has people that helps him and supports him, unlike Yuji. Yuji is alone, and that loneliness will get to him. Yuji would laugh and tell Gojo that it doesn't matter how lonely he is once he's at the top of the world. As Yuji would continue to laugh, he would then tell Gojo that he was tired of talking, and that they simply need to get this over with. He was going to kill Gojo, and then the next would be his students. Once he kills Gojo, he's going to take his technique, and after that, whatever comes next is up for grabs for Yuji. Gojo would then laugh and ask Yuji, does he really think he can take his technique from him? As a matter of fact, does Yuji even think he could beat Gojo? Yuji would then laugh and say that this wasn't like the last time, as he would make hand signs, summoning Maharaga immediately. He would imbue Maharaga with electricity plus blood manipulation, telling Gojo that things were going to take a humongous turn. Things were only just getting started, and Yuji will finish all of this now. As Gojo will be the first to engage, sprinting straight towards Yuji, Infinity active, he would throw a punch straight towards Yuji's face, as Yuji would simply duck underneath it, as Maharaga would come and slash down onto Gojo, being stopped by Infinity. However, at the same time, the wheel on Maharaga's head would begin to spin. Yuji would laugh as he would use domain amplification, punching towards Gojo. Gojo would then laugh, telling Yuji that he's become a lot smarter since the first time they fought. However, this was simply going to slow down the process of Maharaga. Yuji would laugh and say that he knows. He wanted to take his time slowly killing Gojo, and he may keep him alive later to watch Yuji kill every last one of his students right in front of him. Gojo would then get pissed off as he would punch Yuji in the gut, as Yuji would let off a sinister smile, taking the hit head on, taking the blow with a smile on his face as he would throw a punch himself, aiming straight for Gojo's face, as it would crack Gojo across the face. Gojo would then send an elbow towards Yuji, attempting to counter the attack that Yuji had just sent. However, Yuji would catch the attack, continuously using domain amplification to push Infinity back, throwing yet another punch towards Gojo. However, Gojo would block the attack, but at the same time, Maharaga would be behind Gojo, sending an attack of his own with his executioner sword. However, Gojo would simply flip over Yuji, making Maharaga slam itself into Yuji, cracking him across the face. Yuji would be blasted back into a wall, as Maharaga would simply continue following up with Gojo. As Gojo would begin to smile, Maharaga would be relentless as he would try to combo Gojo, but Gojo would simply dodge and counter everything Maharaga was throwing at him. Maharaga would throw a punch, and Gojo would catch it, swinging Maharaga around right to where Yuji was and throwing a red. It would crash into both Maharaga and Yuji, with Maharaga losing half of his body. However, the wheel on top of his head would begin to spin once more as he would begin to regenerate his limbs, as Yuji would begin to laugh once again, telling Gojo that he'd better be careful because once everything's said and done, Yuji's going to take Gojo's head right off his shoulders. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji that he can try all he might, but nothing will happen. Gojo would continue his assault on Yuji, rushing straight forward as he would throw a punch, attempting connecting with Yuji's chest. However, Maharaga would step in between both of them, blocking the attack, as Yuji would spin around both of them, trying to land an attack on Gojo with domain amplification. He would send a strike towards Gojo's back. However, once again, Gojo would grab onto Maharaga and spin around, making Yuji hit Maharaga in the back, as Maharaga would simply get angrier, throwing another attack towards Gojo. However, he would simply dodge and parry attacks left and right. As they would continue their scuffle, they would continue to trade blow after blow, as Gojo would simply have to play defensively due to Maharaga. However, at the same time, he knew he needed to get rid of Maharaga. If Maharaga adapted to his infinity, who knows what Yuji would be able to do to him. He needed to finish this now. So Gojo would then do something that no one was expecting. He would begin to say the words domain expansion, as Yuji would immediately catch notice of this, de-summoning Maharaga, casting his own domain as well, as the two domains would begin to clash, as Gojo would take no time and immediately rushing in towards Yuji. Yuji would begin to laugh, calling Gojo a madman, reminding Gojo that if he loses this domain battle, his technique will be his. Gojo would laugh and tell Yuji that he swear he's not going to lose. As they would continue their hand-to-hand combat, Gojo would rush forward, sending a right straight towards Yuji's cheek, but Yuji would simply just dodge underneath it, attempting to sweep at Gojo's leg. However, Gojo would simply jump over the attack, trying to knee Yuji in the chest, but Yuji would flip backwards, dodging the attack altogether. He would rush back in once more, throwing a left at Gojo's torso. Gojo would catch the attack, sending another knee at Yuji's torso. However, Yuji would block that one as well. Gojo had never realized, but Yuji was incredibly strong at hand-to-hand combat. He was so used to Yuji using curse techniques, he wouldn't realize how strong Yuji actually was. They would continue fighting back to back, throwing punch after punch with one another, as both of them would throw a punch connecting to each other's faces, continuously crashing punches into one another, as Yuji would attempt to throw yet another punch once more. However, this time, Gojo would dodge underneath the punch, cracking Yuji across the face, dazing him quite a bit. He would then continue his assault, throwing a 3-hit combo, hitting Yuji in the face, as Yuji would attempt to retaliate, throwing an arm of his own. However, Gojo would grab it, pulling Yuji forward, cracking him across the chin with an elbow, spinning him around and throwing him into the walls of the domain. He would then rush forward as he would let off a devastating combo on top of Yuji, not letting Yuji get a breathing room, punching Yuji over and over until eventually he would throw Yuji once again into the center of the domain. However, with Yuji taking such a thrashing, his domain would begin to collapse, as Yuji would then take the sure hit effect of Unlimited Void, However, just like last time, it would begin to take one of the abilities of the souls inside of him, beginning to take cursed energy discharge. Yuji would laugh, saying that that was one of the most useless ones, as he would begin to laugh once more, telling Gojo that if that's all he has, they can continue. As Gojo would close his domain, Gojo would say that this wasn't nearly enough. He wanted to disable as many techniques as he possibly could. If possible, he wanted to try to disable the 10 shadows, but he doesn't know how it works. He doesn't know if Yuji's able to purposefully change the trajectory of the sure hit effect onto another one of the souls that he has gathered inside of him, or if it was just random. He couldn't tell at all. But Gojo needed to do something, so he would activate his domain expansion once more, as Yuji would do the same thing. It was a gamble for both of them. Gojo knew that if he was to lose the clash of domains, his technique would be gone forever, and he would die here. However, if he was able to continuously win the domain clashes, he would be able to effectively take out Yuji's techniques one by one. It was an incredible toll on his brain. However, he wasn't going to stop here. He was going to keep pushing until he won the fight. Until Maharaga didn't exist. That was the only threat to Gojo, and he knew that. As the domains would begin to clash, they would begin to clash as well. Throwing attack after attack, Yuji would rush forward, attempting to grab Gojo. However, Gojo would dodge out of the way, grabbing Yuji's arm, pulling him forward once more. He would punch him in the face. As Yuji would be staggered back, he would then use his other hand, punching Yuji in the gut, making Yuji cough up blood. As Yuji would begin to get irritated, he didn't understand it. Why was Gojo Satoru so powerful? Even without infinity, he could barely put up a fight against Gojo. This wasn't what was supposed to happen. He wanted Gojo dead. Gojo was his only obstacle. He needed Gojo dead. If Gojo dies, everything else works perfectly. Yuji would scream out, cursing Gojo as he would throw another attack. Gojo would then laugh, asking Yuji if he was getting terrified. Yuji would tell Gojo that he doesn't know what he's talking about. He would tell Gojo that he was having the time of his life, as the attacks would continue one after another. However, due to the few attacks that he had taken earlier, before Yuji could even land another attack, his domain would collapse almost instantly, as Gojo's sure hit effect would take effect once more, this time taking away his sky manipulation technique. Yuji would kiss his teeth, realizing that he can't beat Gojo to hand. Neither can he win against Gojo in a domain expansion battle, so he would have to continue relying on Maharaga. He would summon the wheel above his head, but he wouldn't summon Maharaga completely. He was going to bait Gojo into using as many attacks as he could, as well as hoping to get him to use infinity more. He needed Maharaga to adapt as fast as he could so he can get rid of Gojo as fast as he could, as Gojo would shoot off a red immediately, not letting Yuji get another chance to think, as it would strike Yuji in the chest, sending him backwards. Yuji would attempt to catch himself, however, Gojo would use blue, re-attracting Yuji right back to him, as Yuji would then use blood manipulation, plus star rage, plus auto transfiguration, reinforcing his body as much as he could. Gojo would laugh, telling Yuji that did he forget that his attacks won't be able to reach him? As Yuji would send an attack, however, it wasn't aimed at Gojo, it was aimed at the floor below them. As a huge explosion would happen and dust would begin to spread around the battlefield. Yuji would then use hand signs, summoning Agito, imbuing Agito with blood manipulation plus star rage. He was going to finish this as fast as he could. Agito would sprint forward, going straight towards Gojo, as Gojo would believe that Yuji was coming straight at him. He could feel the cursed energy of Yuji, as he would get ready, but instead of it being Yuji, it would be Agito, throwing a punch straight towards him, as he would dodge out of the way. However, Yuji would be behind him, as he would send a kick towards Gojo. However, it would be blocked by infinity, but at the same time, the wheel on Yuji's head would begin to spin, as Yuji would begin to smile once more. He would simply make it so Gojo was not able to expand a domain anymore. If Gojo would continuously expand domains, he would simply win the fight, so Yuji was not going to allow that to happen. As Gojo would use blue, attempting to pull Yuji forward, Yuji would use a reverse gravity manipulation on himself, pinning himself to the ground, as well as using Star Rage to increase his mass. At the same time, he would use Auto Transfiguration, transforming his hands into a bunch of whips, as he would slap the ground using his explosion technique, as there would be a slight delay and then an explosion, as more dust would begin to gather. Gojo would be getting tired of this. Yuji was simply hiding, and he needed him to come out, so Gojo would put his fingers together once more, screaming out domain expansion. However, this time, instead of expanding his own domain, Yuji would close the distance between himself and Gojo, making sure to touch him.
He would then laugh, being at Gojo's back, telling him that as long as he makes contact with him, his domain shouldn't work at all. Gojo would then laugh, asking Yuji if he was so sure about that. As Yuji would use Idol Transfiguration, growing a hand out of his stomach and latching it onto Gojo, as they would begin to throw hands back and forth. Yuji would throw it right, attempting to crack Gojo across the jaw. However, Gojo would parry it, sending an attack of his own, cracking Yuji in the face, hitting him with a 3-piece combo. Once more, he would attempt to follow up with another attack. However, Yuji would block that attack, sending another attack of his own. They would simply go back and forth, throwing fist after fist, with each one being harder than the last. Gojo would smile, realizing that this was a fight he could actually go all out in. Yuji had gotten this strong, and he couldn't contain his excitement. He was going to finish this. However, unknown to Gojo, the wheel on Yuji's head was just continuously spinning. Each second inside of Gojo's domain would only cause Maharaga to adapt more and more to infinity. However, Gojo was completely oblivious to it for now. As they would continue fighting over and over, Gojo would then grab the hand that was wrapped around him, ripping it off, as Yuji would be hit with a limited void once more. This time, it would take away his projection sorcery. Gojo would laugh, telling Yuji that was 3 of his abilities already. What was he to do now? As Gojo would attempt to close the distance once more, Yuji would be somewhat tired, so he would begin laughing. He finally got it, as Gojo would rush in once more, punching Yuji in the stomach, then punching him across the face, landing a 2-piece, pulling him forward, hitting him with another combo. As he would be about to land a finishing attack, the wheel on Yuji's head would drop into the ground, as from the shadow, Maharaga would reappear, with blood manipulation and electricity infused inside of him. He would slash at Gojo, as Gojo would be taken aback, as his arm would be completely severed off. The infinity around Gojo was no longer working for Maharaga, as Maharaga and Yuji would let off a devious smile. Yuji would then say, "Gotcha," as instead of panicking, Gojo would simply laugh, telling Yuji that he can't believe someone like him has him like this. This is the most fun Gojo has had since he's been alive. He was going to kick it up a notch, and he hoped that Yuji can hold on to it. Yuji would ask Gojo what the hell he was talking about, as Gojo would rush forward faster than he already was, sprinting straight at Yuji, going to hand-to-hand combat. He would hit Yuji across the face with an elbow, making Yuji spin around, as he would continue his combo, hitting him over and over, left, right, not giving up at all, as Maharaga would attempt to jump in between both Yuji and Gojo. However, Gojo would simply cock back his fist, as Maharaga would step forward, slashing towards Gojo. Gojo would simply dodge out of the way, throwing the fist, as it would rocket towards Maharaga, hitting Maharaga in the chest, landing a black flash. This would blast Maharaga back into Yuji, making them crash into one another. As Gojo would now be operating at 120%, he would rush in once again at Yuji. Maharaga would attempt to block the initial attack, however, Gojo would simply push him out of the way, kicking Maharaga across the chin, sending him flying into a nearby building. As Gojo would then use blue at maximum output, pulling Yuji forward, crashing the blue into him, while smashing his fist across his face. He would then continue to swing the blue around, gathering debris all around them, as Yuji would say that he's had enough of this. He would activate blood manipulation, using flowing red scale stack. Using shrine, he would then use dismantle, sending slashes at Gojo. However, they would simply be stopped by the infinity. However, Yuji would use this to close the distance between him and Gojo, beginning to use domain amplification once more, attempting to wear Gojo out some more. However, this was Yuji's biggest mistake. Gojo would laugh, telling Yuji that he wasn't done with his initial assault. Gojo would then grab onto Yuji's arm, hitting him with 2 quick jabs, pulling him forward and kneeing him in the stomach. He would grab onto Yuji's leg, swinging him around as he would throw him into the air. Charging a maximum output red, he would shoot it directly at Yuji. It would smash into Yuji's chest, pushing him backwards, as he would use Auto Transfiguration to modify his body for the red to go directly through it. He would laugh at Gojo, saying that attack wasn't worthwhile at all, as he would rush forward once again. However, Gojo would then laugh, telling Yuji that he still wasn't done. Yuji hadn't realized, but the blue from before hadn't dissipated yet. It was still around, as Gojo would continue using the blue, pulling Yuji straight towards that one, as Gojo would line up his attack at the same time, cracking Yuji across the face once more, landing yet another black flash. Yuji couldn't fathom it. Was Gojo holding back that entire time they fought the first time? Yuji didn't realize it before, but Gojo was holding back due to not wanting to kill the people inside of Shibuya. However, since there was no one around except for him and Yuji, he could go all out without worrying about anything or anybody.
as Gojo would then begin chanting 9 ropes, polarized light, Crow and Shiomyo, the gap between within and without, as he would bring the red that was still flying up back down, redirecting it, Yuji realizing way too late as he was in the direct path of the red. If it were to hit him, he would crash into the blue, and the techniques would crash into one another with him being in the center of it. He could not allow that to happen. He already had the blueprint, and he was going to stop this attack no matter what. Yuji would then proceed to activate Mythical Beast Amber. Knowing what the technique does to his body, he needed this for an extra boost in power. Using Mythical Beast Amber, plus Blood Manipulation, plus Star Rage and Auto Transfiguration, he would charge at the red, striking it as hard as he could, as the attack would dissipate, and Gojo would be confused. As he couldn't believe it, Yuji just stopped one of his max output attacks. Even though he combined all those techniques together, he was still able to stop it, as Gojo would begin to laugh once more. However, unknown to Gojo, Maharaga would be right behind him. It would slash at him, taking one of his arms off once again. Being distracted in that brief moment would cause Gojo to lose everything. Yuji would then begin to chant Scale of Dragon, Recoil, Twin Meteors, as he would send out a dismantle. However, Gojo wouldn't think much of it until it connected. Going straight through his infinity, Yuji would laugh, saying that he guesses Gojo wasn't strongest after all. Gojo would fall to the floor, legs still standing, as his torso would drop to the floor. Gojo would let off a smile, realizing that even if he lost, it's everything for Yuji to be able to beat him. And on top of that, he forced Yuji to use a trump card, and he knows he did. Everything else was up to the rest of the students, as the Jujutsu sorcerers watching would immediately jump into action. As Yuji would stare up into the sky, he would see Yuta, Maki, Nanami, Ino, Inumaki, Todo, and Hikari. This was the last line of defense for the Jujutsu sorcerers. If they couldn't beat Yuji here, no one else could. However, none of them knew at the moment that Yuji was on a countdown. After using Mythical Beast Amber, Yuji would realize that his body was disintegrating. The only thing he could do right now was reinforce his body with cursed energy. However, if he didn't figure something out, the technique would tear through his flesh until he was an absolute crisp. He was going to finish this now. Yuta would start off the charge, immediately popping his domain expansion. They came with a plan, and they were going to enact it to perfection. Yuta, starting the charge, would immediately rush forward, swinging his sword at Yuji. Yuji would grab the blade, melting it almost immediately. This would shock Yuta. However, Yuji would attempt to follow up on the distraction. He would swing at Yuta as it would connect with his cheek, causing him to be bounced back quite a bit. However, using the momentum from the punch, Yuta would turn around, grabbing a sword, as Yuji would let off a cursed energy blast, sending it straight towards Yuta. Picking up the sword, Yuta would then be able to use sky manipulation, turning the attack back around as it would crash directly into Yuji. Yuji would laugh as the technique wouldn't do much damage. However, it still did damage. Yuji can't allow himself to take as much damage. He would need to play defensively until he could figure out a way for the technique to not render his flesh immobile. However, Yuta wasn't going to let up. He would rush in once more, attempting to exchange hand-to-hand with Yuji. He would throw the initial sword at Yuji, causing Yuji to slap it away. However, at the same time, he would grab another one, where Yuta would then rush forward. He would send a slash at Yuji. However, Yuji would do the same thing, attempting to grab the blade. However, this time, Yuta would reinforce the blade with more cursed energy, making it so the blade would connect with Yuji's hand. And even though Yuji was blocking the attack, it would strike directly through Yuji's hand, cutting his hand clean off. Yuji would turn around, asking himself how, as Yuta would do the same thing, throwing the sword at Yuji once more. As Yuji would say that he's had enough, he would send dismantles directly towards Yuta. They would slash him. However, he would use RC2 to heal himself as quickly as he could, sprinting towards Yuji once more. Just then, as Yuta was right in front of Yuji, Yuji would use his reverse gravity technique, slamming Yuta into the ground. He would then use hand signs, summoning Agito, imbuing it with blood manipulation, the exploding technique, and as well as Star Rage. He wanted Yuta dead. He wanted everybody dead. He would send Agito straight towards Yuta, as Yuta would call on to Rika, as Rika would come out, blocking the attack from Agito. However, it would still push her back quite a bit. Yuta would then push himself off of the ground, forcing himself up as he would grab another sword. Yuta would then smile, realizing that now he's hit the jackpot. He would then use hand signs, conjuring up a maximum output Jacob's Ladder. This is the technique he needed, something that would burn through Yuji's souls. Using the technique, Yuji would get hit by it directly. However, something would happen that Yuji himself wasn't even expecting. Not only would it damage Yuji himself, but the souls inside of Yuji as well. It would burn through half of Sukuna's soul inside of Yuji, burning through idol transfiguration altogether, as well as blood manipulation. As the attack would end, Yuji would sit there, absolutely dumbfounded. That attack did way more damage than he needed it to do. He couldn't take any more of this. However, at the same time, Yuta would then desummon his domain. As Yuji would attempt to rush forward, however, from behind him, he would be stabbed through the chest, directly in the heart, as Maki would stab him with the soul split katana. As doing the same thing, it would disrupt one of the souls inside of Yuji, cutting him off from Star Rage. Yuji couldn't believe it. In this one instance alone, he lost almost half of his techniques. In this katana, it wasn't something normal. It directly attacks Yuji's soul. This wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. He was already at wit's end. After fighting Gojo, he expanded a lot of his cursed energy. And with these guys, and using Mythical Beast Amber on top of that, he just couldn't take it anymore. It was too much going on. As Yuji's skin would begin to fry, cooking him from the inside. However, Yuji would not allow this to get him down. He was going to win this. It didn't matter what he did. As Yuji would then begin to laugh, as Maki would take the sword out of Yuji, kicking him in the back, sending him towards Yuta. As Yuta would strike Yuji across the face, hitting him with a combo, punch after punch. Yuji would attempt to use curse manipulation, however, Maki would follow up once more with Yuta, stabbing him with the soul split katana once more. As curse manipulation would then be deleted from his stock. During the training that they underwent with Gojo, they all knew about Yuji's souls inside of him, so they knew that Maki was going to play a huge role in this fight, as well as Yuta. If Yuta was able to copy Angel's technique, he would be able to strike Yuji with a Jacob's Ladder, effectively extinguishing any curses inside of him. And since he's absorbed the techniques of cursed spirits as well, it would make perfect sense. Yuji was now down to his last 4 techniques, as well as Mythical Beast Amber. He didn't know what to make of this. It was too much to summon another Shikigami. He's burnt through his entire cursed energy reserves, so he was going to do an end-all be-all. Yuji would then use his explosion technique, touching himself all across his body, charging it up as much as he can. If he was to die here, he was going to take every single person here with him. He was going to become a nuke himself. Yuji would begin maniacally laughing, as just before he would be able to explode, he would hear the words, "Maximum output, frost calm." As a wave of ice would freeze over Yuji. As everyone would be confused, they would see Megumi walking forward. They would ask where the hell he's been and that they've been looking for him. As Megumi would tell the group that he was caught off guard by a special grade cursed spirit in the Shibuya incident. However, this person took them into their care and healed him up, so everything was all okay. He would then walk forward straight to Yuji, as Yuta would tell Megumi to be careful. Megumi would then laugh and tell Yuta that he's gotten a lot stronger since the last time they were together, so he doesn't need to worry. Yuji, looking from within the ice, would stare up, as he would begin to smile, realizing that wasn't Megumi. As Megumi would begin to laughing even harder, he would tell Urarame to lower the ice just a bit to where they could see Yuji's face. Yuji's body was completely fried, as Mythical Beast Amber had completely taken over his body. He was basically mush at this point. Yuji would then begin to laugh, telling everyone that he won't be defeated like this. His will continue. As surprising everyone, Yuji would break his hand free from the ice, pouring all of his cursed energy into one singular finger. His soul and everything with him. Everything was betting on this for Yuji. He would then rip the finger off with the other hand, as he would tell Sukuna that he leaves everything to him. As Yuji's body would wither away, everyone else would look on confused, as Sukuna would simply laugh. They would ask Megumi what the problem is, as Megumi would grab onto the finger. He would stare over at the other students, as he would let off a huge smile. He would eat the finger, and Yuji had attempted to take over Sukuna's body in this moment, or be the main soul. However, he didn't realize, combining the other Sukuna's fingers with him, his soul was stronger than Yuji's at the moment. So instead of Yuji taking ownership over the body, Sukuna would continue to reign over, absorbing the technique of All for One as well. Having access to gravity technique and 10 shadows, Megumi would then begin laughing, as Yuta would have a troubled look on his face. He knew something was wrong. From the beginning Megumi walked in here, something was off about him. And now the worst possible outcome has come into the picture. Sukuna would then fully retransform his body, going into his fully incarnated state. He would look at the Jujutsu sorcerers and ask them, shall they continue? They had already expanded so much cursed energy, and at the moment, they were fighting an almost fully powered Sukuna. What were they going to do? Telling them that he's feeling amazing. So for now, and only right now, he's going to give them the chance to walk away from this. However, when the time comes, he's going to retake his place as the king of curses, reshaping the entire Jujutsu society back to what it was during the Heian era, with no Gojo Satoru in his way. No one even comes close to the strength Sukuna has, and on top of that, he's inherited the technique of the boy. He was completely unstoppable, and he was feeling extremely generous right now. However, in due time, he was going to reclaim everything. He would tell the sorcerers good luck, as he would simply walk away with Urarame directly by his side. The sorcerers knew that if they were to engage into a battle with Sukuna right now, they would all die and lose. Things weren't looking good at all, so they would regroup with themselves, retreating for the moment. What was going to happen further down the line? Kenjaku's plan was disrupted. Sukuna was now alive, but now at full power. There was nothing they could do at all. What was going to happen in the future? What was going to happen to Jujutsu society? They would have to figure it out. And I think that's where I'm going to end it. I know I'm ending it like this, and it's like a what's going to happen later. But yeah, I kind of like it. And I won't lie, I rushed this part, so it might be all over the place. But I don't like this what if, but I hope you guys like this what if. And I'm thankful for you guys being supportive for this long. And again, thank you for 3K. I haven't made any kind of specials, and I don't know what kind of specials I would do. But yeah, if you guys can come up with something, I'll try to do it for you guys. And again, I'm sorry for not uploading as often as I should, but yeah, I'm trying to get back into it. I just have a lot of stuff going on. That's it. But yeah, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.